Adolf Hitler stands on the podium to great applause. His chaotic mind is racing as the crowd screams out Heil Hitler, a crowd made up of not just Germans but various nationalities that have fallen under his evil spell. The superpower of Germany is untouchable. There's no such thing as the Soviet Union anymore. The great of Great Britain is lying in the mud. Millions are being executed while millions more are enslaved in Hitler's labor camps. There's just one more thing to accomplish, and that's annihilating the USA, to subdue what Hitler regards as a low-down, dirty race of mongrels. He has won, and it's hell on earth for many. We'll get around to this standoff with the USA, but first we need to know how Hitler pulled it off, this unbelievable victory in Europe. Here we mix reality with fiction. As you know, at the start of the Second World War in 1939, Hitler's army, the Wehrmacht, devastated Poland. With its legion of panzer tanks and an incredibly efficient mobile infantry, the Poles were no match for the Germans. The attack was like lightning, which is what the word blitzkrieg was derived from. In September, German bombs were dropped on the town of Luck, not just destroying buildings, but even killing kids on their way to school. This sent a message of what was to come. The Polish pilot B.J. Solak noted, "The stench of burning and a brown veil of smoke filled the air all around our town. No one was spared." The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, rained hellfire down on Poland. Trains were seen derailed from the tracks. Kids screamed at the sight of the dead. It was a terror no one could have expected, and so on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Amazingly, France was beaten in just 6 weeks, and in time, something worrying occurred. Surprisingly, most of the French accepted the new Vichy government, one sympathetic to Nazi ideology. Not many know that a large number of people in France endorsed Hitler's hatred toward the Jews. Bear this in mind as we go through this story today. But by that time, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg had already been beaten by the Germans. It was as if the German soldiers were on steroids, which isn't far from the truth in the view of their heavy use of powerful methamphetamine, Pervitin. And with Norway defeated, Hitler now had access to heavy water. Although not known at the time, this is a key ingredient in the creation of the nuclear bomb. This was bad news. When France fell and the British were left scurrying for their lives on the escape from Dunkirk, it looked as though the Germans were totally invincible. These conquests so far meant tens of thousands of Germans killed and many more injured. France itself had lost 50,000 men in the invasion, Britain lost 11,000, but now Germany had a massive 1.5 million prisoners of war. It would have been much worse had the Brits not had their miracle at Dunkirk. Britain was at this point waiting for the Battle of Britain. It was a frightening thing to imagine. Not many people thought this small island nation could hold its own, but the fighting spirit still burned within Britain. As a wounded British soldier named Paul Ritchie said when he was flown back to England from France, he couldn't imagine his country going the same way France had. In his own words, he said, "With my mind still filled with the blast and flame that had shattered France, I was seized with utter disgust at the smug contentedness enjoyed behind the sea barrier. Still, he worried about what was around the corner." On June 18, 1940, Winston Churchill spoke at the House of Commons. In his impeccable oratory style, he said, "I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life." He was probably right. Churchill went on, "Hitler knows he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age." He said that upon the defeat of Germany, men will say that this was their finest hour. And take note, he said Hitler would go after the USA. It was just a matter of time. According to this cigar-munching elitist who admittedly was drunk and drugged up half the time, still, he correctly envisioned the hell that Hitler would unleash. That's why Churchill was so against settling with Hitler. He was sure that at some point the furious Führer would have Britain in shackles and take over his empire. Hitler would not stop, not until Nazi ideology pervaded the globe. The Battle of Britain commenced. In the skies, British Hawker Hurricanes and Spitfires fought it out with German Messerschmitt Bf 109s. The so-called dogfights were crazy, and many young pilots who went up did not come back down. Alive, anyway. Here is how one Spitfire pilot described the day at work. "We were both flying in a tight circle, just a little more and I'll have him. Pressing the trigger, I waited expectantly for the 109 to explode. I've hit his wing." He was one of the lucky ones. Life expectancy for an RAF pilot during the war was a grim thing indeed. 60% of operational airmen died, were injured, or became prisoners of war. Around 51% of all RAF aircrew died. Bombs from German Junkers rained down on strategic locations in England, with sirens blaring on a regular basis during what the Brits called the Blitz. It went on for 8 months. But the British down below were typically amenable to hardships. One woman wrote in her diary, "I wonder what the pilots feel. After all, somebody loves them even if they're Nazis." At some point, Hitler made the mistake of withdrawing aircraft for Russia's planned invasion in May 1941. That really was a mistake. It turned out the Germans lacked a cogent strategic plan. The planes also often missed their targets, and British scientists were good at reading German signals and jamming their radars. The British public showed fortitude too. A woman named Barbara Dixon wrote that she'd never even heard of Poland, but she'd do anything to repel the beast of Hitler, who she said was trying to blow us up or murder us in our beds. Historians say attacking Britain was one of the great blunders Germany made in the war, with the next one being the invasion of the Soviet Union. Had Hitler focused all his strength on Britain and not at one point said, "Okay, we'll come back for you later," the Brits might have settled with Germany. Many people in Britain wanted that. They didn't think Hitler was as crazy as he turned out to be. Hitler had many times expressed his liking for British culture, and he said, unlike those mongrels in America, Britain had a good Aryan culture. Prior to German propagandists criticizing the British for their empire's atrocities and their plutocrats living like kings while the working class lived in the slums, Hitler had some pretty good relations with certain British politicians. Britain's army was nothing compared to the German army, and no one really expected them to hold their own in the skies. Even the US ambassador in London, Joseph Kennedy, said Britain had no chance. Despite 23,000 civilians dying and around 33,000 injured, with the German retreat, confidence was bolstered. It's thought 1,000 RAF planes were shot down, with about 544 fighter command pilots losing their lives. Then, with bombers and Coastal Guard losses, that added up to 1,542 planes lost and another 1,542 lives lost. The German Luftwaffe lost around 1,800 planes, and more than 2,500 pilots were killed. Across the pond, an American journalist wrote Adolf Hitler met his first defeat in 8 years in what might go down in history as a battle as important as Waterloo or Gettysburg. Winston Churchill uttered those now famous words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." This bolstered confidence in the US too, and elsewhere in the world. Germany wasn't invincible. It sent a strong message, and for Britain at the time, having the most powerful navy in the world, it knew no Germans would be walking down its streets anytime soon. But as we said, Hitler planned to come back for Britain just as soon as he'd taken care of other matters, namely the Soviet Union. The reason we spent some time on this matter is that had Britain been soundly beaten and backed down, the whole outcome of the war would have been different. With Britain out of the war, Germany could have focused less time on one very formidable foe in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa. It would have also sent a strong message to the Soviet Union and to the United States. Remember, the US didn't want to get involved in a bloody European war. US citizens didn't want their young men being shot to pieces far from its now incredibly industrious shores. But in our alternative universe, let's say Germany did succeed in having air superiority over Britain. Germany might have launched Operation Sea Lion, the planned land invasion of Britain. This was not Hitler's first choice. He had been hoping for the British to accept his offer to back down out of the war. This is what Hitler had said he needed to happen for that invasion to be successful. First, he said the RAF had to be beaten down in its morale, and in fact that it can no longer display any appreciable aggressive force in opposition to the German crossing. Then he hoped the English Channel would be swept of mines, and if the British Navy was distracted with fighting in the North Sea and the Mediterranean, it would make crossing the Channel into England more achievable. Apparently, even Hitler's inner circle wasn't keen on this idea, and if you read the writings of contemporary historians, most will tell you he would have failed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt suspected Hitler was just trying to bluff Britain into pulling out of the war. He said, "By God, even Napoleon failed to invade Britain." The place was a veritable fortress. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was no match for the British Navy. It ruled the waves, and it had done so for years. But in our scenario, Britain lost in the air. The morale of the military and the public was very low. The British Navy, as Hitler wanted, was spread out. The German Navy fought remarkably, better than expected, and before you could say Schadenfreude, the powerful British elites were foreseeing losing their empire while watching panzer tanks make a mess of that beautiful British grass. The country soon surrendered, just as France had. Now Britain was finished. Hitler could certainly win the war. With France and Britain subdued, and to our modern shame, many people in both countries were now buying into Hitler's Aryan rubbish, the Germans could now go full throttle at the Soviet Union. Okay, back to real life. Hitler had made a non-aggression pact with another tyrant, Joseph Stalin, but then he invaded Russia anyway. Never trust the word of a tyrant. The German army, full of confidence, was sure it would walk through Russia. They also said they were doing the right thing. As this 18-year-old German soldier named Henry Mettelmann said, "I accepted as natural that it was German duty for the good of humanity to impose our way of life on lower races and nations, who probably, because of their limited intelligence, would not quite understand what we were on about." Hitler hated Jews, but he was no fan of Slavs either. His notion that most Germans were pure Aryans was utter ridiculous given centuries of the intermixing of people in Northern Europe. It was ridiculous, full stop. But even so, he was prepared to annihilate Slavish people. As for communists, once he'd won the war in Russia, they would either have to forfeit their ideology or die. The many millions of Jews in the Soviet Union would be hunted down and killed. As General Erich Heppner said, the war with Russia is a vital part of the German people's existence. It is the old fight of German against the Slav, the defense of the European culture against the Muscovite Asiatic flood, and the repulse of Jewish Bolshevism. So mark our words, the people of the Soviet Union would have been spared no quarter, or at least those that fit into Hitler described as the lower races. And while Joseph Stalin, by the time he died, had the blood of tens of millions of peoples on his paranoid hands, his zero tolerance to people not fighting was one reason why Germany couldn't defeat him. The Soviets killed around 300,000 of their own soldiers for refusing to fight, fighting badly, or going AWOL. People starved because of Stalin's focus on building weaponry above feeding his people. People even changed sides because they detested Stalin so much. But if he hadn't been so bloody despotic, Germany might well have won. For the invasion, Operation Barbarossa, Hitler deployed around 3.6 million troops, 2,700 aircraft, and 3,600 tanks, which was record-breaking in terms of European warfare. Stalin had 2.9 million troops, 8,000 aircraft, and 11,000 tanks, but the Germans were superior in terms of technology and general warfare. But let's think. If Germany had just defeated Britain in our fictional scenario, there would be a spring in the military step. They'd also be making use of that excellent British arms industry. For instance, in real life, Hitler had thousands of French prisoners of war slaving away in its munitions industry, plus around 650,000 French civilian laborers, not to mention the Vichy French fighting for Germany. Over in the USA, in real life again, many people didn't have much love for the Soviets. The famed American aviator Charles Lindbergh said at the time, "I would 100 times rather see my country ally herself with Britain or even Germany, with all her faults, than the cruelty, the godlessness, and the barbarism of the Soviet Union." There was more support for Nazism in the US than you might think. Hence, Philip Roth's alternative reality novel, The Plot Against America. The famed industrialist Henry Ford admired Nazi Germany, and he was for much of his life very much anti-Semitic, showcased in the anti-Semite books he published with titles such as The International Jew, The World's Foremost Problem. Back to our alternate reality. With the British loss and the USA hardly coming to the rescue, there is every chance that Germany could have won Russia, especially if its ally, for the short term anyway, was Japan, who would also attack Russia. Just think, with Britain defeated, Japan wouldn't have to fight the country in Singapore, Hong Kong, and what were the Malaya and Burma. We also have to remember about the impact of all the countries of the British Empire that fought alongside Britain. Think about British India and the massive impact it had on the war, or India alone, whose 2.5 million troops fought under British command. Think about Canada, which couldn't have fought on since it was a dominion of the British Empire, or even Australia, who, although they didn't join the war effort right away, still provided the Brits with manpower and resources. We understand this is overly simplistic, and we haven't even discussed any country's atomic bomb research, but let's just say after Britain fell, the invasion of Russia went as Hitler planned. It was over within the year. This really could have happened had things just been a bit different. What would the USA be thinking now after much of Europe and some of Asia had fallen to Adolf Hitler and Japan? As we said, Americans didn't want to fight a European war. William Kaplan, the then head of Harvard, said as much, one time stating, "Hitler's going to win, let's be friends with him." Many people thought this way, of course. They weren't fully aware of Hitler's plans for world domination and the sheer ugliness of what he was capable of. Still, the US had meddled in the war by freezing assets and preventing Japan from getting the oil it needed to attempt to build its empire during the war, and Japan didn't much like this American interference. The US wasn't totally out of the war, lending weapons to Britain and helping in other ways, all for a price, of course. But then companies such as GM, Ford, and IBM also sold what was described as useful war materials to Germany. The US made hay while bombs spilled down on Europe, coming out of the war much richer. It might have stayed that way if Japan hadn't launched the famous attack. Japan had hoped that after attacking the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, the US would revert to its isolationist policies. In our alternate reality, the US had watched on as Germany's Operation Barbarossa was successful and Britain and France were a spent force. In this case, had the Pearl Harbor attack happened, the US might well not have retaliated. But then, had history been different, the US might not have interfered one bit and the attack on Pearl Harbor wouldn't have happened in the first place. And that's how things are different in our alternate world. So, right now, Hitler's over the moon. The problem is he has enemies everywhere in his vanquished countries. This is why he's sending out death squads to hunt down the people he doesn't like. For this, he deploys mobile death squads, aka the Einsatzgruppen. They scour German-occupied Europe looking for their victims, and that includes the Jewish people, communists, gypsies, anti-fascists, and even intellectuals. Hitler didn't leave all the work to his death squad, though. He prepared a list in 1940 of what he perceived to be dangerous Brits, kept in his Black Book. He is very well aware that he is much despised by a lot of people in occupied Britain. The French had a resistance, but it was small and only really significant close to the end of the war. Still, there would have been resistance in Britain too. This Black Book contained 2,820 names, from Jews to journalists to anti-fascists to spies to politicians to academics and novelists, all to be immediately arrested once Britain was successfully invaded. This book can give you some idea about what would have happened if Hitler had won the war. There are some names in the book that would surprise you, including the great writer Aldous Huxley. If Hitler had won in England, the writer of the book Brave New World might not have had the chance in 1949 to congratulate George Orwell on his dystopian novel 1984. We very much doubt he would have written to Orwell saying, "Within the next generation, I believe that the world's leaders will discover that infant conditioning is more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, by flogging them and kicking them into obedience." He was right, as it turned out in the long run. Anyway, Hitler was doing a lot of flogging and kicking in the UK, and perhaps Huxley, as well as other British intellectuals who liked the idea of freedom, would have been sent to Nazi extermination camps. These Brits had no idea they were on Hitler's hit list. With the playwright Noel Coward writing after the war, "If anyone had told me at the time that I was high up on the Nazi blacklist, I should have laughed and told them not to talk nonsense." For the most part, no one really understood what Hitler would do to secure his vision of a Nazi-led utopia. In Britain as well as in the Soviet Union, Jews, gypsies, communists, certain kinds of intellectuals are sent to labor camps to work or die in the process. Young and fit people in Britain, as well as Russia, would be drafted to work for the Nazi war machine and its general industries. This machine has to expand. After all, Hitler has the USA in his sights. The country now wondering if Churchill had been right and if they should have helped out earlier when Germany was more vulnerable. Meanwhile, Britain adopts a new government in line with the Nazi regime. That is, an authoritarian, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic government led by Oswald Mosley, whose British Union of Fascists had just been resurrected after being disbanded in 1940. Not too many years earlier, Hitler had kept a keen eye on Mosley, impressed when he said things such as, "For the first time I openly and publicly challenged the Jewish interests of this country, commanding commerce, commanding the press, commanding the cinema, dominating the city of London, killing industry with their sweatshops." And now with Hitler at the helm and his man Mosley in England, the German propaganda machine goes into hyperdrive. What's astounding is how quickly many people in Britain embrace what Mosley is saying. He promises an end to corrupt banking, telling them the upper classes have kept them in bondage for centuries. Soon thugs like the old king and church mob squash any resistance to the British fascists. People are afraid to speak out against fascism. Progressives are hunted down, and something similar is happening in Russia. The Russian Fascist Party has never been that big. But now with Stalin and almost all of the Politburo exterminated or in labor camps, and with the Germans releasing many thousands of Soviet prisoners from gulags, a lot of people start to believe the Nazi propaganda. Millions had died under Stalin, millions more had been on the verge of starvation or been sent to gulags, and generally lived in fear. That's why it doesn't take long for these deeply oppressed people to embrace another form of government, one that promises a better society. As time goes on, while Germany focuses much of its efforts on industry and taking back the African colonies that had been taken away after the First World War, something strange is happening in the USA. The German propaganda machine under Joseph Goebbels is incredibly effective, even far away in the US. The mass exterminations have been kept away from the world's eyes for the most part, despite the rumors and in spite of the spying. The US public doesn't know about those wicked massacres of innocent people. So now the Nazis spew out propaganda regarding how their New World Order is rescuing people from out-of-control capitalist slavery and releasing them from the chains that they say the Jewish elite have placed on them. A worrying number of people are taking interest in the fascist movement in the US. Remember, this is a country where a massive part of the poorer population has just gone through absolute hell during the Great Depression. Hitler blames all that on the Jews. And when leading fascism supporters in the US talk, some of the American people listen, as they also do over the border where the Canadian Union of Fascists speaks at events. Then when Charles Lindbergh stands up and promotes his America First policy, pro-fascist isolationists in the crowd cheer. These crowds just keep growing and anti-Semitic sentiment grows with it. Even though the USA is already backward when it comes to civil rights compared to other advanced nations, racism becomes even more intense throughout the nation. The fascists in the US say leave Europe to its own devices. They say any form of intervention in European affairs will likely be disastrous given the now great power of Germany. People look up to Lindbergh when he says things like this. A few far-sighted Jewish people realize this and stand opposed to intervention, but the majority still do not. Their greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. Remember, this guy is a national hero. When he speaks, many people are glued to his every word. The US government has awarded this famed aviator the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Flying Cross, but now the Nazis have also given him a medal, namely the Commander Cross of the Order of the German Eagle. The Nazis know that Lindbergh and Ford, two of the most powerful men in America, often discuss what they and the Nazis call the Jewish problem. Perhaps Hitler thinks Germany doesn't need to attack the US at its borders. Perhaps he can take control from within the borders, with the help of an American fascist party working on his behalf. Hitler muses that it isn't as if this country of Mongols doesn't already have widespread white supremacy. America can quite easily be pushed over the edge, he assumes. Those he calls the mongrels will once again be enslaved and the Jewish will be executed. The racial segregation that already exists in the US will just be taken up a notch. Hitler once said that the US military posed no threat, but he has changed his mind as of late. Invading the US, he knows, is an almost impossible task, even though part of him believes the country's military is weak due to its racial diversity. He writes in his diary one day that he'd like nothing more than to see New York in flames. Japan has already been granted part of the former Soviet Union, and the country is certainly up for an invasion of the US. But will it work? The months pass, the year ticks over, and the power of the Nazis just grows and grows. Now with so much European industry in its control, and an army like the world has never seen, the US is a David to the Goliath of Germany. And this is why the isolationists in the US win over so many of the people. War will mean mass death. It will mean certain defeat. Why not, just as so many have said in the past, be on good terms with Hitler? Do some trade with him. To become his enemy is a death sentence, and finance-wise, it makes no sense at all. Hitler contemplates on the costs of a long-distance invasion. But even with British ships now under his control, taking that many men across the sea is a Herculean task. Feeding those men, getting the fuel for the machines, moving all that equipment across the ocean just seems like a bridge too far. But if the Canadian fascists, who are now gaining popularity like the British fascists have, go for a war, a land invasion against the so-called decadent capitalists can happen overland from Canada. It will take time and the movement of many resources, not to mention it would also be very risky. Things aren't looking good for the US. Damn, think a lot of people. If the UK had only been able to repel Germany, none of this would have happened. That little island losing to the Nazis had changed the entire outcome of the history of the world. Then, one day Hitler's sitting at his desk and he receives a report that has taken months to compile. The report states that throughout Europe an estimated 9.7 million Jews have been exterminated. It also states that 350,000 homosexuals have been killed, along with close to 840,000 Romani and Sinti people. Things have moved much faster since Europe was defeated by Hitler. The report doesn't state how many disabled people have died in the camps, although Hitler is pleased when he reads that they're being used for various medical experiments. People of color, says the report, as well as intellectuals, are mostly being employed in slave labor activities, although many have also been exterminated. Meanwhile, scientists working in the USA are making headway with an atomic bomb project. Little do they know that if they could have collaborated with scientists in Britain, the project would almost be complete. Now Hitler has control over Britain's project, seeing that under Mosley, Britain is nothing more than a German puppet state. It also helps that former King Edward VIII has been restored to the throne, a much more suitable monarch for the Nazis than George VI. But what about life in general in this new Europe? Hitler believes that he can create a utopian society, but it's only possible when the people he thinks have caused the world's problems are all dead – man, woman, and child. He hates religion, but in his new empire he actually endorses religious tolerance. This is more out of fear of mass resistance than anything else. He also promotes selective polygamy, believing that if you mix the right genes you will create the right products for his army, for his science projects, for his idea of societal harmony. At times this is oppressive for women, who are usually the ones selected. Strangely, for a man with so much blood on his hands, Hitler detests cruelty to animals and even endorses but not enforces national vegetarianism. At the same time, he abhors what he calls degenerative art, and he hates the artists just as much, even if they do tick the right box for his so-called master race. He bans pornography in Germany as well as prostitution, some intellectual pursuits, certain kinds of writing and poetry, decadent music, excessive boozing, and smoking. His puppet states are not asked to conform to these ideals, but in many cases, the new fascists around Europe espouse and enforce the ideals of the Nazis. In some ways, those who follow Hitler do see some benefits. Even some businesses and industries improve, since Hitler has taken a zero-tolerance stand against corruption. The totalitarian ways, he says, must be simple and without deceits. It is also horribly oppressive and leads to unhappiness that people try not to show. Just as one critic over in the US says, the utopia that Hitler seeks can never be free from tyranny. Anyone who says they don't like this new paradise will be severely punished. The guy who writes that is soon beaten up by one of the now widespread pro-fascist mobs in the US. The year is now 1944. For some time, British scientists have been working on an atomic bomb under the Tube Alloys Project, something that has been kept secret from everyone except those who need to know in Canada. The project was actually started before the USA's Manhattan Project. The Brits had forecast a bomb not being ready until 1947, but once the new German and Soviet scientists join the project and the Germans have more facilities with the newly built heavy bombers and a hell of a lot more money to make bombs, the project is completed in 1944. But the US Manhattan Project is also just about ready. Little do the world's public know that a nightmare situation is taking place. In 1945, both sides test their bombs, and so it is now known just how much destructiveness is in the hands of leaders, and more concerning in the hands of a man who thinks very little of American mongrels. The strange thing is Hitler, despite the fact that he's gassed millions of people, does not embrace the use of superweapons. He's even held off on using chemical weapons, even though the Germans at the start of the war had a huge stockpile of deadly sarin gas. So it's not so surprising that he doesn't like the thought of using an atomic bomb. As for the US, it was well aware of what's coming back if it drops a bomb. And why would it when Hitler has not yet made it clear he will invade the US? As crazy as Hitler is, he doesn't want to die. He doesn't want his idea of utopia to be destroyed. Still, if something doesn't change in the US, he might have to do something. This Cold War stalemate creates a frenzy among the public, especially the American public, that according to the polls, do not want to go to war with Hitler. It's during this next chaotic year that Lindbergh creates the American Fascist Party to be sympathetic with Nazi ethos, but with an assurance from Hitler that Germany will not interfere in American affairs. So, how does Hitler finally win this war? It's when fascism wins in the USA, when fear, bitterness, anger, and stupidity push people to polls to tick the box under American Fascist Party. Some of the poor just want change, and rightly so. But out of desperation, political distrust, and lack of options, they unwittingly choose their own demise. Lindbergh has assured that no Americans will be harmed in relation to their race or creed, but already an ugliness has seeped into a once hopeful culture. Gangs roam the streets at night, throwing Molotov cocktails through house windows. The police don't do much to stop it. This will only get worse. Families of Jewish people, African Americans, and other minorities for that matter huddle together in living rooms and shed tears when they watch Lindbergh throw his fist into the air on his victory. It is a victory for Hitler just as much. America closes its doors to the world, but also inside the house something is rotten. No structure can remain standing when the foundations are warped and decayed. Totalitarianism will eat itself and suppresses natural creativity, and with it societal progress. It foments distrust and paranoia, and in that time leads to widespread violence and unhappiness. One day, goodness and morality and love and compassion among races will win out, and that rotten house will fall down. But for now, the present is Hitler's utopia, hell on earth, even for most of the ones who've asked for it. It's late April 1945. Adolf Hitler is in the throes of a nervous breakdown. It's the end for him, and he knows it. He calls for one of his secretaries, Gertrude Traudl-Junge, and tells her to take down his last will and testament. Tearfully, she listens and writes down his insane words. His takes on all things: all of this bloodshed is not my fault. The 4 other witnesses in that room, as well as Hitler, will be dead within 24 hours. We'll talk in depth later about the deranged will and testament, which encapsulates just how insane he was. Hitler had known for a long time before that, maybe since 1943, that the war was lost, but he still clung on to the hope that there might be peace negotiations. Then, at the beginning of 1945, his enemies encroached further and further toward Berlin. The Soviet Red Army was intent on crushing Germany. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, whom Hitler had the nerve to call a barbarian, knew victory was close. In January alone, 450,000 Germans died, and in the 3 months that followed, 280,000 died. This was more German casualties than from 1942 to 1943, which shows you just how stubborn the Nazis were in not accepting defeat. In February, Hitler's command in Hungary watched as his men fell into a state of utter gloom. In his report, he wrote, "Amid all these stresses and strains, no improvement in morale or performance is visible. The numerical superiority of the enemy, combined with the knowledge that the battle is now being fought on German soil, has proved very demoralizing for the men." German people ran from their homes as the Soviets moved in. One woman wrote, "The world is a very lonely place without family, friends, or even the familiarity of a home." In April, a Russian soldier wrote to his beloved back home saying, "At first the fascists fought back fiercely, but they could not endure this hell. Everything is bound to finish soon." On April 16th, Soviet forces had invaded Berlin, finally. Inhabitants heard the gunfire not far off in the distance. Some people ran to the shops to get what remained of food. One of them, Ruth Andreas Friedrich, poetically wrote, "Before us lies the endless city, black in the black of night, cowering as if to creep back into the earth, and we are afraid." The Nazis still relentlessly kept on killing. They emptied jails and shot those who resided there. German firing squads killed scores of people deemed a non-supporter of the regime. POWs and concentration camp prisoners were lined up and massacred. The order given by Hitler was to keep going. But Berlin was doomed, with now even the Hitler Youth fighting toe-to-toe with the enemy. One woman explained what she saw, saying there were young baby faces peeping out beneath oversized steel helmets, and that it was frightening to hear their high-pitched voices. She said this went against human nature, and nothing could be better accredited to the madness of war. You might wonder why so many people fought on in Germany. The historian Max Hastings wrote in his book Inferno that the Germans were well aware of the fact that they would be given no mercy from the Red Army. It was a matter of fighting back or being murdered. The Russians had been on the wrong end of so much savagery themselves, they weren't in the mood for sparing the enemy, which, as they saw it, was all of Germany. Still, the atrocities committed on German civilians can't be ignored. One woman starkly summed it up, saying, "It can't be me this is happening to, so I'm expelling it all from me." It was during these last few days of barbarity that Hitler sat in his bunker under the Reich Chancellery. After hearing of the death of U.S. President Roosevelt on April 12th, he'd actually held out some hope that the new president, Harry Truman, would sign a peace treaty. That didn't happen, of course. Hitler suffered a breakdown on April 22nd when he heard that his orders for a counterattack hadn't been followed through. He screamed and cursed the people he said had betrayed him. It was on this day that Hitler finally admitted to himself that all was lost. This was 2 days after his birthday, which you can understand didn't involve much celebration. He did, however, make this his last public appearance to congratulate some Hitler Youth who were ready to die for him. He was in such a state, he had to keep one of his shaking hands clasped behind his back. He then went back to the bunker, knowing his life would soon be over. It was there that he would be married to his mistress, Eva Braun. We know that in the last day or two, one of the many things that occupied her mind was hiding her precious jewelry. In her last letter to her friend Herta Ostermeyer, she wrote, "On no account must Heisey's bills be found. What should I say to you? I cannot understand how it should have come to all this, but it is impossible anymore to believe in God." Many of Hitler's inner circle made their plans to escape Berlin. Second in command, Hermann Göring, was one of them. Göring had told Hitler on his birthday that he had business to take care of and he needed to go over to southern Germany. That much was true. He was trying to ship his stolen art treasures out of Berlin. So like Braun, he was worried about losing things of monetary value. Not long after, it would get back to Hitler that Göring had spoken to the enemy. This infuriated Hitler, and it would make Göring a prominent feature in his will. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary in the Nazi Party Chancellery, was one of the inner circle to stay behind in the bunker. He'd later flee after seeing the end of his leader, but he'd be dead soon enough too. Then there was the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who was also there those last few days. He would be made Chancellor of Germany, but in the end he, his wife, and 6 kids would all be lost in that bunker. As Berliners were suffering unimaginable torments that late April, Goebbels made one final announcement. He said, "I call on you to fight for your city. Fight with everything you've got, for the sake of your wives and your children, your mothers and your parents. Your arms are defending everything we have ever held dear, and all the generations that will come after us. Be proud and courageous, be inventive and cunning." How both he and Hitler could still ask people to fight in the face of certain loss was a testament to their egoism and insanity. Then on April 27th, Hitler got word that another of his closest had betrayed him. He heard through a BBC report that Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler had tried to negotiate a surrender with the enemy. Hitler raged like he'd never raged before. To him, that meant one thing: treason. Hitler ordered the arrest of Himmler, after which Himmler went into hiding. He too didn't survive many more days. It was true, though, what Hitler had heard. Himmler had attempted to negotiate peace. Hitler's world was falling apart, but he still decided that there was still time to get married. At the stroke of midnight on April 28th, Hitler and Eva Braun tied the knot. Both Goebbels and Bormann were there at the ceremony, but as you can imagine, with the Red Army just around the corner, it wasn't the merriest of affairs. If there was any kind of event, it only involved having a wedding breakfast with booze, lots of booze. At some point, Braun signed off on the marriage certificate, and she wrote Eva B, only to cross out the B and then write Hitler. She was now proudly Eva Hitler, but she wouldn't get much time to enjoy the marriage. Hitler's barber, August Vollenhaupt, would usually trim his mustache at around 11 a.m. This was also usually the time that his valet Heinz Lenke would visit him each morning. Lenke would act as a kind of referee, saying the German for "on your marks" while holding a stopwatch. After that, Hitler would get ready as quickly as possible, as if playing a child's game. Then Lenke would pass Hitler his spectacles and the morning newspaper. One of those days close to his death, Hitler wasn't exactly in a great mood. He looked at Linge seriously and said, "You must never allow my corpse to fall into the hands of the Russians. They would make a spectacle in Moscow out of my body and put it in waxworks." Linge also gave Hitler some cocaine drops for his painful right eye. He also handed him some pills for a flatulence problem. Hitler had many health problems close to the end, for which he took something like 28 different medications. In fact, he was starting to look like a man on the verge of dying from natural causes. Hitler Youth, who later escaped the bunker, described what the Führer looked like during those final days. He said, "He was like a ghost. He didn't seem to see me or anyone. He just stared ahead, lost in thought." At that moment, the bunker was shaken by a strong tremor as a bomb hit. Dirt and mortar trickled down on us, but he made no attempt to brush it off. He looked so much more unhealthy than 10 days earlier at his birthday reception when I had first met him. It looked like he was suffering from jaundice. His face was shallow. It was around this time that Hitler had heard the news about the death of the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini. He'd been summarily executed, which could only mean one thing to Hitler. He too, he knew, would very likely suffer a similar fate. Even worse, he heard that Mussolini, along with his dead mistress, had been dumped like dead cattle in Milan's Palazzo Loreto. There, the crowd spat on their bodies before hanging them up by meat hooks. Hitler then heard that the Dachau concentration camp had fallen into the hands of the Americans. He very likely heard what happened there. The US soldiers had been so appalled to what they saw, they gave no quarter to the German soldiers they captured. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Now Sparks later said the smell of death was overpowering. What those soldiers witnessed was human cruelty on another level. It may never be known what happened on that day. Some reports say US soldiers massacred 520 Germans, but other reports say the number was as low as 50. After an investigation, it was ruled that while international law had been breached, in the light of the conditions which greeted the eyes of the first combat troops, it is not believed that justice or equity demand that the difficult and perhaps impossible task of fixing individual responsibility now be undertaken. Hitler, on hearing the news in his bunker, likely thought about this violent retribution, while the image of the dead Mussolini and his mistress were still in his mind. Also in the distance, he knew the Soviet army was laying waste to his city. It was around this time that Hitler called that secretary Traudl Junge. She would die an old woman in 2002 and always said she wasn't aware of the depth of Nazi atrocities. She also admitted she loved her dear leader, something in later life that gave her cause to feel guilty. She once said, "I admit I was fascinated by Adolf Hitler. He was a pleasant boss and a fatherly friend. I deliberately ignored all the warning voices inside me and enjoyed the time by his side, almost until the bitter end. It wasn't what he said, but the way he said things and how he did things." She said Hitler made it clear to everyone in the bunker that the one thing that he could not allow was his body to fall into the hands of the encroaching Soviets. As for the writing of his will, Junge had woken up from her usual nap around 11 p.m. After that, she went to see Hitler, as she would usually drink tea with him at that time. Hitler's vegetarian cook, Fraulein Constance Manzeili, also attended the tea-drinking sessions. But that night, when she knocked at the door, something was different. Hitler said to her, "Have you had a nice little rest, child?" She replied, "Yes, I've slept a little." Hitler said, "Come along, I want to dictate something." One thing he told her was that he wanted his body to be cremated. He said he wanted his art collection to go to a gallery in the town of Linz, which he called his hometown. As for the little things of perhaps more sentimental value, or what he called items for the maintenance of a modest, simple life, they should go to relatives and his faithful workers. Anything else of value, he said, should go to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Here's a snippet from his testament, word for word. "Since I did not think I should take responsibility for entering into marriage during the years of combat, I've decided now, before termination of my life on this earth, to marry the woman who, after many years of true friendship, entered voluntarily into this already almost besieged city to share my fate. She goes to death with me as my wife, according to her own desire." He then went for a bit talking about how he'd given his life to the service of his country, saying he had not intended to go to war in 1939. He said of the reason for the war, it was desired and provoked entirely by those international statesmen who were either of Jewish origin or worked in the Jewish interest. He had the gall to add, "The responsibility of the outbreak of this war cannot rest on me." He even said history won't blame him for the bloodbath of the war, but will blame international Jewry and its assistants. The British, he said, were offered a solution to what he called the Polish-German problem, but the responsible circles in English politics wanted war. He then called out Himmler and Göring as traitors and wrote down a list of names who should fulfill certain positions. His final words, "Above all, I obligate the leadership of the nation and its followers to the most minute observation of the radical laws and to pitiless resistance against the universal prisoner of all people, international Judaism." Given at Berlin, 29th of April 1945, 4 a.m., Adolf Hitler. There were 4 witness names: Goebbels, Bormann, Bergdorf, and Krebs. All four would soon be dead. Sometime later, while Hitler's SS bodyguards were destroying all the documents around the bunker, doctors followed orders and poisoned his much-loved Atlassian dog, Blondie. Braun's spaniel was also forced into the afterlife. It was around this time someone heard Braun say, "I would rather die here, I do not want to escape." A lot of silent handshaking took place as Hitler looked for the last time into the eyes of people that had supported him. It seems that Braun's last words were to the secretary Junge, who accepted the gift of a coat. With it, she heard the words, "Take my fur coat as a memory. I always like well-dressed women." It was Goebbels that announced the death of Hitler, stating in a message that the time of death was 3:30 p.m., April 30th. Hitler and Braun were subsequently cremated in the garden of the Reich Chancellery as Soviet artillery could be heard close by. Goebbels and Bormann soaked the bodies in petrol and lit them, after which they gave the Nazis salute. The fighting didn't just stop after that. As an observer of this extra bloodshed, a British lieutenant named David Fraser remarked, "There is still too much vile cruelty in the world for us to be able to say with true satisfaction good is victorious. Let's hope nothing like it ever happens again." Here at the Infographics Show, we try to brainstorm all kinds of topics we think you'll find interesting. But it's even better when we get a great suggestion from our viewers. Viewer Robert suggested we cover the many attempts to assassinate Adolf Hitler. It's quite a story, so Robert, here's the video. July 20th, 1944 was a sweltering day at Germany's Eastern Front headquarters, near the town then known as Rostenburg, East Prussia. Weather is always a factor in war, but even though there was no battle at Rostenburg that day, the unpleasant heat would alter the course of history. Someone made the call that it was too hot to hold the high-level meeting in the concrete bunker within the so-called Wolf's Lair or Wolfschanze. Instead, they would meet in a wooden room with windows. You'd think that the Nazi leadership would be more vulnerable in the less fortified setting, but the change of venue may have saved Adolf Hitler's life, at least for a little while. Today was to be the culmination of an assassination plot by the German resistance, including several high-ranking military officers and civilians, that had been years in the making. Hitler had no idea there was a briefcase containing a bomb underneath the oak table just 2 seats down from him. Neither did anyone else in the room, save the man who placed it there, Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Scheck von Stauffenberg, who excused himself on the pretext of making a phone call. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb went off and Stauffenberg hurried away to set the rest of the plan in motion. The July plot was only the latest of more than 30 assassination attempts against Hitler, both before and after he'd seized power. The Nazi dictator had literally been dodging bullets left and right. In 1921, an unknown person in a crowd took a shot at Hitler as he was speaking. 2 more shooting attempts followed in 1923. The first, also in a crowd, the second, a shot at the car Hitler was in. There were 4 attempts in 1932. The first in January was an attempted poisoning. Others dining with Hitler at Berlin's Hotel Kaiserhof contracted severe food poisoning. Hitler took ill as well, but wasn't as sick as the others, possibly because of his vegetarian diet. A few months later, someone fired a shot at the train carriage where Hitler was sitting. In June, a group planned to ambush Hitler's car, but without success. At a speech on July 29th, several people lobbed stones at him, one of which did hit him in the head, but not hard enough to take him out. In 1933, Karl Luttner, a communist and labor leader, plotted with others to kill Hitler by planting a bomb. The day before the election of March 5th, which brought Hitler to power, he was to deliver a public speech, and Luttner intended to use the opportunity to assassinate the Nazi leader before it was too late. But the authorities in what was still the Democratic Weimar Republic found out about the plan and arrested Luttner and his collaborators. Later that year, a separate group, never identified, dug a tunnel underneath a church in Potsdam where Hitler was scheduled to speak, accompanied by other Nazi leaders. Presumably, the tunnel would have been used to plant explosives had security forces not discovered it. As Hitler tightened his stranglehold over the German government, members of the right wing outside the Nazi circle also began to plot against him. Helmuth Mittlus, head of the radical middle-class party, joined forces with the retired Navy captain Hermann Ehrhardt to recruit 150 collaborators to infiltrate the SS. The plan was uncovered by the Gestapo, and most of the conspirators faced severe punishment. A few avoided discovery and remained in the army to continue the internal resistance. The Night of the Long Knives was a deadly purge of the SA, the Nazis' original core group, which was being sidelined in favor of the elite subgroup, the SS. Otto Strasser, a disaffected former Nazi whose brother was killed in the Night of the Long Knives, led other German exiles in Prague in the anti-Nazi Black Front. They carried out an unknown number of assassination attempts in the late 1930s. Joseph Goebbels named Strasser Germany's public enemy #1. In 1938, the military intelligence chief Major General Hans Oster, along with several other military leaders, conspired to arrest Hitler if he reneged on his commitment not to invade Western Czechoslovakia, which the Nazis called the Sudetenland. They were counting on British support for this action, which they intended as a prelude to the reinstatement of Kaiser Wilhelm II. But when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain acceded to Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland, the conspirators lost their opportunity. And instead of coming across as an illegal warmonger, Hitler gained popular support in the German public. Members of the Oster plot would also continue as part of a secret resistance. Also in 1938, Maurice Bavaud, a Swiss national who held the bizarre belief that killing the Führer would also somehow bring down the Soviet government and restore Russia's Romanov dynasty, launched a one-man operation. He planned to gun down the dictator at a party in Munich, celebrating the anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch. The Nazis' failed attempt to seize power in 1923, but he couldn't get a clear shot, and since he didn't want anyone else to die, he didn't fire. Bavaud then traveled to Berchtesgaden, where he hoped that forged documents might get him closer to his target. He learned that Hitler was still in Munich, so Bavaud tried to make his way back by train. He was arrested and confessed under interrogation by the Gestapo. Like several other would-be assassins, Bavaud was executed by guillotine. The following year, the carpenter George Elser skillfully hid a bomb inside a wooden pillar ahead of time for the Beer Hall Putsch anniversary and set it to go off at the customary time of the observance. But Hitler rushed for time, started and ended early, and was gone by the time the bomb exploded. Elser was caught, but the Gestapo kept him alive until almost the end of the war, believing that he must have been part of a conspiracy. If so, he didn't talk. Over time, the number of upper-level military leaders in the Wehrmacht with grievances against the Führer grew. Henning von Treschkow, part of the leadership in the German campaign against Russia, became the ringleader for Project Valkyrie, an elaborate plan to replace all of the Nazi leadership loyal to Hitler upon completion of an assassination. Following the fall of Stalingrad, Hitler paid a visit to the site in western Russia. Coup plotters considered simply shooting him while he was there, but that action was called off, in part because Himmler wasn't present. But there was a second strike in motion that went ahead. Treschkow asked Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Brandt, who would be flying with Hitler back to the headquarters in East Prussia, if he'd deliver a bottle of liqueur to a colleague. Brandt put the bottle in his luggage, unaware that it was a disguised bomb, which was timed to explode when the plane was over Minsk. But the bomb malfunctioned in the cold cargo hold. Learning that the plane had landed intact, Treschkow dispatched an aide to retrieve the bomb before it could be found out. In another attempt, Hitler, along with Himmler and Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, were reviewing new winter uniforms. The handsome officer, Axel von den Busche, who was to serve as model, volunteered for the suicide mission to wear a bomb under the overcoat, but the planned meeting was delayed. The conspirators continued seeking a chance to kill all three leaders at a stroke. In the end, Stauffenberg was the only conspirator who could get close enough to the increasingly wary Führer, who by now had decided it was a good idea to wear a bulletproof vest. A veteran of both the African and Russian campaigns, Stauffenberg had lost a hand and an eye in battle. He was to carry out the assassination, but many others now were involved in another key aspect of the plan, which required a military coup by the German Reserve Army. The co-plotters in Berlin would use the assassination as a false flag operation, accusing the Nazi leadership of taking out Hitler themselves, providing a pretext for the overthrow, after which they would sue for peace and restore civilian government and the rule of law. But first, they had to kill the man who had led Germany down the ruinous path of war. Friedrich Fromm, the Reserve Army's commander-in-chief, had agreed to turn a blind eye to the actions of the conspirators, but he appointed Stauffenberg as his chief of staff, enabling close access to Hitler during meetings. Without understanding the new subordinates' intentions, Stauffenberg was to carry a British-built briefcase bomb to the meeting at the Wolf's Lair. It was equipped with two explosive devices. After arriving at the fortress, Stauffenberg ducked away, saying he needed to change his shirt, but interruptions prevented him from arming both devices. He went ahead with the single bomb, though. The physics of a wooden porous room would make for a less deadly blast than the one that was sealed in concrete, so Stauffenberg made sure to sit as close to Hitler as he could, just one seat over. But this wasn't to be a suicide mission. After placing the briefcase under the table as close as he could manage, Stauffenberg slipped out, but once the spot at the table was empty, a colonel came to fill it, wanting a closer look at the maps being reviewed. Unknowingly, he kicked the briefcase behind a table leg. When the bomb went off, that made the difference. One person was killed instantly. 3 others later died of their injuries. Hitler was wounded. He suffered temporary paralysis and a dislocated arm. His buttocks were bruised and he had a broken eardrum. His pants were torn to shreds and his hair was a mess. But he lived, and that message was relayed to Berlin, preventing the coup. Hitler, who was now boasted of being immortal, gave the order that the conspirators should die like animals. They were hanged with meat hooks and piano wire. One account describes a prolonged torture, with the condemned repeatedly taken to the edge of death and then revived. The following year, the nightmare of the Nazi rule would end with the Soviet capture of Berlin, and Hitler would become his own last victim, shooting himself in the head rather than face justice for his crimes. In the early post-war years, German public opinion remained hostile to the conspirators in Operation Valkyrie, with most people considering them traitors. Meanwhile, following the Nuremberg trials, many rank-and-file Nazis received amnesty from the West German government. It took time, but Germans did come to confront their complicity in Nazi atrocities, and the view of the German resistance began to change. In the early 21st century, only a small minority of Germans polled held negative views of the resistance, who are now officially memorialized. Perhaps the greatest symbol of respect for the resistance fighters comes in a ceremony every year, when new recruits to the German military are sworn in on July 20th. Adolf Hitler was an idiot, and that's a good thing because it led him to make some really bad strategic decisions during World War II. If Hitler had been a little smarter, we might very well be living in a messed up Nazi-controlled world full of Hitler youth today. Luckily, that's not how history played out. As we progress through some of Hitler's worst decisions during World War II, you might be surprised to find that it was his ego, the name of an enemy, and his belief in the occult that partially cost him the war. Let's start at the beginning. When you're a genocidal maniac like Hitler, your choice of allies can end up being pretty slim. One of the main reasons that Hitler's Nazi Germany allied itself with Italy was because no one else was crazy enough to join him but Benito Mussolini. Most historians argue that Italy wasn't Hitler's first choice for an ally, or even his second or third choice, but when your entire platform is predicated on mass genocide and ruling the world in your own deranged way, not many people can be convinced to get on board. It was Mussolini's authoritarian rule and his dislike for Jewish people that made him the perfect ally for Hitler. However, allying himself with Benito was the first mistake Hitler would make that would eventually lead to him losing World War II. During wartime, you want a strong and independent ally who will have your back when things get tough and can bring something meaningful to the table. Mussolini's Italy was none of those things. Time and time again, Germany would have to bail out Italian forces as they continually became pinned down or surrounded by allies. This would cost Hitler greatly, as Germany would lose valuable resources and men whenever Italy failed its missions. Choosing the wrong ally was definitely one decision that cost Hitler in the long run, but it would not be the only one. The way he handled the North African campaign starting in 1940 ended up being a disaster to his cause. World War II started in Europe on September 1, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Axis forces swept across the continent, securing strategic positions and decimating anyone who stood in their way. However, the same cannot be said about their campaign in North Africa, as it was brought to a grinding halt by an unexpected force. The main objective of the North African campaign was to secure the Suez Canal, which would allow the Nazi forces to have better access to oil coming from the Middle East. The Nazis had some of the best tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels in the world, which gave them the upper hand in many battles. However, without oil to fuel these vehicles, they were useless. Originally, Hitler left Italy in charge of securing North Africa, while he focused on decimating Western Europe. This was his first mistake. Italy had trouble defeating Allied forces in the region from the beginning, and Hitler had to send his men and tanks down to bail them out. The distance between Germany and North Africa meant this would take time, but it had to be done if the Axis powers were going to control the region. Eventually, Hitler decided to send General Erwin Rommel to the region to command the German tank forces in North Africa. His mission was to sweep across the continent from Morocco to the Middle East, and once there, he'd be in charge of maintaining control of the vast oil reserves in the region. This was a wise strategic move for Hitler, but the execution was performed poorly. After some initial success, things started to fall apart in North Africa. The main problem was that Rommel just didn't have the resources or tanks necessary to get the job done. Rommel made it as far as Tobruk in Libya before he ran into some issues. He was able to capture the seaport of Tobruk, but once the Nazi forces began their advance further east, they were stopped by British General Bernard Montgomery and El Alamein. For 12 days, Nazi and Italian forces tried to break the British line without success. Hitler was furious with the lack of progress in North Africa. After a second defeat at El Alamein, Rommel returned to Europe. He complained that he should have been left with the tank battalions in North Africa, where he was sure he could eventually defeat the Allied troops. However, whether it was Hitler's direct orders or his influence over the Nazis' military, Rommel was forced to stay in Germany while his forces in North Africa were defeated. The Allies had secretly landed more troops in Morocco and Algeria. They charged across the region and eventually trapped the retreating Axis forces. Altogether, around 250,000 German and Italian troops were captured. This would be a definitive turning point in the war to control North Africa and led to a huge disruption in the oil supply that fueled the Nazi war machine. As a side note, Rommel was later accused and convicted for playing a role in the 20th of July plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. This led to the general being given two options: execution by the state or death by suicide. On October 14, 1944, Rommel bit down on a cyanide capsule and ended his life and career as a Nazi general. There's no clear evidence that Rommel actually played a role in the assassination attempt on Hitler's life. This may mean that rather than having a traitor killed, Hitler made the mistake of eliminating one of his best generals, as Rommel is traditionally seen as a brilliant commander in the field, and Hitler's mistakes would keep on coming. The United States played a major role in securing victory for Allied forces in Europe. However, one of the main reasons that the USA sent troops to Europe was because Hitler made the mistake of declaring war on the United States first. The US was sending supplies and resources to the Allies in Europe from very early on in the war. However, they had adopted somewhat of an isolationist policy and had no plans of directly intervening in Europe until December 11, 1941. That's when Hitler made another decision that would cost him the war. Early on in 1941, the United States had not sent or had plans to send troops to Europe. Then Pearl Harbor happened. Hitler had no idea that the Japanese were going to bomb Pearl Harbor, but he'd hoped from the beginning that Japan would pull the US into a war in the Pacific. This would cause them to focus their attention on the other side of the world, likely reducing the amount of supplies they were sending to Britain. Instead of letting those events play out, Hitler did something really dumb. He started attacking American supply ships in the Atlantic and immediately declared war on the US. Hitler was delusional, and he thought even if he destroyed American convoys and declared war on the country, the US would still be too preoccupied with Japan to retaliate. However, nothing could have been further from the truth. The United States' economy was incredibly strong and had already begun ramping up wartime production. They had the men, the resources, and now the motive to fight a war on two fronts. At the time, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was still on the fence about whether troops should be sent to Europe or if the United States should solely focus on Japan. But Hitler's decision to declare war on the US prematurely made the decision easy for him. America would go to war with Nazi Germany and kick their ass, and Hitler only had himself to blame. Just to put it in perspective on how big of a mistake this was, every year of the war, the United States constructed twice as many planes and war vehicles as Nazi Germany did. The United States also had immense resources and a huge labor pool to pull from. With everyone now united under the declaration of war against the United States by Adolf Hitler, the whole country put everything they had into the war effort to defeat Nazi Germany. In the summer of 1941, Hitler would make a decision that would cost him enormous amounts of men, resources, and pretty much the war itself. On June 22nd, the Nazis launched Operation Barbarossa. At the beginning of the war, Hitler was smart enough to have Soviet Russia sign a non-aggression pact, which ensured that they wouldn't attack Germany from the east. This allowed him to focus his attention on Western Europe and defeating Great Britain. However, Hitler was not smart enough to not break his own pact. He launched an invasion into Russia, which meant Germany now had to fight countries to its east and west, defeating the purpose of preventing a two-front war. This decision was a huge mistake and one of the critical factors that cost him the war. At first, Nazi Germany seemed to have the upper hand. Stalin was delusional and thought that there was no way Hitler would break his promise and invade Russia. But this was Adolf Hitler we're talking about, and he obviously couldn't be trusted. The Germans amassed forces along the Russian border. In fact, they weren't even very discreet about it. Hitler had always planned to invade the Soviet Union. He just wanted to wait until all of Europe was under his control first. However, with resources running low and the need for a new source of labor, Hitler launched his invasion early. He fully committed to this decision, even though many of his military advisors warned that conquering the Soviet Union and fighting a two-front war would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. He ignored them and launched the offensive into Russia anyway. At the beginning of the invasion, the Nazis were winning almost every battle. Hitler patted himself on the back for a job well done and scoffed at anyone who was still wary of sending troops into Russian territory. History has shown that trying to take over Russia never works out well for the invading force. Nazi morale was high as they marched further and further into the Soviet Union. The dirt roads were passable in the summer months, and the Nazi uniforms provided enough warmth to stay relatively comfortable even at night. Hitler was so convinced that the war in Russia would be over quickly that he held off on sending more supplies and winter gear to the troops who were advancing further into the Soviet Union. But as the winter months approached, the weather began to change. The tide of the war in Russia was about to shift. Operation Barbarossa was a massive offensive with 3 different attack forces spread across approximately 1,800 miles of land. As all 3 parts of the German army started to reach their objectives, they were slowed down by terrible weather, lack of food, and depletion of resources. The Russian people destroyed their own villages, farms, and factories as they retreated further into the Soviet Union to get away from the Nazi invasion. Hitler's original plan had been to resupply his troops using Russian resources as they made their way across the country. It was too long a distance to constantly be resupplying his forces from Germany. Plus, the whole point of invading the Soviet Union was to secure more resources. However, the Russian people left very little of use behind due to their scorched earth policy. When the northern offensive reached Leningrad, they thought that it would fall quickly as the rest of Russia did, but this was not the case. The Germans couldn't manage to secure Leningrad from the Russians, and resources were running dangerously low. On top of that, the Nazi forces in the south also ran into trouble. They were stopped dead in their tracks by entrenched Russian soldiers and couldn't advance any further. Hitler was furious. He ordered the middle offensive to send troops to the north and south, which weakened the middle force while not improving the situation in the other regions by much. The slowing down of the German advance allowed the Soviets to regroup. Over 1 million troops and 1,000 tanks were sent to Moscow to protect the capital. The Nazis were now stopped on all fronts. They couldn't manage to take Leningrad in the north, and due to their Soviet reinforcements in the middle of the country and the changing of the weather, capturing Moscow was a lost cause as well. It was becoming more and more clear that Hitler's decision to invade Russia was a huge mistake. The Germans had not brought enough winter supplies due to Hitler's overconfidence. He also gravely underestimated the resilience of the Russian people and how many of them would join in the cause to stop Germany from taking their land. Stalin had a huge population to fuel his war machine, and the resources contained within the Soviet Union's borders allowed them to quickly resupply, while the Germans struggled to get simple things such as food and warm clothes to their troops. While the invasion of Soviet Russia was failing, Hitler seemed to lose his mind. He started blaming everyone else for his bad decisions. This led to another huge mistake. Rather than listening to his generals and advisors who knew more about war than he did, Hitler decided to make himself commander-in-chief of the Nazi army. He couldn't believe that his troops hadn't yet secured Russia. They would have to double their efforts, and anyone who ever mentioned the word retreat would be executed. Everyone who had been serving on the front lines of the war knew that trying to subdue Russia and take its capital would be a lost cause, but Hitler would hear none of it. He wanted Moscow to fall, and he wanted it bad. So he put himself in charge of the military to make sure that no one did anything rash like withdraw and come up with a better plan. Hitler was going to take Russia or lose the war trying, which is exactly what he did. He had to put himself in an unwinnable position, fighting 2 fronts while also bringing the United States into the fray. And he was quickly running out of resources. Things were about to go from bad to worse, and it all had to do with Hitler's next few decisions. Hitler often let his feelings get in the way of making good wartime decisions, and perhaps there's no better example than the Battle of Stalingrad, which began in August of 1942 as part of the Nazis' southern advance into Russia. The city was a manufacturing hub for the Soviets, which meant it had great strategic importance. The Nazis did not necessarily need to secure the entire city in order to disrupt the Russian supply chain. Instead, all they really needed was to blockade Stalingrad to make sure nothing got in or out. However, Hitler had something else in mind. For Hitler, there was almost nothing more important than taking the city of Stalingrad. Not because of its importance, but because it was named after Joseph Stalin, the then leader of the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that it'd be a huge blow to Russian morale and a huge boost to his own ego if the Nazis took the city bearing the leader's name. To be fair, Stalingrad would have provided the Nazis with desperately needed fuel and supplies, but Hitler couldn't help but let his feelings get involved in this wartime decision. For 3 months, the Nazis tried to take the city. They were unsuccessful due to Hitler's obsession with conquering Russia on all fronts, rather than focusing his troops on one location. The Nazis even had taken much of the oil fields and resource-rich areas of Ukraine and Crimea. But rather than holding the line and coming up with a better plan, Hitler ordered his troops forward to the meat grinder of Stalingrad. This was a huge mistake because it left their rear flank vulnerable to counterattack. Whether Hitler realized this and just didn't care or he was too focused on taking Stalingrad to notice is up for debate. Regardless, Soviet generals did notice and they sent a force to attack the rear guard of the Nazi army. The Soviets managed to break through the Nazi defenses and surround them. This allowed the Soviets to cut off desperately needed supplies by capturing military bases and airfields as they tightened their hold in the region. Hitler ordered General Friedrich Paulus, who was in charge of the Nazi forces in southern Russia, to continue fighting or be court-martialed and let someone else take over. Paulus decided to take the third option and save the lives of many of his men as possible by surrendering to the Soviets instead. Due to Hitler's crazed attempt to take Stalingrad, which was done mostly because of the name, the Nazis lost hundreds of thousands of men in southern Russia. After Stalingrad, there was no hope of Hitler turning the war around. The Nazi forces were now retreating back toward Germany, the Soviets capturing anything they left behind and wiped out Nazi forces that got in their way. By the beginning of 1943, not only had Hitler lost millions of troops and vehicles, but he was losing the confidence of his people. The low morale of civilians and military personnel alike would cause the Nazi war machine to be less effective. Early footage of Nazi rallies show huge crowds of enthralled people hanging on Hitler's every word. However, after the Eastern Front began to collapse and the threat of a Soviet invasion loomed on the horizon, the German people started to panic and lose faith in their fearless leader. The final nail in the coffin was the failed attempt to invade the Soviet Union and secure Moscow and Stalingrad. This wiped out any remaining morale left in the German people. To make matters worse, Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just met in Casablanca and decided it was time to commence bombing runs on German soil. This led to death and destruction at home, which the German people had not experienced up to this point. It was a real eye-opener that their Führer might not be able to deliver on all the promises he made, and the war might be in fact a total loss. At the end of the summer in 1943, incendiary bombs were dropped on Hamburg. The destruction and fire they caused destroyed practically the entire city and killed around 40,000 people. After the bombing run, approximately 900,000 Germans were left homeless. The war had now become very real for the average German citizen. It also became clear that many in the military were losing faith in the Führer. Over 20,000 Nazi troops were court-martialed and executed for various reasons, most of which stemmed from their lack of confidence in Adolf Hitler. Without the trust and enthusiasm of his people and military personnel, there was no way that Hitler could win the war. The only thing worse for Hitler than having the Russians closing in from the east, Italy falling apart in the south, and military supplies running low on all fronts would be if the British and Americans somehow managed to land in France and secure a foothold on mainland Europe. On June 6, 1944, Hitler's worst fear came to be. On top of being crazy, egotistical, and power-hungry monster, Hitler was also gullible. He allowed the Allies to trick him and his generals into deploying troops at the wrong locations along the Atlantic Wall as D-Day was carried out. The Allies knew they'd be landing at Normandy, but they definitely didn't want Hitler to know that, so they used false radio broadcasts, dummy aircraft, and misinformation to trick Hitler into moving his forces away from the actual landing zones. The plan worked, and when Allied forces stormed the beaches, they met much less resistance than they would have otherwise. There's no doubt that the D-Day invasion was a gruesome and terrible moment in World War II history that cost the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers, but it ended up being successful because of the Allies' ability to trick Hitler. With Allied troops now on mainland Europe, there was nowhere to run. Nazi forces were recalled back to the fatherland as an invasion of Germany was now imminent. All of the key events mentioned thus far were not the only reasons Hitler lost the war. There were some factors that Hitler handled poorly throughout the entire conflict that led to his demise. These can't be pinpointed to a specific event or battle, but instead show how a bloodthirsty tyrant can let his vision for world domination get in his own way. Perhaps the biggest mistake that Hitler made was overextending his forces. This was such a problem because throughout the war, maintaining supply lines was a huge issue for the Nazis. They constantly found themselves in need of more resources, the most important of which were fuel and food to supply their vehicles and troops. In the initial months of the war, Axis powers secured vast amounts of land across Europe and North Africa. However, this meant that supplies and resources needed to travel incredibly long distances to reach troops. Vehicles and ammunition that were made in Germany could take weeks or months to reach the front lines. Might sound crazy, but Nazi Germany even had to rely pretty heavily on horses to transport supplies to some regions due to a lack of vehicles and landscape. This meant Hitler's war machine moved quickly at first, but then came to a grinding halt, as supplies took forever to get where they needed to go. If he was somehow able to quickly move the resources and his troops needed throughout the entire war, it's likely Hitler could have won. The German supply line also forced Hitler into one of the biggest mistakes in World War II. Nazi forces needed oil, and they needed a lot of it. This was the main reason why Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. If he had been able to secure oil, steel, and food from any other source, he could have avoided starting a war with Russia, which would have meant Germany wouldn't have needed to fight a war on two fronts. Therefore, it was the lack of resources and supply line issues that were the overarching cause that led to Adolf Hitler losing World War II. Perhaps the most surprising factor that led to Hitler's defeat wasn't anything to do with the military or supply chain at all. Instead, perhaps his obsession with magic and the occult was a driving factor behind some of his worst decisions. The Nazis' fascination with the occult wasn't just made up to create Indiana Jones movies. Instead, mysticism played a pretty important role in Hitler's decision-making policies. For example, the Nazis were constantly on the search for the Holy Grail, as the promise of everlasting life Adolf was a huge draw for Hitler and his entourage of occultists. Hitler and the rest of the Nazi leadership were not Christians, but they still believed that certain relics were imbued with mystical powers. But the search for mystical relics was only one aspect of Hitler's use of the occult. He actually used pretty strange practices to help make some wartime decisions as well. Some accounts report that Hitler and Nazi military leaders frequently used a pendulum and dowsing rod to determine the location of Allied warships on maps of the ocean. These devices have no actual magical powers or any measurable effect on determining the location of an object, including naval vessels, so any decisions made using these techniques would be as good as if Hitler had just closed his eyes and randomly pointed to an area on the map with his finger to determine where the Allied forces were. Other important military decisions were made under the advisement of astrologers, magicians, and tarot card readers. Again, there's no scientific basis that any of these practices can have a positive effect on wartime decisions. Belief in the occult and mysticism definitely played less of a role in Hitler losing World War II than the other factors discussed in this video, but you can't help but wonder how many of his bad decisions were actually the result of following the advice of psychics or in pursuit of some magical artifact. Conspiracy theories have been running rampant recently. Sometimes they can be harmless, other times they can cause serious confusion. What would happen if the most evil man in history didn't die the way we thought he had? What if Adolf Hitler actually escaped his fate and was able to live out his life in relative peace? It's unthinkable, yet some people believe this is what happened. The conventional theory is that Hitler took his own life by cyanide and a gunshot to the head in a Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in from all sides. But another theory has been floating around for decades, that Hitler actually escaped Germany and fled to Argentina, where he lived out the rest of his days in secret. Is there any evidence to support this escape theory? Where did this theory even start? Let's find out. Hitler's death is recorded as being April 30th, 1945. On May 1st, 1945, Supreme Commander of the Navy, Admiral Karl Donitz, who was designated successor to Hitler, officially announced the death of the Führer. That same year, the war came to an end in Europe, and British counterintelligence officer Hugh Trevor Roper was tasked with determining the actual cause of death for Adolf Hitler. To this point in time, the Soviet forces were the only ones in Berlin who had access to the remains of Hitler, and they were not very forthcoming with the details of the Führer's death. Not only were the Soviets shady about releasing the information on what happened to Hitler, but since they refused to hand over any remains or evidence as to what happened to the Nazi leader, rumors started to circulate. Even Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was recorded as mentioning that perhaps Hitler had escaped to Argentina after all. This had Hugh Trevor Roper worried. He needed to get to the bottom of what actually happened to the leader of the Axis powers. And as he dug deeper, Trevor Roper found that the disorganization of the Soviets was part of the problem. They may not have been withholding information so much as just misplacing or not knowing where things were. All Trevor Roper knew at this point in time was that the Soviets possessed a statement of Hitler's death. They had conducted an investigation at the bunker where the suicide took place 2 days after it happened, and they had captured key members of the Nazi Party who claimed to be eyewitnesses to the events in said bunker. Trevor Roper worried that the lack of evidence the Soviets were providing may have somehow been motivated by the beginnings of the Cold War. The Soviets may have been posturing and taking credit for Hitler's death as a show of power. Without concrete evidence, Trevor Roper could not be sure. It did not help that the Soviet leaders were uncooperative or forthcoming with information pertaining to Hitler's death. Trevor Roper would wait long periods of time before questions were answered or any tangible evidence was provided. Again, it did not help that the leadership of the Soviet Union was doing very little in public statements to dissuade any conspiracy theories about Hitler's death or provide the public with concrete information to prove that Hitler had killed himself in a bunker. In a public address, Soviet Marshal Zhukov and Colonel General Berzarin went as far as to speculate that perhaps Hitler had escaped from the bunker and was hiding out in Spain. It seemed that even the communication with the Soviet leadership was in conflict, so it was no wonder that Trevor Roper couldn't obtain clear evidence. The British intelligence officer was unable to make sense of the messaging or lack of the evidence and concluded that it might have been a tactic used to create suspicion and distrust among Allied forces. This would leave the Soviet Union in a more powerful position as the Cold War started to unfurl. Trevor Roper himself even said, "The infallible Stalin had declared the truth, before which the inconvenient evidence must bow and retire," meaning this misinformation campaign could all be a matter of Stalinist orthodoxy to further the Soviet agenda. Trevor Roper would leave Germany empty-handed with only speculation and the word of the Soviets that Hitler was in fact dead. The alternative was unthinkable, but the messaging was mixed and there was no official documents or remains handed over to the British intelligence officer to come to a concrete conclusion. In fact, it would take until 1968 until the Soviets divulged the information that resulted from the detailed investigation they'd conducted at the bunker. The results of the investigation were finally made public, and the cause of Hitler's death as suicide could be confirmed, at least for the time being. So it would seem that the theory that Hitler had escaped with his wife Eva Braun to Argentina started as early as 1945 by the Soviets right after the war in Europe ended. But there were other aspects that fueled the fire of this conspiracy theory. Even in the United States, people started believing that American intelligence officials allowed Hitler to escape in return for advanced Nazi technology. In 1945, British newspapers repeated the comments of disinformation from the leaders of the Soviet Union, creating a sense of uncertainty as to what actually happened to Hitler. The papers even reported that the charred body discovered by the Soviets in the bunker was actually a very poor double of the Führer. This rhetoric led to several wild conspiracy theories about Hitler's escape. Some claimed he went to Argentina or Spain, others that he somehow made it to the moon and built a Nazi empire there. However, all credible historians agree that Hitler killed himself on April 30, 1945 in Berlin. Is there any real evidence to contradict the historical account of what happened to Adolf Hitler? Some rogue researchers would argue that several lines of evidence point to Hitler fleeing to Argentina instead of meeting his ultimate demise in Berlin. There were declassified FBI documents that contained a number of alleged sightings of Hitler after he was supposed to have died. However, mustaches similar to Hitler's, think Charlie Chaplin, were in fashion during the time, and people's eyes and brain can trick them into seeing things that are not actually there. Just think of how many people see a man's face on the moon. Also, the FBI made public statements saying that the sightings of Hitler could not be verified in any credible way. Some other rogue researchers used lack of evidence early on to suggest that Hitler's body was never actually found. This meant that he must have escaped. Unfortunately, forensic methods at the time of Hitler's death were not as advanced as they are today, but recently forensic anthropologists and scientists have gone back to analyze the bone fragments and teeth of Hitler that are housed in Russia. Their findings are very interesting. More recently, the theory that Hitler escaped to Argentina became popular again in 2014 with a book called The Grey Wolf. It seemed like around this time there was no shortage of conspiracy theory shows circulating the television networks or books being published. The book Grey Wolf was researched and written by the British authors Simon Dunstan and Gerard Williams. The authors proposed that rather than Hitler killing Eva Braun and himself, he faked their deaths, boarded a U-boat accompanied by a high-ranking Nazi official and treasures collected during the war, and made their way to South America. The authors claimed that Hitler already had connections to the future president of Argentina, Juan Perón, who had received money from the Nazis during World War II. In Grey Wolf, Hitler makes a daring escape, crosses the Atlantic completely undetected, sails around the tip of South America, and lands in Argentina. He moves around for a bit and then settles to live out the rest of his life quietly and happily, two things that Adolf Hitler was not known for. The book claims Hitler actually died in February of 1962. Just thinking about Hitler's personality, it seems that he would not have been able to contain his enthusiasm for destruction and genocide. He most likely would have tried to carry out this vision of a Third Reich in South America. But like the entirety of the Grey Wolf book, this is just speculation. Dunstan and Williams explained that it may have been possible for Hitler to fund his escape using the treasures he stole from around the world. He may have even been the wealthiest person on the planet during the height of World War II. The funds would have been used to hire the men he needed to flee to Argentina and keep everyone silent about his plans by paying them off. Again, all the evidence that Grey Wolf presents is tentative at best and easily disprovable at worst. In fact, the authors were accused by Argentinian researcher and author Abel Basti for plagiarizing his work. Basti claims that his research was used by Dunstan and Williams without citing him properly. He also claims that they misrepresented some of his research in their book. Basti signed a contract with Williams stating that he would introduce the author to two key witnesses that would provide credibility to his theory. Basti held up his end of the bargain but was never paid by Williams. It doesn't bode well for the reliability of Dunstan and Williams that they used people in Argentina to try to fit evidence into their theory instead of allowing the evidence to speak for itself and coming to a logical conclusion. It also doesn't seem like Dunstan and Williams treated people they hired or other researchers with respect, but that's just an observation. Regardless, Grey Wolf was torn apart by historians and established World War II researchers as soon as it came out. There was no actual evidence in the book that could prove the theory of Hitler escaping to Argentina or contradict history. Around the same time as Grey Wolf, the History Channel premiered a series called Hunting Hitler. The show claimed to have uncovered previously classified documents of interviews with witnesses who claimed Hitler escaped from Germany and traveled to Argentina by U-boat. However, upon scrutiny of the documents by historians, they were debunked. This was not discussed on the Hunting Hitler TV show, which probably led to people further spreading unsubstantiated claims that Hitler made it to Argentina. This brings us to the end of the journey down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories about Adolf Hitler escaping to Argentina. So what really happened to Adolf Hitler, and how do we know? That answer is simple. Hitler killed Eva Braun and himself in the Berlin bunker, just like historians have maintained all these years. We know this from several lines of evidence, but it's also okay to trust the experts in their field. Historians have their work peer-reviewed and scrutinized over by other academics. When experts in the field come to a consensus, it's a safe bet you can believe them. But if you want even more evidence that Hitler committed suicide, here you go. In a recent study, French scientists analyzed the fragments of Hitler's teeth that are kept secured in Russia. We know they're his teeth because experts scoured dental records from the Nazi regime and found multiple copies of Adolf Hitler's dental files. The teeth the Russians have are an exact match. At the time of death, Hitler only had 4 real teeth remaining, which are all in very bad shape. Upon analysis, the scientists confirmed that the residue and deterioration of the teeth are consistent with the vegetarian diet that Adolf Hitler ate. They also concluded that Hitler did in fact take cyanide before the gunshot to his head, but it's still unclear if it was enough of the poison to have killed him on his own. Experts have examined the teeth and fragments of the skull, concluded that the remains belonged to Hitler, and as the Soviet reports indicated, he was killed by a gunshot wound to the head. All of the evidence corroborates what historians have known for decades. Hitler committed suicide in a Berlin bunker on April 30, 1945. As it turns out, Hitler's escape to Argentina was just a fabricated myth. It may have just started as a misinformation campaign by Stalin and the leaders of the Soviet Party, or it could have just developed from the media and public wanting a little more excitement in their lives. Either way, there is no concrete evidence to support the escape to Argentina conspiracy theory, and there's ample amount of evidence to support what experts have been saying all along. One stray bullet, one artillery round fired just a second later. That's all it would have taken to end the life of history's most infamous mass murderer. How in the world did Hitler survive World War I? Prior to the war to end all wars, Hitler was living in Vienna as a starving artist. The city was the cultural mecca of the world at the time, and Hitler had come with hopes of joining the prestigious Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. However, his drawings were so poor that he was denied even a chance at taking the official exam. This deeply affected the already moody, disenfranchised teenager, spinning him even further into a world of his own making. By all accounts, Hitler was a moody, largely insufferable young man who loved to launch into spirited political speeches and debates, but would immediately be enraged if anyone corrected him on any matter. Today, he'd be the reason video games have ban lists. He also showed no interest in the few women who were attracted to him, preferring to remain solitary and rebuffing any women who wished to get near him. Making no effort to find a job, he believed he was above doing common work. Hitler lived on ever-shrinking savings, spending what little money he did have attending the opera in the evenings and dressing like a young gentleman. When his friend was accepted into the Vienna Conservatory to study music, Hitler was naturally enraged and one day left the apartment the two shared without warning. On his own in Vienna, Hitler was forced to move from place to place, but his lack of family or friends in the city made it difficult to find permanent housing. Despite his money running out, Hitler still refused to find work and instead pawned all his possessions and started sleeping outside on park benches. He was soon starving in the street, a miserable, smelly wretch of a man, until he was accepted into a local homeless shelter. Finally, Hitler deigned to stoop so low as to work shoveling snow or doing some other physical labor in order to earn some cash. He maintained his lifestyle for a few years, becoming exposed to the political chaos of Vienna in the final days of the weakening Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It was here that he began to form his hard-edged anti-Semitist views, despite the fact that he had befriended a Jewish man who helped Hitler sell artwork to local shops so he could earn a meager living. Many of these same shops were run by Jews, and without them, Hitler would have been starving again. Hitler continued his habit of long speeches, immediately flying into a rage if anyone opposed or corrected him. With war looming in the horizon, Hitler was summoned for a military service, but seethed with hatred at the idea of serving in the mixed-race Austrian-Hungarian military. Instead, Hitler opted to ignore his draft letter, and with the help of his inheritance he received upon his father's death, he moved to Munich. If war was going to break out, he wanted to serve in a pure-race German military, not the mongrel military of the cosmopolitan Austrian-Hungarian Empire. The Austrian authorities, however, tracked Hitler down in Munich and arrested him. Hitler was now in serious trouble, as he was facing prison time for dodging the draft. However, he wrote an impassioned letter to the Austrian consulate, apologizing for skipping out his military service and speaking about his difficult and troubled youth. The consulate was so impressed that Hitler was not punished for dodging the draft, but he was, however, forced to return and serve anyway. Hitler easily failed the required medical exam and was soon free to return to Munich, despite the fact that he should have been deported by the German authorities. To this day, no one knows why this didn't happen, or how it could have changed history. In Munich, Hitler spent the short time before the war once more painting to make a living, selling cheap paintings of local landmarks to tourists and shops. One day, Hitler was asked how he planned to make a permanent living, to which Hitler ominously replied that it did not matter, as soon there would be war. Hitler would prove to be terrifyingly right. On August 1, 1914, Hitler gathered along with a horde of other people in a big public plaza in Munich. A city official hastily addressed the crowd. War had been brewing for over a year, and now it was official. Germany was at war with the Russian Empire. The assembled people began to celebrate the glorious conquest that was to come, with a jubilant Hitler standing in their midst. 2 days later, Hitler volunteered to enlist in the German army and would enlist in a Bavarian regiment. In the words of history's worst mass murderer, "For me, as for every German, there now began the greatest and most uncomfortable time of my earthly existence. Compared to the events of this gigantic struggle, everything past receded to shallow nothingness." Hitler was assigned to the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 16, and as soon as he saw battle at the First Battle of Ypres, a battle that would come to be known to the Germans as the Massacre of the Innocents for the incredible casualties inflicted on the young, inexperienced recruits of the German army. As one of the first battles of World War I, it was expected to be quick and decisive action with a clear victor and loser. However, military commanders on both sides were beginning to realize that modern weapons were making mass battles all but impossible, and that the invention of modern artillery and the machine guns so heavily favored the defender that battles would grind to a stalemate. With both sides dug into miles of trenches, Hitler would find himself in one of those soaked, miserable trenches, battling the elements, Allied artillery bombardments, and the general misery of a gridlocked war. Despite this, though, Hitler was actually in high spirits. After so many years of being a disenfranchised youth, Hitler had finally found people he fit in with, and a place where his ultra-nationalistic far-right views were welcomed. Nonetheless, the First Battle of Ypres proved to be a relentless meat grinder, with the only way to secure victory being through massed assault against Allied trenches defended by machine guns and artillery. These human wave attacks proved to be devastatingly costly for both sides, but the failure of the German army to break the Allied lines would set the Germans on a defensive posture for the rest of the war, as their grand strategy was rethought. Rather than try and defeat the Allies as a whole unit militarily, they would hold a defensive posture in the west while assaulting the east, until the Russian Empire was forced to peace terms and the entire German military could be brought to bear on the Western Allies. Germany suffered upwards of 130,000 casualties in a month of fighting, and yet miraculously Hitler managed to survive every action relatively unharmed. He even began to grow a reputation for being incredibly lucky, always managing to avoid an exploding artillery shell that moments later killed or seriously injured the men Hitler had just been chatting with. In Hitler's mind, it was only further proof that he was destined for some great work. The horrible casualties Hitler saw inflicted on both sides, though, took their toll on the young dictator-to-be, and he became even more sullen and reserved. Hitler's unit had entered the battle with 3,600 men, but at its end only had 611 fit for duty. Hitler began to withdraw from others, the stress of the slaughter taking its toll on his mind. Hitler was soon promoted to Lance Corporal and assigned to become a regimental message runner. While many have claimed that this was a safe job in the rear areas, it's unclear if Hitler truly did operate in the rear areas, or if he had a more dangerous job of running messages along the actual front. Hitler was thought of as a peculiar loner by his comrades, and he was teased for his aversion to graphic stories of sexual conquest, earning the nickname Adi. He was also a staunch non-smoker and would trade his tobacco rations for the jam rations of other soldiers. Well liked, Hitler was still thought of as a strange individual who would only grow more sullen and distant as the war progressed and gradually turned against Germany. At times, he was known to leap up off his cot and launch into a rant about Germany's invisible enemies, namely Jews and Marxists. Even with his peculiarities, Hitler was thought of as eager to please his superiors and commended for his bravery. Despite his willingness to serve, though, Hitler was passed up for promotion repeatedly, as his superiors believed that he was simply not a commanding enough figure to earn the respect of the men placed under him. The peculiarities of his personality and the obvious fact that he did not belong in a military organization also influenced the decision to not promote him to sergeant. If Hitler was frustrated by this, he never showed it, and instead continued to serve dutifully. During lulls in fighting, Hitler would paint landscapes of the war, and at one point adopted a stray dog which he nicknamed Fuchsel. The dog quickly became a beloved pet to Hitler and would follow him everywhere that his unit deployed to. He taught Fuchsel many tricks, and the dog quickly became a favorite amongst the soldiers. Then one day in August of 1917, Hitler's regiment was sent to a quieter sector of the front in Alsace for a bit of rest. Tragically, someone stole Fuchsel during the regiment's transition and even went so far as to pilfer Hitler's artwork. The loss of Fuchsel broke Hitler's heart, and he finally took his first leave of the war, taking an 18-day leave to Berlin to stay with the family of a fellow soldier. In Berlin, Hitler was shocked at the anti-war sentiment of the civilian population. The promised rapid defeat of the Allies had turned into a 3-year-long meat grinder that was taking the lives of thousands of young men every day. The civilian population was sick of it, and the war's popularity was rapidly declining. Hitler, however, blamed this collapse and community morale on the hidden agents working to undermine the glorious Germany, Jews and Marxists, who hoped to see the German Empire collapse. Disgusted by what he saw taking place back home, Hitler quickly returned to duty, showing once more incredible luck at avoiding death or serious injury. Just a year earlier, during the Battle of Selma, Hitler had been wounded in his left thigh by an exploding shell. That shell wiped out several of Hitler's fellow message runners when it exploded right at the entrance of the dispatch runner's dugout. Hitler, as usual, had just left the location, but was near enough to be struck. As a result of his injury, Hitler spent 2 months at a Red Cross hospital and was scheduled to be transferred back to Munich to work at the depot. However, Hitler wrote an impassioned letter to his commanding officer, asking that he be allowed to return to the regiment because he couldn't stand the thought of being in the safety of home while his fellow soldiers fought and died on the front. Impressed by his sense of duty and bravery, Hitler was allowed to return to the front. His next injuries would come as a result of gas attacks. During a chlorine gas attack, Hitler and his comrades were temporarily blinded. A follow-on mustard gas attack took Hitler's voice, which would also return in time. Due to his injuries, however, Hitler was sent to a hospital in Passewijk behind the lines. It was there, while lying in his hospital bed, that Hitler's thoughts became increasingly darker as he contemplated the defeat of glorious Germany. Then, on November 10th, a pastor tending to the sick and wounded broke the worst news of Hitler's life. Germany had surrendered to the Allies. Upon hearing the news, Hitler would later recount that he immediately suffered a second bout of blindness. Hitler's military career was an honorable and distinguished one, receiving the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914 and the Iron Cross First Class, a rare honor for such a low-ranking soldier, in 1918. He showed bravery throughout the war, and while he was never quite the military man that he would claim in his own later fictionalized account of his service, he was a dutiful and obedient soldier. Sadly, the Great War would further taint the mind of the troubled young man, and in his own mind, blame for the defeat of Germany would not be due to superior Allied economies and numbers, but because of Jewish and communist enemy agents working to undo the great German people from within. Hitler would vow that he would be the one to make Germany great once more, and he'd have his revenge on those that tried to end its existence. For most of World War II, Italy was Adolf Hitler's ally. But then, seemingly overnight, the Italians betrayed him. They would pay dearly for such insolence. But why did Italy betray Hitler in the first place? You'd think it'd be on moral grounds for the atrocities he committed, but that's not the real reason. In fact, from entering the war to betraying the Nazis, Italy's World War II involvement was questionably bizarre. The entrance of Italy into World War II was a little shady for a couple reasons. The first was obviously that they sided with the Nazis, but the second had to do more with the timing. When Italy joined the war, it looked like Germany was going to win. Italy had been holding out for a bit and seemed to be hedging their bets. It wasn't until Mussolini and the other members of the Italian government thought that Hitler was going to win the war that they decided to throw their support behind him. When France fell, it seemed like joining the Germans in their conquest of Europe was a safe bet. Italian leaders hoped that by joining what looked like the winning side, they would be rewarded with land and the spoils of war. It seems that Italy was more interested in gaining power for itself than the morality of what was being fought over during World War II. However, that can be said about many of the countries involved in the conflict. If the beginning of World War II had been different, and the Allies looked like they were going to win, Italy's decision of which side to join may have been very different. But that's not what happened, and in 1939 Italy signed the Pact of Steel with Germany, making them part of the Axis powers. 4 years later, on October 13, 1943, Italy would betray their former ally and switch sides to fight alongside the Allied forces to defeat Hitler. But how did they go from backing one of the world's most terrible genocidal maniacs to joining the Allies? There were several key factors, but surprisingly most had to do with the way Italy viewed itself. As soon as Italy entered World War II, they were in trouble. Benito Mussolini ruled the country as a dictator, which many people were in favor of at the time. What the Italians seemed to want more than anything else was a powerful Italy. Mussolini was the man who promised he could provide this, so much of the population went along with his fascist agenda. One of the many problems Mussolini had with running the country and fighting the war was that he cared more about loyalty than experience when it came to appointing generals and military leaders. This led to some dire consequences for Italy during World War II and was the first step in what would eventually lead to their betrayal of Hitler and the Axis powers. Once Italy joined the war, they immediately sent forces to invade Greece, the Balkans, and North Africa. The only problem was that the British already had a military presence in parts of these regions. The British would do whatever it took to defend the Suez Canal and protect their oil supply coming from the Persian Gulf. If they lost this vital resource, Britain would be in a real danger of falling to the Axis powers. A large Italian force of over 100,000 men entered North Africa and were greeted by an army of around 36,000 British soldiers. The odds were in Italy's favor, but due to a lack of adequate training and leadership, the British were able to push the Italian forces back. In fact, by the end of Italy's campaign in North Africa, the Allies had captured around 130,000 Italian soldiers. This was not only a huge defeat for Italy early on in the war, but completely embarrassing and demoralizing for the country. Things in North Africa were so bad that Hitler had to send his own forces into the region to help out Italy. With the loss of so many soldiers in such a short time, the Italian leadership outside of Mussolini and his inner circle began to question if they'd chosen the right side. This dissent among Italian leadership would later lead to the betrayal of Hitler and the Nazis. And the embarrassment was not just felt in the military, but in every Italian who supported Mussolini and his decision to join Hitler. Many citizens supported the war effort to make their nation more powerful and to gain more land and resources for the country. But that would not happen if the military couldn't get their act together. Although Mussolini might have made the trains run on time, other parts of Italy's manufacturing infrastructure was far behind the rest of the world. The factories had a hard time getting the materials they needed, and when they did, Allied forces would bomb their buildings and set the Italian war machine back even further. Basically, Italy slowly realized it was in over its head. They were outmatched by most of the other players in the war, and although Hitler and his country were a force to be reckoned with, Germany was not able to send men and resources that Italy needed to get themselves back into the war after several defeats. Hitler's forces were now fighting the war on multiple fronts, and if the Axis powers were going to win, they needed Italy to start pulling their weight. There were also clear signs of unrest within the general populace of Italy just before the decision to betray Hitler was made. In 1943, only months before Italy would turn on their ally, a strike in the factories of Milan and Turin began. All the workers wanted were evacuation allowances for their families. The Italian people were starving, and hundreds of thousands of citizens were fleeing the cities and battle-stricken areas for the countryside. It was clear that Italian morale was incredibly low, and that many of the working class now wanted to get out of the war. Not everyone in Italy supported joining the Nazi forces in the first place, but the vast majority supported their dictator even if they didn't agree with what Hitler was doing. However, all that changed when it became clear Italy would not end up being the powerful nation its leaders had hoped for as a result of its allying the country with Germany. The citizens were demoralized and disgruntled. The military was in shambles, and Mussolini himself seemed to care less and less about the outcome of the war. It was at this point that the leaders of Italy realized a change was needed. It was time to get rid of Mussolini and to join the winning side. The Italians were now on the cusp of betraying the Nazis, and there was just one more thing that needed to be done. By the middle of 1943, the Italians had been beaten on and off the battlefield. The once proud nation was slowly falling apart. The Allies had already invaded southern Italy and controlled Sicily, and it was becoming clear that Hitler and the Nazis were not going to win the war after all. So the Italian government decided to jump ship and try to salvage what they could. Practically everyone, from members of the government to the average citizen, had lost faith in Mussolini and his ideologies. An emergency meeting was held on July 25, 1943, where Benito Mussolini was voted out of office by his very own Grand Council. The moment that he left the building to meet with King Vittorio Emanuele, Mussolini was put under arrest. Surprisingly, Mussolini showed very little emotion and seemed to not care that he was being booted out of power. But there was still time to save Italy as a whole if the new leadership could figure out a way to betray Hitler and join the Allies without giving away too much of their own power. The Italian government made General Pietro Badoglio prime minister of the country. Badoglio had been Mussolini's chief of staff, but had very different ideas of which direction the country should take to regain some of its former power. Badoglio immediately began negotiations with General Eisenhower. He wanted to surrender to the Allies and help them win the war against Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. The deal was that Italy would surrender and allow Allied forces to move through the southern part of the country without any resistance. Then what remained of Italy's military would help the Allied forces push the Nazis north and out of their country. Hitler himself must have known there was trouble in Italy when Mussolini was deposed and arrested. The Nazi leader needed to move fast, but even he may have underestimated how quickly the Italians would betray him. In the wake of Italy's betrayal, Hitler did the only thing he could. He sent his own forces to invade the country. The Italian military was already so disorganized that Hitler had no problem securing strategic positions. He already had troops in the country that were helping his former ally defend off enemy forces. To make sure the government who had betrayed him would not gain more power, Hitler sent his forces straight to Rome to capture the capital of the country. Nazi forces succeeded in their mission and forced the new government, including General Badoglio, to flee. But at this point, most of Italy had already betrayed him, and its citizens were more than willing to help the Allies defeat the Nazis. Whether Hitler was still friendly with Mussolini or not, he felt the former fascist dictator had some use left in him. Hitler found the mountain prison in which Mussolini was being held captive and sent forces to rescue him. Hitler then reinstated Mussolini as the new ruler of the Nazi-occupied northern Italy and named the territory the Italian Social Republic. Mussolini was once again the leader of a fascist government in Italy, but his reign wouldn't last long. As the Nazi forces were fighting off the Allies, which now included Italian help, the Italians in the north captured and executed Mussolini. This would be the second time Italy betrayed Hitler in a matter of months. To be fair, it was members of the Italian partisan resistance force who had carried out the execution, but as 1943 progressed, Italy betrayed Hitler over and over again. And keeping in character, Hitler started doing some insanely crazy things in Italy to show his displeasure. In the regions the Nazis controlled, Hitler rolled out vicious policies that forced Italian citizens to support and work for the Nazi troops that occupied their homeland. It seemed as if Hitler did not take the betrayal of his former ally well, as what he did next was absolutely nuts and a breach of the Geneva Convention. Hitler ordered one of his scientists to release a biological weapon on the populace of Italy. A Nazi scientist named Erich Martini was put in charge of the biological warfare project. Martini was a friend of Heinrich Himmler and a devout Nazi Party member. At the time, Martini was one of Europe's leading epidemiologists, especially around the malaria virus. Hitler sent Martini to Italy, where his task was to breed malaria-carrying mosquitoes and release them on the Italian population. The thought was that the Allied forces made their way further north, they would encounter the mosquitoes, contract malaria, and this would decimate their armies. Hitler didn't really care what the disease would do to regular Italian citizens, as they had betrayed him, and he was not a forgiving man. During Mussolini's dictatorship, a drainage project on the Pontine Marshes was carried out to create more usable land for Italian houses and farms. Everything went according to plan, and the swampland was turned into fertile farmland. However, Hitler had his forces reverse engineer the Pontine Marshes and make the swamplands once again. This provided the perfect breeding ground for Martini's malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Martini released over 1 million Anopheles labrantiae mosquito larvae into the swampland. Then the Nazis added salt water, making it less habitable for plants and animals, but an environment that the mosquitoes could thrive in. This form of biological warfare had very little effect on the Allied forces, but was devastating to the local Italian population. Once again, Hitler's bloodthirsty insanity knew no bounds. Italy's betrayal of Hitler was complete when on October 13, 1943, General Badoglio moved on to the next phase of his agreement with Eisenhower. He provided troops and resources to help the Allies retake Rome. Surprisingly, as the war was coming to an end, Badoglio resigned his position of power. This took Italy away from the dictatorship government that had gotten them tied up with the Nazis in the first place, and set the grounds for an Italian future that would be slightly more peaceful. The Italian betrayal of Hitler is a tricky thing because of the underlying reasons for the country joining the Nazis in the first place. However, due to numerous military failures, the demoralization of the Italian people, and the turning of the tide of World War II, Italy decided to betray Germany. This helped the Allies defeat Hitler and the Nazis in the end. Adolf Hitler, now the Führer of Germany, has promised to bring prosperity and happiness back to the German people. He's also about to unleash hell on the world. Years of bloody warfare that includes a plan to annihilate the Jews and other people he considers a plague on mankind. But our first day starts with some deception and comes before the outbreak of World War II. It involves the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, going over to Germany and having a chat with Hitler in his apartment. By this time, Hitler has already annexed Austria, and it's looking like he might have Czechoslovakia in his sights. The Brits and many other countries are wondering what this strange man with the funny mustache might do next. At the meeting, Hitler and Chamberlain signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which states that the two countries will not go to war. Chamberlain then writes to his sister, "In spite of the hardness and ruthlessness I thought I saw in his face, I got the impression that there was a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word." Chamberlain arrives in England a hero. He's seen standing on a balcony at Buckingham Palace with the King and Queen. He gets a standing ovation when he speaks at the House of Commons. To tens of thousands of people, he announces that there will be peace for our time. Still, there are some people in the crowd that have read Hitler's book Mein Kampf, My Struggle in English. They know about his thoughts on what he perceives to be a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. They understand that he has big plans for Germany. They've read things like this: all great cultures of the past perished only because the originally creative race died out from blood poisoning. Chamberlain, however, tells those closest to him that Mr. Hitler is not insane. He says he's an excitable kind of chap, but in reality he would barely stand out in a crowd. Hitler, he says, is not hell-bent on starting a major war. Day 1, September 1st, 1939, just over 1 year later. At 2 a.m., the German Army's 1st Mounted Regiment hears the call of a bugle on the Polish border. Someone shouts, "Muzzle caps off, load!" There are around 1.5 million German soldiers and 1.2 million Polish soldiers currently fighting on the Western Front. The Germans seep into Poland like an infestation. Within a short time, the horses of the Polish are crashing to the ground. An hour later, the Germans march on, as riderless horses run through clouds of smoke. In town, civilians hear the sounds of planes dropping bombs from the sky. Sirens fill the air. Kids and their parents are running through the streets, still dressed in their pajamas. The German Luftwaffe shows no mercy, raining bullets down on unarmed people. The head of the British military mission in Poland, General Adrian Carleton, writes a letter. "I'm seeing the very face of war change. Its glory shorn, no longer the soldiers setting forth into battle, but the women and children being buried under it. This is a war of machines. A new kind of war has begun." Day 3. Men in flat caps shout from newspaper stands all over Britain, "Read all about it! Hitler invades Poland!" On the front page of the Evening Standard, a headline in bold reads, "I will give Poland a lesson, Hitler." Both Britain and France declare war on Germany. Americans on the other side of the world listen to their radios and think, "Thank God that's not us. There's no way they're going to fight another European war." Day 4. Nazi Party official Fritz Mühlebach writes in a letter, "I regard Britain and France's interference as nothing but a formality. As soon as they realize the utter hopelessness of Polish resistance and the vast superiority of German arms, they will begin to see that we are always in the right and it's pointless to meddle." The British and French are hoping that by saying they're joining the war, they'll call Hitler's bluff. And anyway, they're still thinking that the people of Germany will overthrow this mad dictator. Day 8. The residents of Warsaw listen to their radios as bombs fall. Chopin's Military Polonaise plays through the din of thousands of machine guns. 30,000 bombs will drop every day, and the German army will storm the city, eventually killing 18,000 civilians in Warsaw, and in just one day, taking 140,000 civilians as prisoners of war. Hitler has plans for them at his concentration camps, places, as you'll see, where the peak of human depravity will be on show. Day 17. The Polish are thinking that the French will be joining them today in the fight. It doesn't happen. What happens instead is Joseph Stalin's army crosses over the Polish border in a vicious attack of its own against the Eastern European nation. Stalin is intending to get some of the spoils of war, and for now at least, he has a pact with Hitler. Day 36. Hitler is in Warsaw, proudly walking through the ruins of a devastated city. Foreign correspondents line up to hear him speak. Hitler tells them, "Gentlemen, you see for yourselves what criminal folly it is to try and defend this city." He sends the world a stark warning, saying, "I only wish certain statesmen in other countries, who seem to want to turn all Europe into a second Warsaw, could have the opportunity to see, as you have, the real meaning of war." Hitler's message is clear. Get in our way and your cities will be turned to rubble. Do not test me. The German army is a beast and other countries know it. The US ambassador in London, Joseph Kennedy, asks, "Where on earth can the Allies fight the Germans and beat them?" No one wants to hear such words, but he has a point. Day 104. Hitler is angry, stamping his feet on the ground, spit coming out of his mouth as he screams at his generals. He's embarrassed more than anything. He's had his first taste of defeat at the Battle of the River Plot, when his navy, Kriegsmarine, experienced a humiliating defeat against the superior British Navy. Maybe the Germans aren't invincible after all. Day 252. Hitler has already had success in invading both Denmark and Norway. On this day, his troops invade Belgium, with Hitler feeling supremely confident that its blitzkrieg tactics will make easy work of the country. Over in the UK, a new man has become prime minister, a stubborn old goat with a taste for war and a romantic idea of empire. His name is Winston Churchill. Soon he will make one of his moving speeches on the radio, telling the Brits, "Arm yourselves and be ye men of valor and be in readiness for conflict." The problem is, in spite of Churchill's powerful words, the Germans have a much stronger military, and Hitler knows this only too well. Day 270. The Nazis now occupy Belgium. Hitler's troops again show no mercy as they shoot down unarmed Belgian civilians. 1.5 million manage to flee the country, but many thousands are slaughtered. Houses are on fire as tanks destroy everything in sight. Day 279. A big day. Hitler delivers a message to his troops. Soldiers of the Western Front, Dunkirk has fallen. Soldiers, my confidence in you knows no bounds. You have not disappointed me. 40,000 French and English troops are all that remains of the formerly great armies. Immeasurable quantities of material have been captured. The greatest battle in the history of the world has come to an end. He's now winning the Battle of France. He sent the British scurrying off back to England where, to be honest, they count their blessings. The evacuation was perilous, but it could have been much worse. The German military is a force of nature. Day 299. Hitler is celebrating again. Bodies of French citizens lay strewn across the countryside. Their faces no longer recognizable. With 4.2 million German army soldiers, 1 million Luftwaffe, 180,000 Kriegsmarine, and 100,000 Waffen-SS, the Nazi Party military, Hitler has taken France. The result is occupation and collaboration under Vichy France. 85,310 French military personnel have died defending France, and the British have also been considerably weakened, losing not just thousands of men, but hundreds of ships and close to 1,000 aircraft. Let's just remember that Hitler has always had a soft spot for Britain. He once said the English nation will have to be considered the most valuable ally in the world. He believes that the only reason he's hated in the UK is because of an American and Jewish conspiracy. Still, now he knows he has to defeat this tiny nation. Day 314. Hitler is sitting in a quiet room at home, mulling over a speech that Churchill made a while back. Part of it went like this: "We shall fight in France, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Hitler now reflects on this, smiling wide. He looks down at his pet Alsatian and says, "They did fight us in France, didn't they? But they lost, didn't they, my little German dumpling?" Churchill knows what's coming. He outlined this in another speech. Hitler knows he'll have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Most of the world doesn't give Britain a chance. Even if Hitler has to hold back on a land invasion, his airstrikes will get Britain down on its knees, begging to sign a peace treaty. Then he can take off conquering elsewhere, notably Stalin's Russia. Packed, schmacked. Day 339. Into the Battle of Britain, the RAF is a handful, that's for sure. German intelligence has supplied information that is incorrect, thinking the British are much weaker than they actually are. The British, on the other hand, think the Germans are much stronger than they are. Hundreds of German bombers fly over cities in England and many civilians are killed, but the British are resilient. Germany makes a strategic error, one of many during the Battle of Britain. They focus on bombing not airfields but concentrating on cities. This brings great relief to Churchill, who secretly thanks Hitler. The cities can take it, he thinks. He's right. Day 427. Brits are out in the streets celebrating. People all over the country laugh while singing this song. Hitler has only got one ball. Göring has two, but very small. Himmler is rather similar, but poor old Goebbels has no balls at all. Germany has made too many strategic mistakes, but what the Brits don't know is that Hitler's focus isn't on Britain now. He can save that for later. Now he wants to invade the Soviet Union. He has economic reasons for this, but ideological ones too. He might have a love-hate relationship with Britain, but for the Soviet Union he only feels hate. He despises communists, and anyway, the Soviet Union, he says, is full of Jews and Slavs. Germany and Britain have lost over 3,000 aircraft between them and over 4,000 personnel, not to mention the 43,000 British civilians that have perished under the German bombs in an 8-month battle. But as no one expects Britain to hold its own, the people of the world have now gained confidence. Over in the US, where many folks expected Britain to fall, people are saying the Battle of Britain will go down in history as a battle as important as Waterloo or Gettysburg. A battle might have been won, but the fight is just beginning. Day 661. It's 3:15 in Berlin, and Hitler's inside his apartment at the Reich Chancellery on Wilhelmstrasse 77. Down at his side is the Alsatian puppy he's just been given, Blondie. He strokes the back of Blondie's head and says, "They won't know what's hit them, will they, my little dumpling? 3.8 million men, thousands and thousands of aircraft, tanks, artillery are coming to squash those Slavic fools." He pats the dog on the head, saying, "Stalin's not so tough, is he, dumpling? Let's see if he really is the man of steel." Stalin might not be so tough, but his people are. Millions of them will be slaughtered in the bloodiest fight the world has ever seen. They will starve, freeze, and over 300,000 will be killed by their own army for defecting or other such transgressions. Around 5 million Soviets will be taken prisoner, and many of them will be tortured and killed. But these are people as hard as the cold Russian soil in winter. They will prevail. Hitler doesn't know that when he's detailing to Blondie what he'll do to them, that night he lies awake mulling over every other detail of the invasion. Operation Barbarossa is about to start. Just after 3:15, close to the Bug River Bridge on the Russian-Germany border, a German soldier shouts over to the Russian side, "Hey guys, can you come over here for a second? We have some important matters to discuss." As soon as the Russians walk over, all of them are machine-gunned down. In the mayhem, German sappers pulled the charges to blow up the bridge. The German soldiers think it's kill or be enslaved by an inferior race of devils. What Hitler doesn't account for is just how resilient these people are. 6 million of them were not long ago killed under Stalin's oppressive measures when he began a system of forced industrialization. They know what pain is. Hitler's hoping some of them won't want to fight or they might defect, and this is one reason why he thinks he'll be victorious. Stalin will dispatch millions of troops, young and old if need be, and they will walk into gunfire because if they don't, their own commanders will have them killed. Day 829. Japanese planes rain bombs down on the U.S. airbase at Pearl Harbor. The U.S. is caught unprepared. It's a total disaster, and one which Japan sees as a resounding success. That'll show the Americans what happens when you offer support to the Allies, and it should make them think twice about interfering with Japan's plans for Southeast Asia. Hitler finds out about the attack only after it happens, since Japan hasn't given him any warning. He's delighted, telling one of his commanders, "We can't lose the war at all. We now have an ally which has never been conquered in 3,000 years. Still, he's never relinquished his objective that one day in the future he'll have to defeat what he calls the Yellow Race. He's quite content, thinking that Britain will now have his hands full of fighting Japan in its empire in the East, and the US will stay out of its way, since it'll have to deal with Japan. Hitler can now concentrate on Eastern European domination. Day 833. The US declares war on Germany and Italy after already declaring war on Japan. President Roosevelt matches Churchill with his rousing words, saying, "The forces endeavoring to enslave the entire world now are moving toward this hemisphere. Rapid and united effort by all the peoples of the world who are determined to remain free will ensure a world victory of the forces of justice and a righteousness over the forces of savagery and barbarism." Hitler believes the US, a race of mongrels, can't fight to save their lives. He has little respect for this relatively new nation, but he'll see what these mongrels are capable of soon. Day 1010. If you need to know about the USA's strength, look no further than the victory against Japan in the Battle of Midway. It just happened on this day. Japan takes an absolute beating, but not quite a knockout punch. 3,057 Japanese have died compared to the USA's 307. Day 1100. A German soldier named Hans-Jürgen Hartmann says never mind how many Russians they slaughter, they just keep coming. He and his men are starving too and dying from the bitter cold. They've been ordered to kill everyone in sight. In his diary, he writes how brutal this war is becoming. It's now a total war, a war against women, children, and old people, and that is the greatest horror. But he, like the other troops, has had words like this drilled into his head time and again. Russia, a country of cruelty, must be cruelly treated. At some point soon, Hitler will realize he can't outright win this war, and he'll carry on fighting in order to get what he thinks Germany deserves as part of settlements. Day 1206. The battles of Stalingrad and Leningrad have been raging for a while now, and they're both horrific affairs. Together, millions of people will die, mostly Soviets, but Germany will also see a shocking number of casualties. War is always monstrous, but these battles are something the word monstrous cannot begin to describe. Both sides have acted with savagery on an unprecedented scale, but Stalin has taken advantage of this by getting his people into a state of fury in what he's called the Patriotic War. But as time passes, some German soldiers don't hold out much hope for a victory, as can be seen in the words of a panzer officer named Wolfgang Paul. He writes, "We have blundered mistakenly into an alien landscape with which we can never be properly acquainted. Everything is cold, hostile, and working against us." Another German soldier says the Russians will fight to the very last man and die over every last foot of land. He says we're entering a war of attrition, and I only hope in the long run that Germany will win it. Day 1250. In Leningrad, the people are being starved, with bread rations being only 4.5 ounces per day. The people try to carry on. A scientist named Axel Reichardt actually finishes a great work called The Fauna of the Soviet Union. Days later, he's found slumped over in a chair, dead. The theater still puts on plays, but half-starved, the actors collapse on stage. A woman named Elena writes in her diary, "People are so weak with hunger that they're completely indifferent to death. They perish as if they're falling asleep. Those half-dead people who are still around do not even pay attention to them." Perhaps the most shocking thing is cannibalism among the starved. In the winter of 1942, a report at the militia office in Leningrad contains these chilling words. One woman, utterly worn out and desperate, said that when her husband fainted through exhaustion and lack of food, she hacked off a part of his leg to feed herself and her children. That woman was executed. The British and the Americans don't know the full scale of the misery. They're just hoping the Russians can hold out, not concerned about how they do it. Lieutenant von Heil writes back to his family in Germany, "Human life is cheap, cheaper than the shovels we use to clear the roads of snow. The state we've reached will seem quite unbelievable to you back home. We do not kill humans but the enemy, who are rendered impersonal animals at best. They behave the same toward us." These battles on the Eastern Front will go on for years and easily be the biggest bloodbath of World War II, but Russia will hold out. Day 1400. Hitler is reading documents about what's happening in the Nazi death camps. Around 6 million Jews will die at the hands of the Nazis, while prisoners of other ethnicities will be murdered, starved, or beaten to death, or used for medical experiments in the camps. The human depravity at these camps is incalculable. Things are changing on the battlefields, though, and Hitler is now rarely the receiver of good news. Day 1532. Hitler finds himself backed into a corner. The Italians have just retreated, and he knows that the Soviets are about to stage a big offensive. He thinks if he can just push back the Anglo-American invasion of France, he might be able to move more troops back to Russia. Many of Hitler's top generals don't agree with his orders, with one of them, Rolf Helmut Schroeder, saying if he just lets them decide what to do, they might stand a chance at having some success. Still, Hitler's word is final. He's deluded, thinking his posters on the walls in Ukraine saying Hitler the Liberator will become a reality. He's wrong. Day 1542. Hitler writes an important letter to his generals. He says no more troops should be sent to the Eastern Front. He says the Anglo-American armies must be fought in Italy and France, where they soon will be. At this point, the long battle of Leningrad is pretty much lost, but the Germans keep fighting. There's much debate among the US and the UK as to how to take France back, with Churchill disagreeing with the Americans about bombing the French railways. He says that will mean too many civilian casualties, to which the Americans say such collateral damage will have to happen if they're to be victorious. 70,000 French folks will be killed by those Allied bombers. Since many French embraced the Vichy regime and fought against the Allies, some generals aren't too bothered about spilling some French blood. Day 1574. Allies stormed the beaches of Hitler's so-called Atlantic Wall in Normandy in France. What we know as D-Day, the D just stands for day. As many will later say, it's like walking into the jaws of death. 156,000 Allied troops, mostly American, British, and Canadian, arrive on the beaches, some embracing battle and others scared out of their wits. A US private will later write, "There were men crying with fear, men defecating themselves. I lay there with some others, too petrified to move." He was hit in the arm and thought it was a bullet, only to find out it was someone's hand that had been shot off. In the US, everyone's listening to the news on the radio, while in the UK, even the industrial strikes have been cancelled for the day, so people can listen to live reports and go and donate blood. One of the German soldiers writes a letter that morning. "The whistling of shells and shattering explosions around us created the worst kind of music. Only a tiny, tiny handful of our company remains." By evening, the British have beaten back the German 21st Panzer Division, and the Americans have established positions up to 3 miles inland. 2,501 men die from the USA, 1,449 British, 391 Canadian, and 73 from other Allied countries also die in the invasion, as well as thousands more Germans and, as you know, even more French civilians. Day 1600. Hitler is on the brink of defeat. His troops are now withdrawing from all over the Western Front line and facing utter catastrophe in Russia. In Germany, many towns and cities have been devastated by Allied bombs, and the morale of the people is low. Hitler should surrender, but he will not. He might lose, but he's going to cause as much bloodshed as possible, even if that means conscripting children. Day 1784. It is madness to carry on, and this is why some Nazi generals on this day try to kill Hitler with a bomb. They fail. Hitler is injured, and while his trousers certainly take some damage, he will be shouting orders again soon. Now in a state of paranoia and shock, Hitler orders an investigation, and many people who he even minutely believes are against him are arrested. 4,980 of them are executed. One of them screams out before the executioners pull the trigger, "The whole world will vilify us now, but I'm still totally convinced that we did the right thing. Hitler is the archenemy not only of Germany but of the world." Day 2029. The Allies have entered Germany, with the Soviet Red Army getting there first in the east. They will give no quarter to German civilians. Their troops have seen such horrors over the years. A woman who is now starving writes, "We are afraid." From the west, the British and the Americans will invade, and like the Soviets will march toward Berlin. The Soviet soldier writes in his diary, "At first the fascists fought back fiercely, but they could not endure this hell. Everything is bound to finish soon." He's right, kind of. As this is happening, the Germans are busy exterminating people in their concentration camps, trying to burn all the documents that show what horrors they committed. Many of the Nazi bigwigs and scientists who work in those camps are already making their getaways, and to everyone's astonishment, in the decades to come, some will be helped by American intelligence agencies if they prove useful to science or in the new fight against communist Russia. Day 2042. The Americans liberate the Ohrdruf concentration camp in Germany and cannot believe what they're seeing. They see stacks of dead bodies, people alive that have suffered cruelty on an unimaginable scale, and soon, when the other camps are liberated, the Allies will begin to understand the absolute evil of Nazi ideology. The Soviets have already seen similar horrors. When they liberated the largest camp at Auschwitz, they found stacks of shoes and bodies thrown into trenches. It's around this time that from his bunker in Berlin, Hitler learns that some of his orders haven't been followed. He suffers a nervous breakdown. Day 2044. Stalin wants to get to Berlin first. This isn't only a matter of pride, but also because he's aware that the US and Britain have almost perfected a nuclear bomb. When he gets to Berlin, he's going to make sure he gets his hands on German scientists. Day 2063. The Red Army's General Zhukov and General Konev have their troops stationed around Berlin. They meet with resistance, but many of the German fighters are boys that are so young their helmets drop over their baby faces. When they're shot and injured, they give off high-pitched screams. One reason the Germans are fighting so stubbornly is that they know what will happen to them if the Red Army catches them. It will be death, but it might not be a fast one, especially for the women civilians. Day 2066. From his bunker, Hitler can hear gunfire and bombs. He wakes up as usual to the sound of his valet, Heinz Linge, shouting, "On your marks!" Hitler learns that Mussolini has been shot and his body paraded around, spat at and beaten, and hung up with meat hooks, something Hitler imagines will happen to him at the hands of the enemy. He returns to Linge and says, "You must never allow my corpse to fall into the hands of the Russians. They would make a spectacle in Moscow out of my body and put it in waxworks." Linge agrees and then hands Hitler some flatulence pills, one of 28 medications he's on, and also some cocaine drops for an eye problem. To make matters even worse, the Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler has just tried to negotiate a surrender with the enemy. It's the end, and Himmler knows it. Hitler knows it too. On this day, he gets married to his mistress Eva Braun. They celebrate with copious cups of champagne, but this will be a very short marriage. Day 2068. Hitler wakes up at about 11 a.m. and calls for his secretary, Traudl Junge. They have tea together and Hitler asks, "Have you had a nice little rest, child?" She replies, "Yes, I've slept a little." Hitler says, "Come along, I want to dictate something." In his last will and testament, he says that Germany isn't to blame for all the years of misery and carnage, saying it was desired and provoked entirely by those international statesmen who were either of Jewish origin or worked in the Jewish interest. He adds, "The responsibility of the outbreak of this war cannot rest on me," and instead he blames British politicians and the Jewish hierarchy. 4 people signed the document: Goebbels, Bormann, Bergdorf, and Krebs, and soon, like Hitler, they're all dead. Before they die, Goebbels and Bormann take Hitler's body along with his wife's body and burn them in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. As they do this, Soviet guns can be heard close by. Soon, the Americans and British arrive in Berlin, but it is the French army who believe they're owed something by the Germans that do most of the looting and killing. Sometimes they arrive at houses only to find whole families sitting in chairs in the living room, all of them dead already. This is why a British officer named David Fraser writes, "There is so much vile cruelty in the world for us to say that with any satisfaction that good has been victorious." At home in England, the philosopher and pacifist Bertrand Russell puts pen to paper. He agreed that Hitler had to be stopped, but he still writes, "And all this madness, all this rage, all this flaming death of our civilization and our hopes has been brought about because a set of official gentlemen living luxurious lives, mostly stupid, and all without imagination or heart, have chosen that it should occur, rather than that any one of them should suffer some infinitesimally small rebuff to his country's pride." Adolf Hitler broods in his office. He paces back and forth waiting for the phone to ring. There's been opposition to his power, and all guilty parties must be eliminated. But in order to do this, he needs to betray one of his closest allies and best friends. It's taken him years to get to where he is, and he isn't about to lose it all when victory is so close. People will die in the purge to come, but that is of no consequence to Adolf Hitler. He will secure his position as Führer of Germany. Hitler thinks about the years leading up to his ascent to power. He remembers his old friend Ernst Röhm and how he played a vital role in getting Hitler into the position of Chancellor of Germany. But even though Röhm is a good friend and ally, he will not make it out of the purge. Hitler shakes his head as he knows he must betray his friend. They both played major roles in the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923 to overthrow the German government and put the Nazi Party in control of the country. That coup failed, and like Hitler, Röhm had to go into hiding to escape being arrested or killed. But together, they worked toward a new goal: taking over the German government by political means rather than strictly by force. The Nazi Party was still growing at the time, and Hitler was gaining more and more prominence within the party. Ernst Röhm believed in Hitler and would do anything to help him secure his position in the government. To this end, Röhm helped from the Sturmabteilung, also known as the SA, or brown shirts, due to their uniforms. This was an organization that enforced Nazi Party norms and influenced elections. The SA was one of the main organizations that provided the means for Hitler's rise to power. Yet now, in the final days of June 1934, he will betray not only Röhm but anyone else in the SA who questions him. Adolf Hitler stops thinking about the past and starts focusing on the present. He walks over to the door, opens it, and ushers the men waiting outside into the room. Hitler and his advisors take their seats around a large table. The chamber's filled with Nazi regalia. The swastika flag hangs from the wall. Paintings dedicated to the glory of the Aryan race seem to fill every empty space. "You know why you're here," Hitler says. "The SA has played a major role in getting us to where we are today, but now they are becoming a problem. They have ideas of an even greater revolution, one that will put all of our positions in jeopardy." Hitler looks at one of his advisors and nods. The SA is comprised of around 3 million men and outnumbers the German army. We all remember the oppressive rules imposed on our great country by the Treaty of Versailles. The German military can only consist of 100,000 men, but since the government does not control the SA, they can have as many members as they want. This worked well for us in the past when we were trying to secure prominent seats in the government, but now that I've become chancellor, we need to find a way to get them under control. There are grumbles of agreement from the Nazis sitting around the table. The SA is still loyal to Hitler and the Nazi Party, but they are starting to frighten the elites of the country. The beginnings of a delicate plan have already been put into place to ensure Hitler will become the supreme ruler of Germany when the current president dies. However, this will not happen if the SA incites a revolution before he can make final preparations. Everyone in Hitler's chambers agrees something must be done. The leaders of the SA need to be dealt with. Otherwise, everything they worked so hard to accomplish will fall apart. Thank you for your input, gentlemen. I will take what you've said under advisement and will come up with a solution. I must now meet with members of the SA. I will update you on any progress next time we meet. Adolf Hitler stands up from the table. The other members of the Nazi Party rise and salute him. Chancellor Hitler walks down the hall of the government building and enters a room where members of the SA are waiting. "Gentlemen, we have much to discuss." Hitler takes a seat at the table. "I, along with everyone else in the party, appreciate your support in keeping everyone in line," Hitler says to the SA officials. "Your methods of intimidation have kept the press quiet and squashed my opposition. For that, I'm eternally grateful." He pauses for a moment to make eye contact with the men in the room. "You have all been loyal in your duties, and I know that this revolution is taking slightly longer than anticipated, but we are almost there." Hitler is interrupted by one of the leaders of the SA. "Longer than anticipated? Your use of diplomatic means to achieve our goals is going nowhere. We need to overthrow the entire government and put true leaders in charge like Ernst Röhm." The other SA members in the room nod their heads and cheer in agreement. Hitler looks at the man standing in the corner of the room. It is Heinrich Himmler, his right-hand man. They both know that too much could be lost if they allowed the SA to continue inciting violence and force an armed revolution. "We couldn't agree more," Hitler lies. "But you need to give us time to deal with the elites of the country. It is with them that the loyalty of many lies. When we bring them to our side and they support the Nazi cause, everything else will fall into place." "Screw the elites," one of the SA shouts. "All they do is hide behind their money and servants. It is time for the people to reclaim Germany. We say that the elites should be removed from office and replaced by members of the SA with more fundamental Nazi beliefs. That is what we are going to do," Hitler reassures the SA gathered before him. "But first we need their support. Once my position as Führer is secured, we can move our plans forward and deal with the real threat to our people, the Jews. However, if you don't give me the time I need to change the system from within, there will be backlash from the elites and many other German citizens as well. The German army is still loyal to the president and the current administration. They will not just roll over and hand us the country. Then we will wipe out the army and take the government by force," one of the SA leaders shouts. Hitler shakes his head as he glances at Himmler. "We will take that under advisement. But right now I have another meeting. Thank you for bringing your concerns to my attention. It is much appreciated and they will all be addressed in time." There's murmuring from the SA officials as Hitler leaves the room. "We need to deal with this sooner rather than later," Himmler warns him. "The SA is becoming too powerful, and we're going to have a civil war on our hands if we don't get them under control." "I know that," Hitler hisses back. "I'm trying to figure out the best way to eliminate this threat. We cannot let them overthrow the elites. We need their money and support to realize our final goal. Every time I meet with members of the government and their influential friends, they complain to me about the trouble the SA is causing. They blame me for the destruction. They blame me for the riots. They blame me for the violence. It's getting tiring. I've talked to Röhm, and he's working to get his members under control, but he also agrees with the SA ideology. I'm not sure he can be trusted any longer." "Then Röhm will need to be dealt with as well," Himmler says. The corner of his lip curls up slightly. "I'm sure your SS branch of the SA would be happy to help out. We can use them to eliminate our problems from within the organization. After all, what good is having your own personal bodyguards if you don't use them to do your bidding?" Hitler stops walking and is silent for a moment. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he asks. Himmler nods his head. Hitler rubs the bridge of his nose as he thinks out loud. "I really didn't want it to come to this, but it seems as if we have no other choice. Gather the SS and work with Goebbels to prepare them for their mission. I don't know when we'll need to purge the party, but it'll be one day soon." Himmler salutes Adolf Hitler and marches down the hallways. Hitler calls after him, "Heinrich, be discreet. We don't want anyone getting wind of this before we can execute the plan, especially Rome." Himmler nods his head and continues on his way to brief his loyal SS men about the plan to cleanse the Nazi party. Adolf Hitler exits the parliamentary building and enters a car idling on the street. The summer rain falls steadily, casting a gray shadow across the city of Berlin. He has a meeting with several German elites and military leaders that he is not looking forward to. He knows how it'll go. They'll tell him the Nazi party is becoming too aggressive and that the SA must be dealt with. This time though, Hitler has a plan. The SA will soon cause him no more trouble, and the elites of the country will finally be off his back. Hitler enters the room full of generals, politicians, and powerful businessmen. He shakes the rain from his coat and hangs it on a nearby hook. "My friends," he begins, "I have met with the SA leaders and they are less than willing to back down. Therefore, I have taken matters into my own hands. In the days to come, you will watch the SA fall apart. It's all being taken care of as we speak." One of the military generals speaks up. "There are rumors that the SA is forming a people's army. This is unacceptable and will lead to the destruction of the country. The Nazi party is becoming more trouble than they're worth." Hitler represses the rage that fills him. "I assure you, General," he clearly says as calmly as possible, "it is not the Nazi party that is the problem. It is Rome and the SA. And if you were listening, I just said it is being dealt with. It better be, or you'll find that your position in the government may not be as secure as you might think. We're happy to squash this rebellion and put the country under martial law if you can't do it yourself," responds the general. "Do not threaten me," Hitler spits. "In the coming days, the SA threat will be crushed. After that, it's only a matter of time until President von Hindenburg passes, and I am fully in control of this country. You do not want to be on my bad side when that happens, General. When I'm Führer, all I will have to do is snap my fingers and you will be removed from your position. There are plenty of loyal followers to take your spot." There's an unsettling silence in the room. "I have my top men working on a solution for the problems Rome and the rest of the SA are causing for you. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to make preparations." Hitler turns and exits the room. His wet leather boots squeak down the hallway. In his mind, Hitler is playing out the murder of everyone who has ever questioned his decisions. There will be no escaping his wrath once he has complete control of the country. People will hang, generals will be shot. It's only a matter of time until he gets everything he's ever wanted and makes the world pay dearly for allowing it to happen. Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, Hermann Göring, and Adolf Hitler sit around a table. The room is lit by candlelight as they discuss the plan to purge the Nazi party of anyone who might jeopardize their future plans. We all know that Rome and the other leaders of the SA are not planning to overthrow the government anytime soon. They're unhappy but still have faith in the Chancellor, says Himmler. However, the current ruling body doesn't see it this way, which means we're going to have to make it look like the SA was trying to destabilize the country to ensure the people of Germany are on our side. The other men around the table nod in agreement. Göring chimes in. "We've already planted fake evidence in the offices and homes of the people we need to get rid of. We can use this as justification for purging the party. As long as it looks like we're saving the country from chaos, no one will question us." Hitler sits quietly, staring at the burning candle flame in the middle of the table. "Rome has been loyal to me this entire time. He's one of the main reasons I am where I am today. But the fact that he is the face of the SA means he must be eliminated. I regret this, but make sure once Rome is killed, there is indisputable evidence that he was connected to an extremist plot to overthrow the government. If that doesn't work, we'll say he has a proclivity toward unbecoming sexual behaviors." "As you wish," replies Himmler. Everyone here is aware of Vice Chancellor von Pappen's speech at the University Marburg a few days ago on June 17th, right? Himmler asks the other men around the table. They confirm they know of it. "It's for this reason I believe now is the perfect time to carry out the Night of the Long Knives. We can use that speech as an example of how radicalized the SA have become. This, along with all the planted evidence, will be enough to execute everyone we need to ensure the elites and army stay on our side while maintaining the loyalty of the more moderate brown shirt members." "I agree," says Hitler. "By keeping the current governing body and military happy as well as retaining most of the SA, we will have an armed force large enough to begin our plans of rearmament and military expansion. Once this is done, we can move into the next phase of our final solution and begin ridding Germany of the Jewish threat. We will return this country to its former glory, and no one will stop us." Hitler slams his fist down on the table. The Nazis in the room applaud his conviction. A few days go by without incident. Then, unexpectedly, the timetable for the purge gets moved up. "What do you mean the brown shirts are rebelling in the streets?" Hitler screams into a telephone receiver. Himmler's on the line. "Put an end to it. I'm coming to Munich now." Hitler slams down the phone and grabs his coat. His car is summoned to drive him to the airport. It's June 30th, 1934 when Hitler lands in Munich. Top Nazi officials wait for him on the tarmac. "Give me an update. What's going on?" He begins walking to the waiting caravan of cars as his entourage follows. Himmler speaks first. "The SS have been deployed and are subduing the SA brown shirts who are rioting. We've also deployed men to arrest anyone who is sympathizing with the SA or trying to cause problems for the party. They've been told that if anyone resists arrest, they are to be shot. Good, Hitler responds. Sir, you should know that the brown shirts who are rioting through Munich are calling for your resignation and accusing you of treachery, Göring says. We'll have them all executed for treason. Very good, Hitler replies. The men enter the cars waiting for them and begin to drive toward Munich, where they'll meet the SS forces. Contact Röhm and tell him to gather the heads of the SA for a meeting. Make it seem like we just want to talk. Inform him that they should all meet at Hanselbauer Hotel in Bad Wiessee. We'll deal with them there. Yes, sir, says Göring. Hitler and his men proceed to the Bavarian Interior Ministry. When they get there, August Schneidhuber, the chief of the Munich police, is nervously waiting for them. Hitler bursts into the room screaming about the ineffectiveness of the Munich police. He walks up to Schneidhuber and rips the epaulettes showing his rank off the chief's uniform. How dare you let the brown shirts wreak havoc in the city? We're so close to a unified and powerful Germany, yet you let something like this happen. I'm sorry, Chancellor, the chief of police says. No, you aren't, but you will be, screams Hitler. Take him outside and shoot him. SS soldiers grab Schneidhuber by the arms and escort him out of the building. A few moments later, the sound of a gunshot is heard from outside. Now it's time to deal with the brown shirts once and for all, Hitler says as he exits the room. Hitler and his men head to the Hanselbauer Hotel, where Röhm and the other SA leaders are staying. They had gone to bed the previous night when Hitler had not yet arrived. The sun is just starting to rise as the SS pulls up to the hotel in their vehicles. It's a caravan of men loyal to Hitler. There's no escaping what's to come. The soldiers burst into the hotel with their guns raised. The concierge throws his hands in the air and begs for mercy. The SS run from room to room, kicking the doors of the SA leadership while they're fast asleep. Hitler's enemies are dragged from their beds, lined up in the lobby. They stand in their pajamas, terrified of what's to come. Urine runs down the legs of men who knows that this will be the last moments on the planet. Hitler enters the Hanselbauer and looks upon the faces of the confused SA leaders with disgust. You thought you could get away with it, Hitler shouts at them. Well, we uncovered your plot to overthrow the government and the Nazi Party. This ends now. You're all under arrest and will be tried for treason. Hitler scans the faces of the men who stand before him in their nightgowns. There are some that would betray him, but most are loyal. Who's this? Hitler says, pointing to a young man standing next to an SA leader named Edmund Heinz. We found them in bed together, one of the SS soldiers informs him. Take them outside and shoot them both, Hitler says with disgust in his eyes. We'll publicize this and make sure everyone in Germany knows that laying with another man is punishable by death, no matter who you are. Hitler signals to his soldiers to take the SA leaders away. They're headed to Munich's Stadelheim prison, where they'll be questioned, tortured, and eventually executed. Before Ernst Röhm is escorted out of the hotel, Hitler walks up to him and grabs his arm. I'm sorry, old friend, he whispers into Röhm's ear, but I have to do what's best for the party and the country. I'm sure you understand. Röhm says nothing. He keeps his head down and follows the others out the door. His friend and the man he believed would return Germany to its former greatness has betrayed him. Hitler stands in the lobby of the Hanselbauer Hotel, watching his longtime friend being led to his death. One of the SS soldiers walks up to the Chancellor. Sir, everything's ready at the party headquarters. There's a crowd assembled to hear you speak. Thank you. Let's get going, Hitler says. He's driven back to Munich, where he gets himself ready to speak to the masses. He walks up to the podium and with a fit of rage begins screaming into the microphone. His voice echoes off the buildings in the vicinity. Hitler explains how his SS uncovered a plot by the brown shirts to overthrow the government and send the country to civil war. Ernst Röhm and the other SA leaders have committed the worst treachery in the world history, he screams into the microphone. His SS guard closely watches the crowd to gauge their reactions and to make sure no one does anything rash. Anyone who consorts with the undisciplined and disobedient characters of the SA will be put to death, Hitler concludes. The crowd erupts in applause. There are regular citizens, Nazi Party members, and even sympathetic SA in the crowd. Hitler has won them all over. The threat that the SA posed to his rule has come to an end. Joseph Goebbels watches the future Führer's speech from the side of the stage. He claps as the crowd shows their support for Adolf Hitler. Goebbels turns and walks into the Nazi Party building. He picks up the phone and is transferred to Hermann Göring. Kolibri, Goebbels says into the receiver and hangs up the phone. On the other side, Göring smiles. He places the phone back in its cradle and gives the order for the SS soldiers to execute any remaining SA sympathizers. Dozens are killed by the SS across Germany. After his speech, Hitler orders SS commander Sepp Dietrich to execute the SA leaders at Stadelheim prison. Most of the SA members rounded up at the Hanselbauer Hotel are put to death by firing squad. Others are saved only to be put on trial for treason. Each trial lasts minutes before the SA leaders are convicted and shot. Hitler's Purge and the Night of the Long Knives ends on July 2, 1934. During the Purge, the SS executed Ernst Röhm, Reichswehr General Kurt von Schleicher, Hitler's predecessor as Reich Chancellor, and his wife, Major General Ferdinand von Bredow, Schleicher's friend and collaborator, Gustav von Kahr, the Bavarian chief of state who had condemned the beer hall putsch, and Hitler's role in it. and Gregor Strasser, a Nazi leader who tried to reach an agreement with the previous Chancellor von Schleicher to keep Hitler from rising to power. More than 1,100 people were brought into custody and around 100 individuals were killed during the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler sits in his office with a smile on his face. He's rid the country of his enemies and it's only a matter of time before he becomes the Führer. President von Hindenburg is getting sicker and sicker by the day. Hitler rewards the SS forces for their loyalty by making them a completely independent entity from the SA. Slowly but surely, the SS takes control of the police forces across the country. Eventually, Heinrich Himmler centralizes all of the SS under his command. This streamlines decisions being made and makes the SS the legal authority throughout Germany. Any resistance or disruption to Hitler or his plans are now quickly dealt with by the SS. There's no more freedom of speech or expression. Any opposition to the Nazi Party is swiftly punished. The murders that were committed during the Night of Long Knives are all but forgotten. The Reich cabinet legalizes the actions taken during the Purge by the SS as an emergency measure to ensure the security of the country. Hitler claims that since it was all done to protect the nation of Germany, any violence committed against the SA was warranted and therefore legal. This sets a precedent for the genocide he's about to launch against the Jewish people. If it is legal for the Nazis to kill anyone who threatens the state, then all Hitler has to do is convince German citizens that the Jewish people are trying to overthrow the government and control the economy. Once the German people are convinced of this, they'll have no choice but to support the genocide of the Jews. This is an easy sell for most at the time, as they have been force-fed Nazi propaganda for several years now. On August 2, 1934, President von Hindenburg dies. Soon after, Adolf Hitler proclaims himself the Führer of the nation and gives himself absolute power. This change in power becomes official on August 19, 1934. Because of what he did to the SA leadership, Hitler now has the full support of the German military as well as the SS Guard. Since his main opposition to becoming supreme ruler of Germany was destroyed a month prior during the Night of Long Knives, there is no one to stop him. Hitler gains more and more power. He uses his SS soldiers to carry out his bidding. No one who opposes Adolf Hitler is safe any longer. His purge has been complete, and the only thing left for him to do is build up Germany's military and prepare for war. Hitler's desire to reclaim former territories of the German Empire and eventually expand his influence across the world is coming to fruition. In the years to come, the world will be plunged into war as Adolf Hitler tries to purge it of the Jewish people and basic human rights. Luckily, the Allied powers will be there to stop him, but not before millions of innocent lives are lost. Dachau concentration camp, 2022. Ulrich took another sip from his canteen. The scotch he secretly kept inside had burned going down, but then filled him with a pleasant warmth that helped keep at bay the stinging cold of the German winter. He was briefly concerned that a supervisor would find him, but sitting in his guard tower at 3 a.m., there was little chance of that happening. What did cause him to sit up out of his chair, though, was a commotion from the reception gates, quickly followed by a train whistle in the distance. He was used to the trains coming in, though they had been slowing down significantly in the last 6 years. This was unusual for one to come in this late anymore, but the old-timers talk about how right after the war the trains would come in back to back, practically waiting nose to nose to enter the camp station and unload their cargo. Ulrich sighed. He understood why this work was important, but it took a toll nevertheless. He talked to his mother about it last time he visited, but she waved his concerns away. "It's perfectly all right, darling," she said. "You just concentrate on your duty." She then followed it up with a hand motion that had grown in popularity in the last few decades, brushing the tip of her chin with her hand as if flicking away something undesirable and foul from one's mouth. It was often used when someone bit into something disgusting or had to break really unpleasant news. It was also the default response to the Reich's ongoing cultural programs in the Far East. The train thundered into the station as the automatic barriers were drawn back. There had been some terrorist attacks against the camp's receiving station in the past, radicals who opposed the party's cultural advancement programs, so the camp had responded by building giant concrete barriers that could be opened and closed to allow entry. The number of guard posts and machine gun emplacements also had doubled. With a rumbling shudder, the diesel locomotive came to a stop. The large cargo cars weren't opened yet. That part always took a while, as the camp security staff prepared for the task. Ulrich wished he had his phone to mess around on, but they'd been strictly forbidden after videos from inside one of the camps had been smuggled to America by a radical. The incident had been hugely embarrassing for the Reich. His job was to make sure nobody used the arrival of the train as a chance to escape, but it was practically impossible. After several escape attempts over the years, the entire perimeter was covered in a dense minefield. They'd have to go out and scoop up the remains of the last prisoner who attempted to escape. Suddenly, there was the sound of a sharp sergeant's whistle, and scores of armed men rushed to the receiving docks, taking up position in front of each car. Then the automatic locks disengaged and the big door swung open. Immediately, interpreters began to shout out instructions in German, Russian, and Yiddish. Though the last was largely unnecessary, there were few native Yiddish speakers anywhere outside of the United States anymore. Cargo spilled out of the cars in a series of small waves. The guards angrily shouted them into some semblance of order, even as the cargo struggled against the crowd, trying to huddle together in family groups. This was the healthy cargo. The journey from the Urals had been a long one, and the cars were standing room only, with no facilities. He could smell the stink from here, and he was grateful he hadn't been assigned to cargo control tonight. There was inevitably plenty of weak cargo, which would need assistance exiting the cars after the multi-day trip, with no food or water, and some of the cargo would already be dead on arrival, adding to the horrible stench wafting into Ulfric's nostrils from 100 yards away. He mentally willed the guards below to hurry up so the cars could be hosed down already. It always gave him a twinge of regret, seeing the cargo huddled together with loved ones, only for them to be inevitably separated by sex and age. The younger cargo was always shuttled into trucks and driven somewhere else. Ulfric had no idea where. It wouldn't make sense for the Reich to take on the additional expense of trucking them elsewhere for removal. Dachau was the only cultural refinement facility left operational in the entire Reich. The rest had been shut down gradually over the years due to lack of demand. That cargo must be useful for something else. But what, Ulfric couldn't even begin to guess. The cargo inevitably screamed and wailed as the young cargo was separated for transport, though the interpreters were quick to shout out encouragement and promises of safety. Ulfric snorted. Even cargo isn't that stupid anymore. Why bother? You could already smell the crematorium fires being lit in anticipation. Washington, D.C. America must have closer ties with the Germans. Columnist Jeannie Arendt worked hard to keep the disgust from her face. The man on the podium before her was Aaron Court, one of the senior organizers of the Sons of America Party. It was amongst the most popular and most recent far-right political organization that had sprung up in recent years, as American Nazi sympathies neared a historical all-time high. The debate was being hosted by the German Reich's diplomatic office, and Jeannie felt sympathy but also anger at the academic who had agreed to take part to defend, not growing ties, with a deeply murderous and evil regime. The debate itself was just another bit of cultural manipulation of the American people by the Reichers, who were constantly working to sway public opinion in their favor. As the Reich's greatest rival, the United States stood in the way of a lot of Reicher ambitions. Most debaters who had been invited to this dog and pony show had wisely rejected. But this Berkeley professor couldn't resist the bait. Now that the debate was officially on, her and dozens of other journalists were forced to cover it, giving the Reich access to the American homes it desired. There was perhaps no state in the world more adept at propaganda than the Third Reich. Most of their own people still refused to believe any genocide had or was still taking place within its borders. They must also assume it's just a coincidence all their neighbors in the Reich are white. Mr. Court continued speaking. But we must have not just closer political ties, but economic, scientific, and of course cultural ties with the German people. The German propaganda minister who put on this show had done his job well. Inviting only far-left academics, its allies and the Sons of America could cartoonishly lampoon in the media. Jeannie shook her head. She really wished the professor had been wise enough to not take the obvious bait. You want closer cultural ties with a xenophobic, genocidal state that's waged a campaign of racial purity for the last 80 years? The professor practically quivered in outrage. Jeannie didn't blame him, but once more, he'd simply fallen into Court's trap. Most Americans are of European descent, English, French, Swiss, yes, even German. Over 60% of Americans share a direct cultural link to the people of the Third Reich, and there's nothing wrong with honoring one's heritage. It was a pure dog whistle. The Sons of America were directly backed and even financed by the German government, who used them to push a message of racial purity with dog whistle-style slogans and talking points. Being proud of being white wasn't fascist or racist anymore, it was simply honoring your culture. The message was working too, as Nazi support had climbed dramatically in recent years and even led to the election of pro-Nazi politicians. Germany was dividing America in two from within, cleverly manipulating its free speech culture to push indoctrination. Many feared the war between the US and the German Reich, but if they could simply get the US to tear itself in two, there'd be no need for war or continued competition between the two superpowers. Jeannie sighed. The US had missed a moment in history 80 years ago when England had begged for aid, but the isolationists had won. Germany hadn't attacked Pearl Harbor, the Japanese did, and thus the US never sent forces to Europe, signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler. But what if, she wondered, what if the US had responded to Britain's call for help? Sadly, she'd never know. Venezuelan jungles. A bullet smacked into a sandbag just in front of U.S. Army Captain Bartholomew Tobias, putting the captain into an even fouler mood than he already was 3 seconds ago. "Sergeant, can you please tell me why I'm getting shot at from that hill when I specifically requested it terminate immediately?" The sergeant grunted a response as he ducked for cover from a new volley of rounds. He put 2 of the machine gun teams on turning the jungle on that hillside to Swiss cheese, but the damn fascist rebels were still alive and putting lead downrange. "Put the Mark 19 on it, now!" Captain Tobias hated doing his sergeant's jobs for him. He'd have to have a word with this particular one once they were back at the FOB and out of the range of rebel Heckler and Kochs. Damn Germans were fine engineers, and their rifles were cheap, reliable, and widely available. They were a symbol of fascist guerrillas all over the world. The sergeant barked out a series of orders, and a corporal and 2 privates set about to reorient the massively heavy automatic grenade launcher. By the looks of it, the rebels saw what was happening and didn't like it one bit. One of the privates took a round straight in the body armor center mass. Damn, but those H&K rifles really were fine bits of kit, thought the captain. The grenade launcher began to return fire now, belching out 40mm grenades at a rate of 325 rounds a minute, far slower than most machine guns, but with even more devastating effect. Each grenade had a probability of killing everything in a 5-meter radius, wounding out to 15. Soon the jungle was being absolutely leveled under an onslaught of American firepower. Then the firing went silent. The fascists were either all dead or in full retreat. If they were in retreat, a drone he'd just called in would hunt them down. But the thick jungle canopy protected the fascists from overhead observation in either visual or infrared spectrums. New microwave sensors were being field tested and finding mixed results. There's a lot of living things to track in a jungle this size. Captain Tobias sighed. They'd have to go in there after him, regardless. If anything, at least to count bodies, or body parts, after the Mark 19 did its work. Then they'd come up with a rough casualty figure, more of a guesstimate really, and shoot it up the chain so the generals and politicians in Washington could tell the public if the American democratization campaign in Venezuela was working or not. The captain wasn't a fool. He knew what the United States was doing here. Yes, half the people yearned for a real democratic government, and the U.S. was promising to deliver just that to them, but the other half were hardcore fascist, ideologically tied to the German Reich, and fatally opposed to America's liberal democracy, which they saw as decadent and wasteful. Tobias snorted in derision. He wondered how many of those fascist guerrillas would still support the Reichers if they ended up swept up in one of its cultural advancement programs and sent to Dachau. Ostensibly, the U.S. was here to support the public's desire to overthrow its fascist dictator, but realistically, the U.S. was also here because Venezuela was one of the few oil-rich South American states not firmly within America's geopolitical sphere of influence. After subjugating Europe, the Reichers had turned their attention to the Middle East and seized great swaths of it. Their armies stopped only by the threat of nuclear weapons by the U.S. But that had been 80 years ago. And now, what nations the Reich hadn't taken outright in the Middle East, it had intimidated into subjugation. After all, these countries had 500,000 German soldiers at their borders, and the might of the U.S. military was half a world away. It was an easy and very practical choice. But that meant the Reich controlled most of the world's important oil fields, from the vast deposits in the eastern Russian province to Saudi Arabia, which was basically a client state of the Third Reich. The U.S. needed to counter and secure the energy supply of itself and its allies in Eastern Asia and South America, and it just so happened that Venezuela was both rich in oil and had a popular pro-democracy movement. He'd been here for 8 months already, 1 more month left in his rotation before going home for a year and then inevitably another deployment. He doubted the ongoing war would change. Sorry, it wasn't a war in the media anymore. That part was over. It was a security and stability campaign now, one that had lasted for 5 years, in counting. As long as the flow of German weapons and supplies kept coming, the fascists could keep fighting. Hong Kong. Tokuda Masato sat impatiently, absent-mindedly swirling his drink. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room allowed for a breathtaking view of downtown Hong Kong. You could make out the water beyond reflecting light from all the buildings, but the beauty was lost on him. He was in a foul mood, and he checked his watch. He'd now been stood up for exactly 30 minutes. As if on cue, the door swung open and a Chinese woman in business attire entered alone, moving to the chair across the table from Tokuda and sitting down. Lin Gao was a trade minister and oversaw China's suppliers of rare earth minerals, a critical commodity in the modern age. Like many Chinese, she still harbored antagonistic feelings toward her Japanese allies of necessity, despite the fact that the Japanese occupation of China had ended with the U.S. victory in the Pacific 80 years ago. The 30-minute wait had been a carefully crafted power move to reinforce the fact that it was China, not Japan, who was now dominant in Asia. Masato bristled internally at the carefully crafted offense, but bit his tongue. After the fall of the Soviet Union in World War II, the Chinese Communists quickly collapsed to US-backed nationalists. China was now a vibrant democracy, having evolved from its early roots as a nationalist dictatorship at the start of the Cold War between the US and the German Reich. The Communists had fled the mainland to Taiwan in defeat, a thorn in China's side that persisted to this day, as the German Reich had thrown its support behind the only nation in the Pacific friendly to it, promising to defend the island against any reunification effort. But China and the US had a strong relationship that went back decades, and that made Japan the junior partner in a three-way security partnership. Masato put on his diplomatic face. That was his job anyways, and greeted Miss Gao in fluent Mandarin. Then he went straight to business. He'd done his research and knew Miss Gao was not someone fond of pointless pleasantries. We need you to reconsider the current level at which you export to the Reich, specifically dysprosium and terbium. We would greatly appreciate it if you significantly decrease the level at which you supply the Reich in future contracts. Lin Gao said nothing for a moment, taking the request in and processing it. You spoke to the Americans about this? Masato was quick to answer. Yes, they back our request. We must begin to think long-term and deny the Reich access to rare earth minerals it needs for advanced weapons. Gao frowned. The Reich effectively controlled the Middle East, and China imported most of its oil either from the region or from the German-Russian provinces. Slowing down supply of minerals critical to development of modern weapons would result in immediate retaliation from the Reich. And it wouldn't have to do much to retaliate. By simply turning off the oil tap, the Chinese economy would tank. China was not an American client, but their interests were very closely aligned. The Reich was an ever-hanging threat to all democracies, and if the Cold War kept raging for another 80 years, it was only a matter of time before Germany's hungry eyes turned toward East Asia. The difference between China and America was that China was a hell of a lot closer to the front lines thanks to Britain's capitulation at the end of World War II and Germany's seizure of India. I'm sure you're aware of the difficulties in granting this request. Even if I wanted to do this, Germany supplies most of my nation's oil. My own government would never allow it. Masato leaned back in his chair slightly. He could appreciate China's position. They had been warned for years to lessen their dependency on German oil. China hadn't listened. A long line of idealistic presidents had attempted to bridge the divide between the Reich and the rest of the world through trade. All it had ended up doing was handing over the strings to Germany so they could play China like a puppet. We, in conjunction with the Americans, have begun to survey vast hydrocarbon deposits in the Arctic Circle, accessible for the first time due to global warming. There's enough to offset China's dependency on German oil. Developing those fields will take years yet. This isn't an overnight fix for my nation. Masato nodded emphatically. Yes, of course, which is why we don't expect you to immediately cut off the Reich from supplies. Slowly, gradually, like turning off a tap. Lin narrowed her eyes. What were the Japanese getting at? We are ready and willing to assist you in manufacturing artificial causes for the slowdown in production. But Beijing leaks like a sieve. This operation has to be kept out of official Chinese channels. Masato tried not to grin as he saw Gao's face flinch. He was right. Reich intelligence had penetrated Beijing thoroughly, resulting in numerous security scandals. Japan will help cover your digital tracks and make sure there's nothing to suggest you are slowing down production on purpose and just making excuses, while the Americans are prepared to bankroll any losses incurred due to a slowdown in supply contracts. Gao's brow furrowed. This was a dangerous game to play. The Reich controlled the flow of oil into China, but China held the world's largest reserves of rare earth minerals, and without them, all of Germany's fancy modern weapons would be no more. If Berlin got wind that the slowdown in supply was on purpose, there's no telling what they might do. It might be the spark that finally lights the powder keg and turns this Cold War hot. But despite herself, she knew Masato and the Americans were right. The world couldn't hang in balance between two diametrically opposed ideologies for another century. The Reich needed to be weakened, chipped away at. She stood without a word and exited, another purposeful slight born of her hereditary antagonism toward the Japanese. She didn't need to say a thing. Masato knew he'd hear from her soon. London. Billy did her best to hide her nervous fidgeting by tucking her hands onto the desk. She warily eyed the corners of the room, sure that there were cameras hidden somewhere in the office, and people behind those cameras eyeing her every move, judging, critiquing, evaluating. The employment officer seated in front of her took his time going over her paperwork. She'd recently moved to London from up north, hoping to land a good, high-paying city job, but first she'd have to get her cultural verification documents. In the old days, this was merely proof of your family history. Now with the advent of genetics, everything the Reich wanted to know about you was available with a single drop of blood. The employment officer cocked an eyebrow as he reviewed her DNA report. 13% North African. Billy gulped, quickly trying to regain her composure. Yes, sir. If you look at the genealogy documents, you'll see my family traces its lineage to southern Spain. We were there when the Moors had established their caliphate. There was some blood mixing by force, I'm sure. The officer grimaced. By force, I'm sure. Those animals. He was silent a while longer as he carefully reviewed her paperwork. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. Very well then, Miss Ashton. I don't see why you should be denied work license because of race crimes against your family in the distant past. Here's to a new start, yes? Billy was flush with relief, a beaming smile on her face. Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you so much. The rest was all a formality as the proper documents were gathered, signed, and double-checked. She'd already passed her interview and now her ethnic background checked. She finally had the right to work within any of Britain's metropolitan areas where all the good jobs were. Zimbabwe. Rudolf Heinrich mopped his brow, dragging away a rag soaked with his sweat once again. It hadn't even had time to dry since the last brow wiping. He sneered with disgust at the sun above him, blazing at well over 40 degrees. He absolutely hated it here, but this is where the Reich needed him and thus where he belonged. Administering to the African protectorates was a full-time job, and a rather distasteful one at that. When he went back home to Germany, people at social events either pitied you or were disgusted at the amount of time he had to spend in ethnically unclean territory. That's why the Reich paid well for the service in Africa or the Middle East. But right now, Heinrich dreamt of assignment to the Urals, even if it meant dealing with the stubborn Russian guerrillas still fighting an 8-decade-old lost war. Not that there weren't guerrillas here to deal with. The US was funneling weapons and cash to various separatist movements, and the jungles were unsafe to traverse without a heavy security escort. But his was more of an office job, rarely needing to leave the safety of the Reich's compound. Today, unfortunately, was one of those days, and he spent that on the ground as he surveyed the damage to the oil drilling equipment. American-backed guerrillas had done this. They did all they could to sabotage oil production and mineral extraction as the German Reich hungrily fed itself off the natural resource wealth of Africa. It was the new engine of the Reich's economy. Heinrich listened to the chief engineer's damage report and assessment on repairs. It'd take at least 2 weeks to get the drilling back on track. That is, if there wasn't another guerrilla attack. He promised the chief that he'd assign additional troops for protection, while mentally trying to figure out how exactly he'd do that. It would mean stripping men and equipment from other tasks that were just as critical as this one. The Reich was spread out incredibly thin these days, an unfortunate consequence of achieving racial purity, but a problem that should resolve itself in a generation or two as the government encouraged women to have more babies. It was their patriotic duty. He headed back to his vehicle and the comfort of air conditioning, leaving the chief to bake in the hot sun as he spurred his men to work. Most of the crew was not Aryan, and that bothered Heinrich. But he understood the need to postpone cultural advancement programs in some of the Reich's territories and protectorates until they found an alternate solution or good Aryan women had more babies. It was simply a manpower issue. The lesser races had their place though, he thought, as his vehicle sped past oil field workers, and this was clearly it. Manual, unintelligent labor. Exactly what they were suited for. The armored vehicle let off a high-pitched alarm as the active countermeasure systems installed on the roof of the vehicle fired off an explosive charge, intercepting the incoming shoulder-fired rocket and exploding it harmlessly 10 feet from the vehicle, showering the armored sides and bulletproof windows with shrapnel. It didn't stop the second rocket, though. As Heinrich's vehicle was engulfed in flames, his last thought was about the damned Americans and how much he wished they would stop sticking their noses where they didn't belong. Chicago. The attic door crashed open and the heavily armed men poured into the small room. Leia screamed in terror, throwing her arms around her little brother, but rough hands grabbed her and pulled him out of her grasp as they ordered her to put her hands behind her back while shoving her to the ground. She wept bitterly as a plastic zip cuff was placed on her wrist and tightened painfully. A crowd had gathered outside the home she and her 3 younger siblings had been taking refuge in. There were angry shouts from the crowd upon seeing the teenage girl dragged out, and only growing angrier as the younger children appeared one by one. The last was a toddler who had to be carried in the arms of one of the FBI agents. Someone in the crowd threw a bottle, smashing into the side of one of the armored FBI vehicles. Immediately, an agent on a bullhorn warned the small crowd to keep its distance. The local police unholstered pepper spray canisters and threatened to use them. Law enforcement did all it could to keep these raids secret, but there were sympathizers within the various arms of law enforcement itself who routinely leaked the raids to the public online. An international agreement between the German Reich and the United States gave the Reichers legal right to reclaim an ethnic refugee fleeing from a Reich-controlled territory, but that didn't sit well with most Americans, and this included many within law enforcement. None of the officers would meet Leia's pleading gaze as she continued to cry. She twisted and turned in the officer's grip to look behind her and spot Levi, Samuel, and little Adam. She had hoped against hope that one of them might have remained hidden, but the agents had found them all. The mother of the family who had hid them away rushed one of the officers, slapping him in the face hard enough to leave a mark. A local cop grabbed her and pulled her away, but didn't place cuffs on her. It wasn't against American law to harbor ethnic refugees from overseas, but it was against the law to strike a law enforcement officer. Still, nobody here had the stomach to enforce that particular law at this particular moment. The whole business was distasteful enough for all involved. Up ahead, next to the transport vehicle she'd been loaded on and processed for deportation by two unmistakable agents of the German Gestapo, easily recognizable by the bright red Nazi armbands they wore on their left arm. They were here to verify the capture and identity of the fugitives, and upon spotting them, Leah's legs gave out on her. "Please," she sobbed to the FBI agents, the crowd, and to anyone around her. "You know what they'll do to us. Please, I'm begging you. You know what they'll do to us." Adolf Hitler, one of the worst human beings to ever walk the earth. The very existence of a man like Hitler raises a lot of questions about the nature of good and evil. One of the biggest ones being, are monsters like Hitler born evil, or has something in their life made them that way? That's why we're going back to where it all started and taking a look at Hitler before he became the Führer, before he even joined the Nazi Party in the first place. Did something happen to this man in his youth that made him the monster he turned out to be? Let's take a look and find out. It probably doesn't come as a surprise that Hitler's father was a terrible guy. Alois Hitler Sr. was born Alois Schicklgruber in 1837 in the small Austrian town of Strons. He was an illegitimate child of a 42-year-old unmarried Catholic peasant known as Maria Schicklgruber, which carried a fair bit of social stigma at the time. He wasn't even given a proper surname on his baptismal certificate. The priest just wrote illegitimate instead. This was likely a major source of insecurity for young Alois. When Alois was just 5, his mother married a local miller by the name of Johann Georg Heidler. It's strongly believed that Johann could have actually been Alois's biological father, but nobody can ever really know for certain. Some have speculated that a Jewish man named Leopold Frankenberger was actually Alois's real biological father, but there isn't any hard evidence for this whatsoever. It just came into popular belief because the idea of Hitler, history's most famous anti-Semite, having a Jewish grandfather seemed darkly ironic, but this assumption doesn't really line up with the facts. 4 years after the marriage, Maria passed away, and Alois was sent to live with his new uncle Johann Nepomuk Heidler, with whom he trained to become a cobbler. But that wasn't the path that Alois ended up taking in his life. Instead, he became a civil servant and joined the semi-military profession of being a customs official. This led him to bouncing around Austria for a number of years, and in 1877 he decided to right the biggest perceived wrong of his life and legitimize himself. With permission from his church, he asked to change his surname from Schicklgruber to that of his legal father, Johann Georg Heidler. For reasons lost to time, the official who filled in Alois's papers wrote his name as Alois Hitler rather than Alois Heidler. It's crazy to think that if Alois had never gotten his name changed, we might have been looking back in fear at the dread of Adolf Schicklgruber. Doesn't quite have the same scary ring to it, does it? So who is Hitler's mother? She was actually the third wife of Alois. His first wife was the wealthy Anna Glassel-Horer, but much like his future son, Alois was a bad guy and would have affairs frequently, often cheating on her with girls as young as 19 when he was 43. He next married one of his mistresses, Franziska Fanny Matzelberger, after Anna died, and had 2 children with her. However, he would soon leave her too for his housekeeper, young Clara Posel. But there was just one problem. Depending on the truth of Alois's parentage, Clara might have also been his first cousin, or even his niece. Yes, that's right, Hitler could have been the product of cousin incest, and things would only get stranger from there. As Alois and Clara started having children together, they had 6 in total, Hitler included, but the grand majority of them died in their infancy. Gustav, Otto, and Ida died of diphtheria the year before Hitler was born, and another one of his brothers, Edmund, would die of measles in 1900. The only surviving children of Alois and Clara were Adolf and his younger sister Paula. Adolf was born on April 20th, 1889 in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn, close to the German border. He lived with his mother and father, his biological siblings Paula and Edmund, and his 2 half-siblings from his father's second marriage, Angela and Alois Jr. While he was close with his mother, conflict with his father and his inability to adapt to school gave young Adolf a troubled childhood. Alois Hitler Sr. was a profoundly cold and cruel man to his immediate family. He was controlling, distant, and would beat his wife and children at the drop of a hat. Some even recounted that he'd make a show of beating the family dog until it wet itself on the carpet. Adolf was a confident and free-spirited young man, so he received the worst of his father's physical abuse in their frequent fights. They also moved around a lot during Hitler's youth, as Alois Sr. retired from his job as a customs official and decided to move to the Austrian town of Hafeld to farm bees. The move made things even worse for Adolf and Alois Sr.'s relationship. Adolf was enrolled in a strict state-funded elementary school and found himself at odds with the establishment's rules and and regulations. This led to further violence from Alois, who wanted his son to take a similar career path to himself. While Clara tried to defend her son from his father's wrath, she often ended up on the receiving end instead. It was a truly toxic home life. When the bee business failed, the Hitlers continued to move around over the next few years. Hitler, now 8 years old, started to take an interest in art and performance. He began painting watercolors and even taking singing lessons from his school choir. However, his life would take a major hit when his brother Edmund died in 1900. This tragedy shook young Adolf, changing him from a confident, outgoing child to a withdrawn oddball who regularly got into fights with teachers and, of course, his father. By this point, the seeds of hatred and nationalism were already growing within young Adolf. A frightening but important thing to remember is that Hitler's views, while obviously scary and extreme to us in the modern day, had its roots in extremely common sentiments for pre-World War I Austria and Germany. Hitler and his friends, despite being Austrian, were loyal to the German cause, hated growing ethnic diversity in Austria, and would even greet each other with Heil. It's likely that many of the adults in his life expressed similarly hateful views, including his father and school teachers, making it seem extremely normal to believe such things to a growing Hitler. His school performance only got worse as the years went on. Alois wanted Adolf to work at the customs office and even took him on a tour in one of his early teen years. Hitler felt that this was the moment that the differences between him and his father became truly irreconcilable. He knew by now that he wanted to attend a classical school and develop his painting skills to become a professional artist, but his father instead forced him to attend a technical school. Hitler would later recount in Mein Kampf that he did badly in this school on purpose, hoping that when his father saw how terrible his performance was, he'd allow him to pursue his dream. This was the first of many grave miscalculations in Hitler's life. But in the end, one event did allow Hitler to drop out of school: the sudden and unexpected death of Alois Sr. in 1903. Likely due to a pleural effusion, he was out drinking at a local inn when he suddenly collapsed and died shortly after. When the 14-year-old Hitler saw his father's corpse, he supposedly began to weep uncontrollably. He and his father may have constantly been at each other's throats, but losing another family member was just too much. His school performance deteriorated further until his mother eventually pulled him out of school entirely. After a year to put himself back together under the doting care of his mother, Hitler returned to school with improved grades and performance. He was never a particularly good student, but he was able to pass his exit exams with 2 different attempts. He left school with no intentions to continue pursuing a technical career. With his controlling father dead and his mother being far more supportive of her son following his dreams, he set off to cosmopolitan Vienna to develop his artistic skills and hopefully join the Academy of Fine Arts. But by now, we all know how that turned out for the aspiring artist. Hitler was rejected twice by the Academy, finding his artistic abilities subpar. Because Hitler specialized in drawing landscapes and buildings, they suggested instead that he try his luck at the local Academy of Architecture. However, this is where Hitler's earlier decisions came back to bite him, because his poor school performance left him without the necessary academic qualifications to enter the architecture college. Naturally, this left Hitler feeling pretty sour about his time in Vienna. But contrary to popular belief, his rejection in art school wasn't nearly as important in his development as the ideas and beliefs he was beginning to learn from his new locale. Hitler had always been a nationalist, but in Vienna, it's believed that he first started developing his hardcore anti-Semitism. He read local magazines that blamed Jewish people for all the problems that Austria and Germany were experiencing. Some who knew Hitler claimed his anti-Semitism predated his time in Vienna, but it seemed as though this time in Vienna finally gave him the political and philosophical framework for his irrational hatred of the Jewish people. But amongst all this, one final tragedy would strike the now 18-year-old Adolf. His mother Clara, the only surviving member of his family that he was truly close with, had been diagnosed with terminal breast cancer at the age of 47. She was diagnosed and treated by the Hitler family doctor, Dr. Edward Bloch. He later recounted that Clara took the news with dignity, as a deeply religious woman who believed that everything happened was part of God's plan. Adolf was devastated. Dr. Bloch described the closeness of their relationship in later interviews, stating, "While Hitler was not a mother's boy in the usual sense, I never witnessed a closer attachment. Their love had been mutual. Clara Hitler adored her son. She allowed him his own way whenever possible. For example, she admired his watercolor paintings and drawings and supported his artistic ambitions in opposition to his father, at what cost to herself, one may guess." When she finally died from the disease, Hitler was, according to Bloch, the saddest man he'd ever seen. He was utterly broken, his last tether to humanity and decency cut. It was clear that Dr. Bloch's good treatment of his mother meant a great deal to Hitler, as he was one of the few Austrian Jews that Hitler allowed to move from Austria to the United States in 1940, as his genocidal plans were beginning to pick up steam. Later, being interviewed, Dr. Bloch described Clara as a kind and decent woman, and said that she would roll in her grave if she ever knew what a monster her beloved son became in the end. So, we return to the big question. Did Hitler's childhood turn him into a monster? Did Clara and Alois raise him to be a person capable of committing genocide? Was his childhood so tragic that it made him evil? Well, no. Hitler's beliefs were the product of popular and toxic philosophies that were rife during his time: nationalism, authoritarianism, anti-Semitism. It might be more comforting to believe that Hitler was some kind of fluke, a supervillain born out of incest and abused into being evil by a controlling father. But even if Adolf Hitler had never joined the Nazi Party, a man like him would have, given how common it was to think like he did back then. Hitler never could have done what he did alone. It took millions agreeing with him, and millions more simply doing nothing or being killed while trying to rebel. Bad childhoods don't cause genocides. A society growing to hate its most vulnerable people does. The Kriegsmarine, the terrifying naval force of the Third Reich during World War II, manned by over 800,000 soldiers at its peak, with 22 of the particularly feared destroyer-class vessels at its disposal. Even one of these would be a formidable opponent. But several Nazi destroyer ships zeroing in on an Allied convoy? Boy, you are really in trouble. Today, a squadron of destroyers approach their prey, preparing for an easy victory until they see a huge shape on the horizon. A Nazi commander on the deck asks, "Is that an iceberg?" No, it couldn't possibly be. Wait, is that? But then, it's already too late for this hapless Wehrmacht battalion, as dozens of British Spitfires and Mosquito bombers seem to spill out of this massive iceberg, bombing and machine gunning the shocked Nazi destroyers into submission. How is this possible? Where did they all come from? Were some of the Kriegsmarine's most terrifying ships just brought to their knees by a rogue iceberg? Well, not quite. What we just described was the intended result of Project Habakkuk, a crazy brainchild of the British military during World War II. The grand plan? An aircraft carrier made of ice. Project Habakkuk was a piece of deranged military beauty, 2 miles long, 200 feet deep, and 300 feet wide across the beam. The Project Habakkuk aircraft carrier could carry 200 Spitfires, 100 Mosquito bombers, 404 British military officers, and 3,216 petty officers, soldiers, and workers. This icy beast would be around twice the size of your average aircraft carrier even today, and would be constructed with a practically magical new wonder material, pykrete, a frozen alloy constructed of 14% sawdust and 86% pure ice. The Project Habakkuk aircraft carrier was a creation unlike anything military history has ever seen, and would remain to be unlike anything ever seen again. You're probably wondering, how come I've never heard of this? That's because the harebrained plan never truly saw the light of day, but it doesn't make it any less fascinating. It goes without saying that in addition to being some of history's biggest monsters, the Nazis were also huge weirdos. From the sickening experiments of madmen like Josef Mengele to the absurd and often impractical Wunderwaffe superweapons, Nazi military plans were quantifiably crazy. And sometimes to defeat crazy, you have to be a little crazy yourself. The particular kind of crazy that fueled Project Habakkuk came to us courtesy of one Mr. Jeffrey Pike. Pike was the kind of guy you'd love to have a beer with, seeing as spearheading the creation of an iceberg aircraft carrier is only one of the many interesting things he did in his life. He escaped a German internment camp in World War I after a near-death experience. He spied on Nazi Germany, despite being Jewish and thus in extreme danger, to find out what the German people really thought of Hitler, and worked on Operation Plow, which was an attempt to use another one of Pike's wacky inventions to help liberate Norway from Nazi control. With the incredible resume of a prison breaker, rebel, journalist, spy, strategist, and inventor, Pike made an extremely valuable friend, Admiral Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten thought that Pike was a mad genius and believed that his strange strategic mind could be an asset to the British war effort. Thankfully for Pike, Mountbatten was the Chief of Combined Operations, a department of the British War Office tasked with planning attacks on the Nazi forces in Europe. It was during his work on the aforementioned Project Plow in the United States that Pike was hit by a bolt of inspiration. They were running out of aluminum and steel, and cultivating more of it was both time-consuming and costly. But do you know what sturdy material is an awful lot easier to make? Ice. Ice could be manufactured for only a fraction of the energy it took to manufacture workable steel, and numerous case studies had shown naturally occurring icebergs decimating thought to be unsinkable ships. If 9 times out of 10 icebergs beat ships, Pike thought, why not make an iceberg ship? Pike was so enthusiastic about the idea that he didn't even wait to get back to England to share it. He wrote about his plans and sealed them in a diplomatic bag with a written note that was only to be opened and read by Louis Mountbatten. The admiral, who seemed to be enamored with the idea that Pike came up with, immediately took the proposal to the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill was apparently taken with the idea too, and gave Pike and Mountbatten the go-ahead to further explore the idea of an Iceberg aircraft carrier. This wasn't the first time a floating ice microisland for storing planes had been pitched, as a similar concept was suggested by German scientist Dr. A. Gerke all the way back in 1930. In every iteration since then, the idea had essentially been laughed off. Pike and Mountbatten were the only ones crazy enough to actually go through with it. But of course, for every crazy dreamer, you need some more down-to-earth experts to keep their feet on the ground. Max Perutz, a Nobel Prize-winning molecular biologist, was brought in to assess the feasibility of Pike's floating ice fortress. Sadly for Pike, Perutz didn't see much merit in the idea, as natural icebergs have only a tiny portion of their overall surface area above the water and were prone to tipping. While this isn't a problem for an iceberg, it would be a catastrophe for an aircraft carrier. To make this whole idea work, an entirely new substance would need to be created, and that entirely new substance was pikecrete, Pike's sub-zero ice sawdust alloy. It was stronger, melted slower, and most importantly of all, was significantly more buoyant. Pikecrete also had the miraculous properties of being able to be carved like wood and set into shapes like metal, making it ideal for Pike's ambitious construction project. However, Perutz once again found a potentially devastating drawback. The entire structure would sag if not constantly cooled. In order to solve this, Project Habakkuk would need fitted external insulation and an interior ducting system and refrigeration plant. This would keep the carrier at a perpetually stable temperature and prevent potentially deadly sagging. Research on Project Habakkuk and the pikecrete that made it possible continued in secret under the Smithfield Meat Market in London, where Pike and Perutz took advantage of the pre-existing walk-in meat freezers. If it wasn't absurd enough already, the secret experiments were literally hidden behind a wall of hanging frozen meat. But things were about to take another insane step forward, as a coalition of British and Canadian engineers began constructing a large-scale model in Jasper National Park of Alberta, Canada. Even at only 60 by 30 feet, a minuscule fraction of the intended size of the final carrier, the model still weighed around 1,000 tons. Testing was rigorous, with the main areas of focus being nailing the proper insulation and refrigeration techniques to make Project Habakkuk seaworthy, and the artillery and ballistics defense to keep it above water during battle. The grunt work of creating this huge model was performed by conscientious objectors to the war who didn't even know what they were making. Though even the top brass behind this clandestine military project probably harbored doubts about what they were doing. All except Geoffrey Pike, the true believer behind it all. He was watching his crazy dream come to life in real time. However, in April of 1943, Pike's dream project ran into trouble. Perutz, who had just discovered the perfect 14:86 sawdust to ice ratio for pikecrete back in the UK, gave the grim warning to Pike that they'd have no hope of hitting their 1944 deadline if tests weren't completed by May, and the cost of Project Habakkuk was running into the multi-millions, with more outlays for steel reinforcement and insulation around the hull. It was quickly becoming clear that if a comparatively tiny-scale model was such a huge financial drain, the real thing would run up some truly monstrous costs. The whole planning and production process played out kinda like a bizarre dark comedy. During the 1943 Quebec Conference, where leaders of the Allied forces gathered in Quebec, a particularly strange incident played out. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt gathered to see a demonstration of the strength and durability of pikecrete from Lord Mountbatten. In order to show the two world leaders how resistant the pikecrete was to conventional arms fire, he pulled out his service pistol and blasted it, sending the bullet ricocheting around the room. According to the diary of one of the witnesses, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the bullet rebounded out of the block and buzzed round our legs like an angry bee. According to Max Perutz, a similar pikecrete ricochet incident almost saw Alan Brooke shot again in Combined Operations Headquarters back in England. It was a little less Saving Private Ryan and a little more Monty Python. But things were about to get a whole lot worse for Project Habakkuk. After the Canadian engineers said it was impossible to get the Project Habakkuk carrier finished in 1944, Pike's superiors at the Combined Operations Headquarters felt they needed American funding and participation to ever get this project finished. While the American government was willing to pitch in and get their own awesome Iceberg aircraft carrier for their trouble, their involvement came with a pretty heavy caveat for one member of the team. Geoffrey Pike. The man behind all of this had to go. While Lord Mountbatten was a big fan of Pike's eccentric style and his off-the-walls ideas, the American forces were not. He left a bad taste in their mouth after the failure of Project Plow, causing a rift between him and the United States Army personnel. Some of the top brass at Combined Operations, such as Pike's old friend John Bernal, had also grown tired of the bizarre inventor's antics and supported the motion to remove him from the project. Much to his dismay, Pike was removed and excluded from the project he'd conceived, and the work went on without him under the control of Bernal and Perutz. As the demands placed on the Project Habakkuk aircraft carrier grew, the cost continued to grow with them. The hull was made 40 feet thick to protect from torpedoes fired by German U-boats. The engineers had to figure out how to create a 100-foot rudder to steer the epic Berg ship. Spoilers, they did not. And Combined Operations had to choose between Pike's original design or the 3 designs presented to them by the Canadian naval architects and engineers. The whole project was becoming a chaotic mess, and criticisms from all sides were beginning to pile up. But the team persisted. Of course, effort and persistence can only take you so far, and not every seemingly great idea is destined to be fulfilled. In practice, the Project Habakkuk carrier had some huge issues. For example, because of its insane size, the carrier would only be able to travel at around 6 knots per hour, compared to the typical 30 knots of your standard aircraft carrier. The sheer amount of sawdust pulp it would take to create all the pikecrete would have crippled Allied paper production during the war, and the sheer cost of creating even one Project Habakkuk aircraft carrier would equal the time, financial cost, and resources of constructing a whole fleet of more conventional ships. By December of 1943, it was finally concluded that Project Habakkuk aircraft carriers were too expensive and too impractical to ever be fully conceived. Even Admiral Mountbatten, one of the first figures of the Combined Operations headquarters to believe in Pike's idea, finally withdrew from the project. This was officially the end of Pike's frosty dreams, and sadly, it wasn't all that long before the end of him too. Geoffrey Pike would take his own life with an overdose of sleeping pills in 1948, a mere 5 years after the end of his most strange and fantastical idea. Over the course of 3 hot summers, the 60-foot prototype was melted back down to nothing. Could this incredible Iceberg aircraft carrier have turned the tide of the war even sooner? Well, nobody can really know, as the last of the Axis powers surrendered only 2 years later in 1945. Though one thing can't be denied. While his life might have ended tragically and his ideas went down in history more as curiosities than life-changing innovations, the world needs and always has needed people like Geoffrey Pike. After all, if you want to have a great idea, sometimes you need to be a little bit crazy. April 30th, 1945, the Wolf's Lair. The war is lost. Every German soldier and citizen knows this, and nobody feels the sting of impending defeat more bitterly than Adolf Hitler, Führer of the Third and hopefully final Reich. His dreams of a 1,000-year German Reich are over, and with Soviet forces closing in quickly to the east, the Americans and their allies on the west, the noose is literally tightening around Hitler's neck. He'll die for what he's done. There's no doubt about that. If captured by the Soviets, there's no telling what tortures and humiliation await him. He is, after all, the mastermind behind the deaths of millions upon millions of Soviet citizens and soldiers. Then there's the many tens of thousands that were starved, experimented on, or simply executed in his POW camps, all with his direct approval. He'd nearly brought the Soviet Union to its knees, and now it was out for blood. Entire Soviet units were weathering withering defensive fire and rushing past German units simply to get to Hitler before he could disappear. Soviet spies had for months been prowling the countryside, all on the hunt for the war's greatest prize, Hitler's head. To the west, the once nearly defeated French and British were being led across the Rhine by a massive bulwark of American firepower. French forces stung with bitter defeat and were eager for their own revenge. He hadn't been as heavy-handed in France as he'd been with the Soviets, but his forces had still carried out many abuses and atrocities under his watch. The humiliation of having lost their capital also spurred the French forces on. The British had narrowly escaped utter annihilation at Dunkirk, and contemplating these dark last days of the war, Hitler kicks himself mentally for his foolishness. It had been him who had given the order for advancing panzer forces to stop, confident that there was no need to rush the offensive, and he had plenty of time to crush the British forces with their backs to the sea. His generals had begged him to reconsider, but the Führer's word is law, and none may question it. The concentration camps that dotted Europe were filled with those who had. His failure to eradicate the British Expeditionary Force when he had the chance meant that Operation Sea Lion, meant to take the British Islands, had become a strategic impossibility. With Britain out of the war, the United States would never have been able to invade Fortress Europe. The island nation was absolutely integral for the consolidation of American expeditionary firepower and as a jumping-off point for the invasion. The Americans, perhaps they would be more lenient with him. After all, relatively speaking, he hadn't committed any atrocities against them. It'd been the Japanese who'd given them a good and proper bloody nose. The capture of Tokyo should vent most of their anger. But the Americans were already even now maneuvering for a greater share of the world stage. They'd seen the future and were poised to seize it for themselves. For too long, they'd sat in their hemisphere of the planet, and with the world's greatest empires in ruins, it was their chance to take the reins of global leadership. That meant that they'd have to establish their international legitimacy, which in itself meant one thing: Hitler would be tried and indubitably executed for his crimes. There was no escaping his fate. Or was there? Hitler gathers his two most loyal and remaining aides. Both know the stakes and what will happen if their beloved leader is captured. Secrecy is of the utmost importance. The only other conspirators in on the plot are a dentist, himself a loyal supporter of the Führer, and his beloved Eva Braun. Two Jewish prisoners from a local concentration camp have been specifically chosen for what comes next. His aides had scoured all available stock from concentration camps across Germany and what little territory the Wehrmacht still controlled, until they found a man and woman who both matched the age and general build and height of the Führer and his wife. They'd been secretly taken to meet with Hitler's dentist, who, through painstaking effort lasting many hours, had filed and scraped to perfectly reproduce a copy of the Führer and his wife's teeth. Then, the woman had been poisoned with cyanide and the man shot through the temple. The dentist had been shot shortly after. No loose ends could be left behind. The two bodies were moved into position outside the wolf's lair, then set on fire until only unrecognizable bones remained. This had been kept secret even from his own guards, who'd been simply alerted that the Führer had committed suicide, and his body immediately burned per his request. The two piles of bone and ash would be left behind for the Soviets to discover, and Hitler was betting that the difficulty of identifying the remains accurately, as well as Stalin's refusal to publicly admit Hitler may have evaded his grasp, would lead them to declare that they had indeed found Hitler's remains. Dental records would prove the identity. Now Hitler and his wife, wearing disguises, are rushed to a waiting jeep. The exodus of personnel from the wolf's lair is the perfect cover for the German Führer to make his escape from the bunker without arousing suspicion. The fanatical SS guards that remained would fight to the death, believing the place to be a place of honor. Or perhaps they'd simply surrender, knowing that the war was truly well and over. It mattered little to Hitler at this point. From the forests of Germany, Hitler travels south and into Switzerland. A hefty bribe convinces the border guards to allow the unknown Germans through. High-ranking Germans have been fleeing for weeks now, and bribing Swiss border guards was nothing new. For the guards, it was a chance to enrich themselves, and as long as it was kept quiet, no one would ever be the wiser. Hitler must hurry, though, because his opportunity to escape is quickly closing. He travels across Switzerland and finally into Italy, where they successfully hide amongst streams of refugees pouring across the border. There are still fascist supporters in Italy, stinging from the loss of the war and the murder of Mussolini, and a former Italian intelligence agent meets up with the Führer and his escort, helping them get to the coast. Late at night, outside a small Italian fishing village, the Führer and his escorts fire up a single flare into the sky. A mile off the shore is a German U-boat, on station for the last week. It doesn't dare surface except at night to recharge its batteries, and has been sitting off the Italian coast waiting for the agreed-upon signal. Lookouts on the deck of the U-boat spot the flare and hurriedly shout to the captain below. On the beach, the group spots the countersign: two bright flashes of a spotlight followed by one long flash. Dragging a rowboat to the surf, the Führer and his wife, his two aides, and the Italian spy all make their way to the waiting submarine. As they near it, the captain and an armed escort are waiting for them. They throw a rope out to the small dinghy to help pull it in. First off the boat is the Führer, and then his wife, Miss Braun. As the first aide attempts to climb up the rope ladder lowered to them, though, he's shoved back into the boat by a sailor. Without warning, the armed sailors open fire, killing the two aides and the fascist spy. Without a word, the captain of the U-boat drops an incendiary grenade into the boat, and in moments, it's a scorching inferno. The boat will sink, and the final bit of evidence hinting Hitler might have escaped the Allies' grasp will go to the bottom of the Mediterranean with them. Once inside the submarine, Hitler settles into the captain's own personal cabin. He looks at his beloved wife, and after 2 weeks on the run, breathes a final sigh of relief. Even now, news is spreading throughout Europe and the world that the German Führer is dead. Efforts to locate his dental records and authenticate the discovery, though, are underway. The Americans and the British are asking for access to the body to do their own confirmation, but the Soviets are so far refusing. Even now, tensions are flaring between the former allies, and as the German U-boat pulls away from the coast, Hitler wishes nothing more than the damn communists and arrogant Americans tearing each other's throat out. Perhaps then he might be able to return. Once the Soviets and the Americans have destroyed each other, Hitler could return from his exile and lead the German people to ultimate triumph over his two weakened armies. He tells his plan to Eva, who smiles in delight, nodding her approval. The thought of his triumphant return and the U-boat captain's warm bed is the first bit of comfort he's had in weeks. Hitler fancies himself a Napoleon as he drifts off to sleep, returning from exile to triumphantly lead his people into the glory he deserves. For the next first few days, the U-boat steams beneath the waves as it makes its way to the Strait of Gibraltar. The trip takes longer than usual, as the submarine must carefully avoid Allied vessels and merchant ships of all kinds. By now, the Kriegsmarine has officially surrendered, and the Allies are demanding a full register of all operational U-boats and verifying the surrender of their crews. The last thing they want is a renegade U-boat attempting to earn itself a final bit of revenge by taking on unwary ships with its remaining stores of weapons and fuel. But the real reason is the Allies don't want more senior German leadership slipping through their grasp, spirited away to safety around the globe thanks to the stealthy U-boats. Luckily for Hitler, German military records have been scattered or lost in the chaos of the invasion of Germany, and it'll be time yet before his U-boat's disappearance is noticed. As the submarine approaches the Strait of Gibraltar, though, it enters the most dangerous part of its journey. Here, Allied forces have established a picket of warships for most of the war. Hitler's hope is the crews have been pacified by the victory and not manning their posts as diligently as they should be. Whether that's the case or not, the U-boat successfully moves past the Allied picket, diving to its maximum depth and running almost imperceptibly silently. When no depth charges rain down around them, the men breathe a sigh of relief. Ahead is the Atlantic Ocean, where it would take a miracle to find them. The most difficult part of his journey is well and truly over. Freedom is now all but guaranteed. Retiring to his cabin, Hitler begins writing his new memoir. His new Reich will need a new source of inspiration, something to lift the broken spirits of his people and spur them to future glory. All the pieces are in place. The Soviets and Americans have all but forgotten their wartime cooperation, and the stage seems to be set in Europe for a decisive confrontation between the two. Hitler is confident the Americans will win. Theirs is the superior navy, and their military hasn't suffered nearly as much as the Soviet war machine has. More to the point, much of the Soviet military relied on abundant American aid, everything from boots to ammunition, food, blankets, and even the tens of thousands of trucks that made the Great Red Army's counterattack possible. All came from America. The Soviet Union was a land in ruin, and without US aid, it would never be able to defeat it. The US, though, would learn the same bitter lesson Hitler had learned and pay dearly for every mile of Soviet territory it was forced to fight for. Stalin had refused defeat even when victory for the Wehrmacht seemed all but inevitable, and his forces were besieging his namesake city. He'd never accept defeat at the hands of the Americans. The long, bitter war would result in an American win, but they would be thoroughly expended and exhausted of war by then. Hitler needed only return in glory to his people, inspire them to rise up, and the Americans would simply let him. They would never have the stomach or resources to wage yet a third war. Then the gloriously reborn Third Reich would easily annihilate its utterly spent and decimated opponents, claiming Europe for Hitler. But he'd have to bide his time until the moment to strike was at hand. The U-boat makes its way across the Atlantic, able to move on the surface now that the threat of discovery is negligible. Hitler is glad for this. Not only will the submarine move faster on the surface, but it gives him a chance to take in fresh air on the deck. He'd never let any of his men know it, but he's terrified of tight spaces. And frankly, the stink of several dozen unwashed men was strong enough to taste it, no matter how good the air recyclers worked. As the sun sets, the U-boat continues on its course to Argentina. They'll cross south of Patagonia, where the submarine can remain submerged and ignore the historically tumultuous Antarctic weather that plagues the area year-round. Fuel will run out before then, but the Kriegsmarine has established several small refueling stations across the Atlantic on tiny islands which remain undiscovered by former allies. These are meant to be used in emergencies only and are unmanned, forcing the crew to refuel the boats themselves. With the stars twinkling in the skies above him, Hitler considers them and what glorious future prophecies they may hold for him. He has been defeated, yes, but setbacks are nothing new to him. He arose from a faceless, insignificant soldier on the front lines of World War I to lead the greatest nation the world had ever known, and he'll do it again, even if he must endure humiliating exile for a few years first. But here in the open Atlantic, the stars are bright, and so is Adolf Hitler's future. He may be in the middle of a bitter winter now, but soon it'll be springtime for Hitler. All he has to do is wait. This was obviously a fictitious story, or was it? While Hitler remains were indeed authenticated by the Soviet Union, they never let American or British personnel take a good look at them until much later after their discovery. Even then, they refused to allow them to take bone samples, which would have helped to authenticate the remains. While most believe that the remains were indeed those of Hitler, due to x-rays of Hitler's skull taken a year before his death, it is fair to say that there remains some doubt, and the last thing that Stalin would have wanted is for his people to know, let alone the world, that the Soviet Union's greatest enemy had indeed fled his grasp. So, maybe our story is more a reality than fiction after all. By now, Hitler would be dead, and the truth may never be known. This video is sponsored by Wondrium, a museum for your mind with over 6,000 hours of video courses from trusted, inspiring experts and non-fiction storytellers. Click on the link in the description to get started with your free trial today. When people think of Hitler's headquarters, they usually think of the Eagle's Nest, the mountaintop headquarters that's become a popular tourist site as people come to see the gathering place of some of history's biggest monsters. The one person who is not such a big fan? Hitler. The Nazi dictator didn't like heights and only visited it 14 times. His choice in headquarters was lower, more hidden, more fortified. Hidden in the woods over 5 miles from the nearest town of Rostoberg, it doesn't even lie in modern-day Germany. Once Prussia, now Poland, those who make the pilgrimage could almost miss it. Today, it lies covered in moss and ringed by trees, a relic of a time gone by. But those who get close will find an impressive sight. A massive stone fortress, it has the distinctive name the Wolf's Lair. Why? Because Hitler, never shy to proclaim his own superiority, had taken on Wolf as a nickname and liked to litter it through his various headquarters in Europe. And he was unsatisfied with his current choice of hideaways, especially with the war raging in 1940. And in 1940, he ordered his party machine to start construction on the new headquarters, far from the chaos of the war. And it would be massive. The organization taught, Hitler's civilian and military engineering organization, was quickly put to work, and so were the large collection of forced laborers they commanded. The plans were drawn up and the total complex would be around 2.5 square miles in size. With 3 security zones, it would be connected to civilization by a nearby airfield and rail line. But only those in the know would be aware, because if the Wolf's Lair had one thing going for it, it was camouflage. The forest provided its own form of camouflage, with thick trees, bushes, and grass making it hard to see what was beyond the horizon. But that was nothing compared to what would be added around the Wolf's Lair. Artificial trees would be erected around the complex and on top of the buildings, making it look like part of the forest from the air. Buildings would be connected with dense netting, so approaching soldiers wouldn't be able to see. Much of the forest had been carved out for the massive fortress, and that was nothing compared to what was going on inside. The Wolf's Lair was known for its 3 security zones, each built in a concentric circle. Each one had a unique purpose. The first security zone was at the heart of the compound. All it took was one look at the facility to know no one was getting in if they weren't supposed to be there. Surrounded by steel fences, the zone was guarded by high-ranking SS officers and managed by some of Hitler's closest allies. Inside, camouflaged bunkers made from concrete reinforced with steel would hold Hitler and his inner circle for military conferences and when they were hiding from Allied forces. Hitler's specific quarters were built on the northern side, so they would never even be hit by revealing sunlight. The other zones served 2 purposes. The second zone surrounded Hitler's inner circle, and it was a place of refuge for high-ranking allies of Hitler, including Albert Speer and the master of the organization taught, Fritz Todt. While it served as a living quarters, the fortified area was also filled with military barracks, and all those who were within knew they were potentially the barrier between the Allies and Hitler and might be called upon to defend it. But if the place was designed properly, the enemy would never reach it. Security Zone 3 encircled the other 2, and it had one purpose: repel all invaders. Heavily fortified, it was surrounded by landmines and dotted with watchtowers and checkpoints. And overseeing the whole thing was the Führerbegleitbrigade, a powerful armored unit of the Wehrmacht that was often assigned to personally escort Hitler. The exterior of the complex was also guarded by a local army unit, and they were equipped with tanks and anti-aircraft guns. If anyone got too close to the Wolf's Lair, they would likely find themselves overwhelmed, even if they had no clue what they'd gotten too close to. And they would have good reason for the security. By the time the Wolf's Lair was completed in June 1941, it was easier to list which countries Hitler hadn't invaded. The Nazi leader had conquered much of Western Europe, including France, and was at war with Great Britain. While Germany and Russia had been allies, that was about to end. Only one day after the lair was completed, Hitler began invading the massive Soviet Union. He was the most wanted man in the world, and at the same time as he launched a new front in the war, he moved into his new massive bunker. It would become his de facto capital on the Eastern Front, and it would be far more than just a hideout, because Hitler spared no expense. The Wolf's Lair wasn't just a bunker, it became Hitler's primary living quarters during the height of the war. The dictator had requested amenities that would be more at home in a high-end hotel. He had access to a barber shop because that distinctive mustache didn't shape itself every morning. He would dine on the finest cuisine at an on-site restaurant. He even had a personal casino for himself and his inner circle. I guess it wasn't enough to gamble on the lives of millions of soldiers in Russia. But if you thought he enjoyed it, maybe think twice. As the war front grew and the United States got involved in the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Hitler became increasingly unstable, erratic, and paranoid. The dictator became obsessed with the idea that he was being targeted, and even suspected many of his closest inner circle. As the war raged on, the staff and regulars at the Wolf's Lair grew. While many bunkers only housed a skeleton crew, the Wolf's Lair needed guards, engineers, and staff to attend to Hitler's every wish. At its height, the facilities housed a massive 2,000 people, all of whom were subject to Hitler's fast-changing whims. He had a routine, and he did not want it disturbed. During most times, Hitler was predictable. He would take his daily walk with his dog, then look at the mail that had been funneled in by plane or train. He would meet with his military advisors and then go for a run before lunch. He would sit in the same seat every day between Alfred Jodl and Otto Dietrich before adjourning to deal with non-military matters. Coffee would follow, after which there would be more military briefings. But there was one area of the day where Hitler was most paranoid. Hitler was convinced someone was plotting to kill him. And he was probably right, but they might not have been in the bunker. But that didn't stop him from becoming obsessed with the idea that his food was being poisoned. He was served elaborate vegetarian meals in the on-site restaurant, but before he would take a bite, he insisted that the staffers taste it before he did. Whether there was a risk or not, Hitler was so convinced that he was being targeted that the staff became paranoid as well, many weeping with relief when they didn't die after their job as tasters. There were brief moments of peace in this headquarters of evil. When the day's business would end, Hitler's bunker almost became a party. After dinner, everyone would retire to the on-site movie theater where films were shown to the entire crowd. Afterward, Hitler and his inner circle would retreat to his private room. They would listen to music, usually his favorite Wagner or Beethoven music, but above all, Hitler loved to hear himself talk and would frequently give elaborate monologues to those closest to him. But danger was lurking, and the Nazi leader was looking in the wrong direction. The Wolf's Lair was supposed to be safe, and it was, from outside enemies. But Hitler had made many enemies in his inner circle. His paranoia, erratic behavior, and genocidal obsession with purging Germany of those he deemed undesirable had made many in the military see him as an unfit leader. By 1944, the German army was the underdog in the war, and military officers were discussing if the only way to save the German war effort was to eliminate its leader. A group of officers decided to assassinate Hitler and install a new military-centric government that would turn the tide of the war. But to get to Hitler, they'd have to strike at his inner sanctum. Hitler had been well protected from the outside, but he was vulnerable to those he let in. One of those was Staff Officer Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated war hero who had access to the daily conference meeting. He would bring a briefcase bomb into the meeting, place it near Hitler, and get clear in time. It would be the closest anyone got to assassinating Hitler, but close was no cigar. From the moment of the day the assassination began, things started to go wrong. It all built to an explosive end. Von Stauffenberg's plan was thrown off when the meeting was moved to a different room, as the Wolf's Lair bunker was under construction. The new room was unfamiliar, and von Stauffenberg ran into more trouble when the meeting was called earlier than expected. The bomb was placed, but it was moved slightly before it went off, and when it blew, Hitler was only lightly wounded. Although 4 people in the meeting died as a result of their injuries, Hitler survived, but his inner sanctum had been pierced. It was the beginning of the end. The assassination attempt and the associated Operation Valkyrie had failed, and collaborators were quickly arrested and many were executed. But the Wolf's Lair was about to face a much bigger problem. Hitler had learned the hard way what Napoleon learned a century earlier. Invading Russia rarely goes well. The German invasion had run into rough waters, and now the Russians were turning the tide. The Red Army was on the march, and by October 1944 they reached the borders of East Prussia. They soon came across the Wolf's Lair, but Hitler had abandoned it, heading toward his final bunker in the last days of the war. But the Russians wanted to make an example of this complex. The order was given to bring it down, and it would be no easy task. The fortified bunkers were not meant to be destroyed from the outside, but that didn't deter the Russians. They brought in a whopping 18,000 pounds of TNT and detonated it in January 1945. The whole area shook, the smoke cleared, and much of the building was still standing. Hitler had led his country to ruin, but taking down his favorite bunker was proving to be less possible than toppling his regime. And that wasn't the only reason it was difficult to take down. The Red Army soon found that clearing the many landmines surrounding the installation would be challenging. In total, 54,000 landmines would be removed from the area surrounding the complex, a testament to just how fortified it was, and how paranoid Hitler was that anyone would penetrate it. And even today, Hitler's massive complex still stands. The area of the Wolf's Lair was initially taken over by the post-war government of Poland and fell into disrepair. But when the communist government fell in the 90s, the new government saw potential for something else, a tourist site. The ruins draw almost 300,000 visitors a year and is surrounded by hotels and restaurants. There have even been proposals to rebuild it to make it safer and more attractive to tourists. But that's raised some questions about what the appropriate way to handle the legacy of a monster is. Should the site be razed to avoid it becoming a gathering site for Hitler's remaining fans? Today, the Wolf's Lair still stands as a testament to the massive war machine Hitler built, and how ultimately it was still doomed, just like his regime. A young Adolf Hitler sits outside a Vienna cafe painting a picture of the building across the street. He is covered in dirt from the ground he slept on the previous night. He's completely broke and homeless. Hatred fills his heart as he receives rejection after rejection from art schools and patrons. No one wants him or his paintings, it seems. In a few years, everything will change. The struggling artist that is Adolf Hitler will transform into a monster, and his art is partially to blame. Before uncovering the secret history of Adolf Hitler's art, let's make something very clear. Adolf Hitler was a terrible person, a genocidal maniac, and the driving force behind the most bloody and brutal war in the 20th century. He has no redeeming qualities, and there is no excuse to justify the atrocities he committed in World War II. We will be exploring his early life and art career not to humanize the man, but to understand his shortcomings and examine his art career. Hitler was born out of wedlock on April 20, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, Austria, to his mother Maria Anna Schicklgruber. He was baptized Catholic, although he would denounce all organized religions and only worship the state once he started his reign of terror. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official, which is the career he wanted for his son. However, Hitler had other plans, and they all hinged on the death of his father. In 1898, Hitler's family moved to Linz, Austria. It was there that Adolf Hitler was educated, or at least took classes, as he never finished school. By some accounts, Adolf Hitler was a nightmare child who was constantly disruptive and wouldn't follow directions. He wasn't very intelligent, or at least he didn't care enough to try very hard in school. This would eventually lead to him pursuing alternate paths throughout his life. Hitler and his father rarely saw eye to eye when discussing his future. All Hitler wanted to do was paint and be an artist. His father was much more practical and forced his son to go to secondary school so he could eventually work for Habsburg civil service. Hitler dragged his feet and did everything he could to just barely pass his classes in the hopes that his father would realize he wasn't suited for civil service. But then Hitler caught a break. In 1903, Alois Hitler died, and his son was now free to quit school and pursue his dream of becoming an artist. This would be a turning point in young Adolf's life, one that would end up with him developing his anti-Semitism ideology and eventually becoming the nightmare leader of the Nazi Party. In 1907, at the age of 18, Adolf Hitler grabbed his paintbrushes and headed to Vienna, which was then the epicenter for fine arts in Austria. It was here that Hitler firmly believed he would develop his skills and become one of the greatest artists the world had ever known. However, like with most things in his life, Hitler held delusions of grandeur. He never doubted he would be a successful artist, but when he reached Vienna, he would receive a swift slap in the face from reality. Before he left Linz, Hitler's mother had become very sick. She had breast cancer that was causing her immense pain and keeping her in bed for days at a time. She rarely left the house, and it sapped almost all of her energy when she did. Rather than staying and taking care of his dying mother, Hitler packed his bags and left her to fend for herself. He even had the audacity to ask her for money to start his art career in Vienna. Even a monster such as Hitler still had a loving mother. She wanted her son to pursue his dream, so she gave him as much money as possible to help him rent an apartment, buy supplies, and apply to art school in Vienna. She likely knew she didn't have much time left, but making her son happy was more important than her own health, it seems. On the other hand, Hitler was much more selfish and didn't give leaving his sickly mother a second thought. Instead, once he got to Vienna and realized how expensive city life was, he asked his mother and other family members for even more money. Hitler had rented an apartment with a childhood friend named August Kubizek. Much to Hitler's dismay, Kubizek was almost immediately accepted into one of Vienna's music conservatories, where he began studying to achieve his dream of becoming a conductor. Unfortunately for Adolf, he had very little success when it came to achieving his goal of becoming a famous artist. The year he moved to Vienna, he started the application for the Academy of Fine Arts. It was a rigorous process that came in two stages. The first was providing a portfolio with past works in it. The second consisted of 2 3-hour sessions of painting scenes that were not disclosed to the applicants until the day of the entrance exam. With around 100 other applicants, Hitler made it past the first round of screening and was asked to come to the school for the second part of the admissions process. We can imagine that Hitler was somewhat ecstatic to be so close to reaching his goal of becoming an artist. However, in his autobiography Mein Kampf, he talks about the process as if he knew he'd get in. The fact that Hitler had not really succeeded at anything thus far in his life did not seem to deter him. But this is in line with the future Führer's delusional personality. Growing up, he thought there was no way he wouldn't become a world-renowned artist. Yet the admissions council did not see it that way. They were about to give Hitler the news that would change his life and the fate of Europe forever. It's interesting to think about what the world would have looked like in the coming years if the Academy of Fine Arts had made a different decision following Adolf Hitler's completion of the second phase of his admissions process. When Hitler sat for the painting test portion of the admissions exam, he and everyone else in the room was told that they would have to paint either an iconic scene from history or something biblical. This would be Hitler's downfall. As a young artist, he found painting landscapes and architecture satisfying, so his human characters were always in the background or had little importance in the piece. This was not what the admissions council was looking for. They critiqued Hitler's work by saying it contained too few heads and faces. And although the committee noted that Hitler's drawings of architecture showed promise, he would never make it in the fine arts due to the fact that he showed a lack of emotions or empathy in the human figures in his paintings. Think about that for a moment. Hitler could not draw humans well or even show compassion for his own creations on the canvas. Young Adolf Hitler saw beauty in the rigid structures of architecture, but could care less for the emotional aspects of human life. It was as if he couldn't be bothered to paint or even think about others' feelings, even if they were characters that came out of his own mind. In hindsight, the way he painted people in his works of art as an afterthought and devoid of meaning in the picture's context aligned pretty closely with how he would treat humans during World War II. At this point in his life, Hitler was starting to develop hatred for certain groups of people, and the main factor for this was the city he was living in. Vienna might have been a center for arts and music in the region, but something much more sinister was going on behind the scenes, something that Adolf Hitler would eventually seek out and embrace after being rejected from art school. There was one member of the admissions council who was sympathetic to Hitler's cause after he was rejected. This professor suggested that since the architectural features were well drawn in Hitler's paintings, he should apply to the School of Architecture. There was only one problem with this suggestion. In order to get into the School of Architecture, Hitler would need a secondary school degree. Since he decided to drop out without finishing his education, Hitler would have to go back to school, complete the degree, then apply to the School of Architecture, which seemed like too much work for the aspiring artist. He ended up completely rejecting the professor's recommendation. Hitler was confident there had been a mistake and he would still be an artist. He applied to the School of Fine Arts a second time and didn't even make it past the first round of screenings. It was reiterated by the admissions council that Adolf Hitler's paintings were utterly devoid of rhythm, color, feeling, or spiritual imagination. As you can imagine, Hitler did not take the second rejection from the admissions council very well either. He didn't tell his friends or family about the rejection. Instead, he carried on living a life of a broke artist in Vienna. Even as his mother slowly died in Linz, Hitler hid the fact that he had spent all the money that she had lent him and was denied entrance into the academy, which was the main reason why he had left her in the first place. Maria Anna Schicklgruber passed away in December of 1907, just before her son received his second rejection letter from the admissions council. Hitler didn't really mention how the death of his mother impacted him in his autobiography. In fact, it seems the only thing it changed was that he now needed another source of money. Again, like in his paintings, Hitler seemed to care very little for people in the real world, even his own mother. As Adolf Hitler grappled with the reality that he would never be accepted into the art school of his choice, he started to form delusions of conspiracies against him. He thought perhaps the admissions board was rigged, or maybe even Jews sat on the council itself. Before coming to Vienna, Hitler had come across anti-Semitic ideas in Linz, but there would be a couple of key players from this part of the country who would influence him to eventually become a genocidal maniac. At this point, Adolf Hitler was demoralized. He had no purpose in life. He was completely broke, and there seemed to be no hope of ever becoming a painter. However, Hitler had another opportunity to turn his life around. He'd been given the chance to work under graphic artist and stage designer Alfred Roller. Roller was a set painter and designer for the Vienna Court Opera's productions of Wagner. This would have been an incredible opportunity for a young artist, but like many things in his life, Hitler made a bad decision. Hitler was given a letter of introduction that would allow him to meet with Alfred Roller at his home. The meeting could have launched his art career to new heights, but as he approached the door, Hitler turned away without knocking. He would try 2 more times to muster the courage to knock on Alfred Roller's door, but would never succeed. It's not clear why Hitler did not seize the opportunity. Some scholars think he was just too afraid to face more rejection, while others believe that Hitler's ego was so big he refused to work in the shadow of another artist. Either way, Hitler's ambitions were falling apart. If he was going to make it as an artist, he would need to start selling his own paintings. Hitler never made ends meet as an artist in Vienna. The only reason he was able to live in an apartment his first year in the city was because his mother and aunt lent him a good, sizable sum of money. But as soon as that dried up, Hitler was on the street. He lived in a homeless shelter and sometimes slept under bridges. It was not the glamorous lifestyle of an artist that he was hoping for. Eventually, he started selling postcards he painted of the city to tourists and picked up a few jobs painting houses, but he still didn't make enough to afford an apartment. He would spend most of his money on basic necessities and art museums and opera show entrance fees. Then things changed slightly for Hitler. He met a man who was able to sell some of his artwork. The irony here is that this man was Jewish. Samuel Morgenstern was an Austrian businessman who dabbled in the art scene. For whatever reason, Morgenstern liked Hitler's paintings and managed to sell several of them. In fact, many of Hitler's early paintings were sold to Jewish buyers. At the time, it didn't seem that Hitler was racist enough to refuse the money from Jewish people for his art, but that would change by the time he rose to power as the head of the Nazi Party. Hitler was now making some money as a painter. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to get him off the streets and into a room in a hostel. During this time in Vienna, his art became more and more influenced by Austrian and German painters. Hitler even said Rudolf von Alt was his greatest teacher that he ever had. There are many similarities between von Alt's work and Hitler's, especially in their style of painting architecture and landscapes. However, von Alt had less of a problem drawing realistic people than Hitler did. Adolf Hitler later described his other influences as being from Greco-Roman Classicism, the Italian Renaissance, and Neoclassicism. The biggest influence on Hitler's life and what he would eventually turn into was the city of Vienna and the key players in it. In Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote, "For hours I could stand in front of the opera. For hours I could gaze at the parliament. The whole Ring Boulevard seemed to me like an enchantment out of the 1001 Nights." The beauty of the city enamored Hitler, but there was a darker side to things that would eventually lead him down a dark path. There were two main movements that influenced Hitler while he was struggling to be an artist in Vienna. Both had racist ideologies and blamed others for the problems of society. George von Schonerer was the leader of the Pan-Germanism movement in the city. This group of people believed that all German-speaking people should be unified under a single nation called the Greater Germanic Reich. You could probably tell which part of Hitler's ideology this influenced, as he would later do this very thing in World War II and call it the Third Reich. The second person who influenced Hitler in Vienna was the mayor of the city, Karl Lueger. It's Lueger who promoted the anti-Semitism principles that Adolf Hitler would adopt in life. Lueger explained how it was the Jewish business owners and Jewish people in general who were making life hard for the German middle and lower classes. When Hitler started his rise to power in the Nazi Party, he used the doctrines and tactics of both Schonerer and Lueger to rise to the top. The combination of both these men was just what Hitler needed to secure his position as the head of the party and spread his anti-Semitic belief system to the people of Germany. Basically, Hitler didn't do anything new to help him gain power. He just used what he had learned from the men he idolized in Vienna during his time as an artist there. For someone who ended up loving war so much, Hitler never registered for the military in Linz like all citizens were required to. In 1913, this decision caught up with him as the police started looking to arrest him. He needed to get out of the city, fast. Hitler had not given up on his artistic dream, but Vienna was getting too dangerous. He had some connections in Munich, so he packed what few personal possessions he had, and in May of 1913, got out of Vienna. Once in Munich, Hitler encountered slightly more success as an artist. He continued selling small watercolors and oil paintings of architectural features and landmarks in the city. A few wealthy patrons also commissioned Hitler to paint landscapes for them as well. Things were starting to look up for Adolf Hitler's art career. Then, suddenly it all came to a screeching halt. World War I had begun, and although this would give Hitler a new calling, his art would be put on hold for the time being. When World War I broke out, Hitler finally decided to fulfill his military duty. The embarrassing thing was that when he enlisted and took his fitness exam, he failed. He was deemed unsuitable for combat and support duty because he was too weak and incapable of firing weapons. Hitler didn't really mention this in his autobiography, probably because it would have been too embarrassing. But like with art school, he just didn't have the right stuff. In August 1914, the German army became desperate for infantrymen and Hitler was able to finally enlist. While serving in World War I, he brought paper and canvas along with him to continue drawing and painting even as the war raged on around him. Even though Hitler volunteered to fight, he appeared to be more interested in continuing his art career than his actual duty. During this time, Adolf Hitler did his final paintings, which were made up of farmhouses, landscapes, and other images he saw during the war. After World War I ended, Hitler put down his brushes and replaced them with anti-Semitic rhetoric, fear-mongering, and his nationalistic agenda. Interestingly, once Adolf Hitler came to power as a leader of the Nazi Party and Führer of Germany, he did something unexpected with his painting career. For whatever reason, Hitler wanted to erase any trace of what he had done as a young artist from the face of the earth. He was so serious about locating and destroying all of his own paintings that he created a special task force and gave them whatever resources they needed to get the job done. A man named Schotte Strathaus was appointed by Hitler in 1936 to locate, buy, or steal any works of art created by him. Strathaus took his mission very seriously and located hundreds of works of art that Hitler had made. He destroyed them all. Strathaus spent years tracking down the paintings and only stopped when World War II broke out, and the Nazis needed every available soldier to fight in the war. This means that by the time World War II came to an end and Hitler shot himself in a Berlin bunker, only a handful of his pieces were still in existence. Much of his work was actually secured by the US Army, who collected them and hid them away in storage. There was never any intention of creating an exhibit out of them or letting the paintings see the light of day ever again. However, the same can't be said about all the pieces of Adolf Hitler's artwork that found their way to private collectors. A group of 18 watercolor pieces was sold by Peter Jahn, a collector of Hitler's early work decades after the war, for around $50,000 apiece. More recently, a painting of Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria done by Hitler sold for approximately $113,000. In Germany, it is illegal to sell anything that has Nazi symbolism on it related to Hitler. However, if Adolf Hitler's signature is on an object and there are no Nazi symbols, then it's okay to sell and display. In 2015, 14 works of art created by Hitler were sold for $450,000 at a Nuremberg auction house. So, the question is, was Adolf Hitler a successful artist since his pieces are now selling for relatively large sums of money? The answer from many art historians and collectors is absolutely not. The reason these pieces are selling for so much money is because they were created by one of the most infamous and hated men who ever lived. If the paintings were created by anyone else, they would either be collecting dust somewhere or destroyed long ago. Most historians agree with the consensus of the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna that rejected Hitler twice. His early works show that he had some talent for painting architecture, but the pieces themselves don't show any emotion or take any risks. Heinz Joachim Maeder, who works as a spokesperson for the Kloss auction house in Berlin, said, "If you walk down Messina and see 100 artists, 80 will be better than Hitler." Maybe if Hitler had been allowed to study at the Academy of Fine Arts, he could have refined his skills and worked on painting humans in a way that evoked some kind of emotion. But he was never given the opportunity. It's crazy to think about how different the world could have turned out if Adolf Hitler was just a slightly better artist and had become successful. Perhaps the millions of lives lost during World War II could have all been saved. There's also another surprising aspect of Hitler's art that rarely gets talked about, something that foreshadowed the carnage that was to come. Although Hitler struggled to incorporate all of the elements needed to make his artwork stand out, he did employ some artistic techniques in his rise to power. By layering different colors in the form of anti-Semitism and national pride on the canvas that would become the Third Reich, Hitler was able to paint a picture in the minds of the German people. His experience in Vienna set the foundation for him to meet people with strong and terrible dogmas that he then incorporated into the Nazi movement. Even while in power, the rigid and emotionless techniques he used in his paintings became part of his main agenda. He would not let the human condition get in his way or veer from his path to creating a Nazi empire. Hitler even said that after he won the war, he would retire and spend the rest of his days painting. It seems he never gave up on his dream of becoming an artist, even as he destroyed the world around him. However, there is one art design that Hitler created that's probably more famous and recognizable than any painting in the world. Hitler describes his masterpiece in Mein Kampf when he says, "I myself, meanwhile, after innumerable attempts, had laid down a final form, a flag with a red background, a white disc, and a black swastika in the middle. After long trials, I also found a definite proportion between the size of the flag and the size of the white disc, as well as the shape and thickness of the swastika." That's right, Adolf Hitler was the artist who designed the Nazi flag. It's one of the most identifiable symbols in the world, and obviously not for good reasons. So if Hitler's goal was to make something that everyone would recognize and connect him with, he succeeded. The swastika that Hitler used in his design was a bastardization of a symbol from the ancient civilizations of the Near East and India. German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann found a similar symbol in the ruins of the ancient city of Troy and on old Germanic pottery. He assumed incorrectly that the two symbols meant Aryan people had an empire that spread across the world. This absolutely inaccurate conclusion led to many Aryan nationalist parties to adopt the symbol at the time, including Hitler's Nazi Party. Again, the symbol is not Aryan in nature and never was. It was just misappropriated from other cultures. Hitler used the colors black, white, and red and is designed to represent the old flag of Imperial Germany. This symbolized a time when Germany was powerful and wealthy, which resonated with many people who were struggling to recover after the sanctions placed on the country after World War I. Looking back on Hitler's art career, we can safely say he was never going to be a great painter. His inability to express emotion through his artwork and the lack of innate talent made him a decent postcard maker and house painter, but only a mediocre artist. His most recognizable work of art is the Nazi flag, which is now only used by infinitesimally small numbers of people who, like Hitler, are monsters. Adolf Hitler failed at winning World War II, failed as a leader, and failed as an artist. Now watch why Hitler's nephew was his worst enemy, or check out last 24 hours of Hitler's life.